Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Got His Heart Broken. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. In a society full of quirks, it was no surprise soulmates started to appear. While being found only in the younger generation, marks soon appeared on older folks as children were born. At first, regulations were set as a society on a fated couple and were the following. Your soulmate must be 10 years older or younger to be married. The bond must be accepted. You cannot cheat on your soulmate. They cannot be in a higher position than the other. They were never regulations any heroes or law enforcement followed. But if couples were against the standards, society would shun them. That was then, and since the rules had been abolished, the older generations of people would look at couples in disgust if they didn't uphold the standards, but they were usually ignored. It now didn't matter your status or age. If you wanted to pursue your soulmate, it was a joyful occasion. At least that's what Izuku thought until at 15 he got his soul mark. They always started out as shapeless blobs, especially if their soulmate had just been born. He noticed the mark as he was changing into his gym uniform, resting on the base of his neck, stretching out long and thin over his right collarbone. Shouta, are you? Is that your soul mark? Yamada burst into the locker room once again to check on his tired friend. Instead, he was greeted with a slightly panicked man who was only staring at the mark that had formed on his neck. Yeah, it is. He pulled his shirt down, then proceeded to walk away. He didn't think his soulmate would be this young. That maybe it would have been better if he didn't have one. Maybe they didn't want someone who. Get out of your head, Shouta. You need to stop thinking about them and worry about graduating, becoming heroes. You can't worry about a soulmate right now, Yamada said. He had grabbed his wrist and pulled his best friend in a hug. It wasn't a hug, but more of a way to restrain the teen. Fine, let's go to class, he muttered. His best friend was right. He had 2 years until he would be a pro, an underground pro, so he had no time to sit and worry over a toddler he could someday call his soulmate. But Yamada had no soul mark. Like how rare the quirkless were, the people who didn't have a soul mark were known as the fateless. A part of him wanted Yamada as his soulmate. Maybe they could have been fateless together, but that wasn't an option anymore. Hey, Shouta. What? Don't wait for me. If you find them, hold on to them for me. Izuku turned to see the small frown that grew on his face. Yamada then looked at him with a large smile. Okay, fine. Midoriya was 4 when he first heard the news. He was quirkless but not fateless. No amount of crying could fix what was wrong with him. No amount of tears could give him a quirk. He had watched the video of All Might on loop. Maybe if he learned something about his quirk, he could figure out why his wasn't showing up. Mom, why don't I have a quirk? He questioned, looking back at his mom who was only crying. I am sorry, Izuku, she whispered, not bothering to hide her shame and sadness for her child. Like any mother, she would give him the world if he asked for it, but right now the only thing he would ask for is something she couldn't give. She sank to the floor, holding him in her arms. The tears flowed down her face, yet he just sat still. Shell-shocked. Would they still want me? He questioned, his form still unmoving. Who are? Of course they would. Her hands flew to his head, drawing him closer. Anyone would be lucky enough to have a soulmate like you, Izuku. Izuku didn't say anything after that. He sat there, tears trailing his face as his mom kissed and held him. He couldn't understand why he felt so heavy and tired, but maybe sleep would fix this nightmare. Before Izuku went to bed, he would always check his soul mark, but the one night he didn't was the night it changed. The black mark slowly morphed into the form of a bunny. Midoriya stood in front of the rather large door, white-knuckling the straps of his backpack. A part of him wanted to turn around and walk back to the principal's office and ask if he could have a place in the Gen Ed course back. Hello, Midoriya. Nezu spoke, then motioned for the couch. He looked around the empty room. No one was in the room with them. Hi, Principal Nezu, he stuttered out, then sat down. His hands were constantly fiddling with the sleeves of his shirt, trying to keep himself calm. How are you today? He asked, pouring the boy a cup of tea. He only nodded, then took the cup. I am good, just scared. His eyes flickered over the barren walls. It was just him and the principal of a school for heroes, as if that could be any more dangerous. You were experimented on, just a mouse. Oh, tell me, how do you know? Nezu asked, bringing the cup up to hide his growing smirk and sense of pride. He wasn't afraid of the principal, but afraid of the confrontation. If only Kaken. If you are afraid, then there is no need to be. There is no one here beside you and I. Even if there were heroes here, you would easily overpower them. How I do not want to lie to you. I find honesty to be the best policy. He replied, then took a sip of his tea. Care to demonstrate your observation ability? Nezu set out a computer, then pressed play. It was a rare video of Eraserhead, as the underground hero made sure all videos were deleted. Though it was obvious this was a personal file of the hero, judging by how good the camera quality was. His eyes darted across the screen, studying each frame, though he already had the page for Eraserhead open mentally. His quirk has something to do with erasing others. It only lasts for a few minutes, I guess, when he has to blink. The capture weapons somehow play into his quirk, but I'm not sure how. His gaze was locked on the computer, then flashed up to look at the principal, who was only sipping his tea with a grin. You are correct, Nezu replied, then he closed the computer. How did you know that? I don't have a Q quirk, and it's really hard to fight when they have an upper hand. He managed to spit out, his face red in embarrassment. So you decided to observe and level the playing field? Nezu asked, a confident smile hidden behind the teacup. Midoriya nodded. It made his smile widen. What am I doing here, Principal Nezu? I don't have a quirk and I have CL. I want you in the hero course, was the last thing Midoriya thought he would hear from the mouse. Excuse me. I want you in the hero course, Midoriya. Your observational skills are quite frankly astonishing. It takes you moments to analyze a video that would take most pros minutes, maybe even hours. How do you do it? I don't have a quirk, and I spent my free time learning how to. He cut himself off, hoping it implied what his true intentions were. How to gain a quirk. You do know it's biological, correct? Nezu felt like he had to ask, though it was more a joke than truth. I do, though observing quirks became more about how to help them instead of helping myself. He looked down at the now cold tea, his fingers running over the smooth edge of the cup. If you know I'm quirkless, why am I being transferred into the hero course? It is for reasons you have already explained. You want to help the heroes. Of course, we have the other hero classes that eventually become psychics, but what you can do doesn't qualify for either psychic or hero. You are essentially a middleman in likes we have never seen before. He finally set the cup and saucer on the table, facing the student seriously. I want to challenge you, and it seems the only way to do that is through the hero course. But what about my teacher? Shouldn't they know? That is up to you to decide. But I have filed your paperwork with no quirk listed. It's up to you to decide your alias. Why not tell my teacher? It would save all this trouble. Midoriya felt like he was being toyed with at this point. Aizawa is famous for rejecting a full class of students that didn't show potential. He might just judge you for being quirkless and kick you out instantly. Nezu slid off the chair, as it was too high to get off properly, then crossed the floor towards Midoriya. Do you agree to everything I have just said? Midoriya was in an internal conflict. He could either say no and live his life as a regular person, or say yes and live his life as a hero. I will join the hero course. Welcome to class 1 of Midoriya, Nezu said, then he walked over to his desk to grab paperwork. Meanwhile, Midoriya was transfixed on his hand. He watched as the lazy black cat that usually sat near his soul mark over his heart walked down onto his hand, then fell asleep. A small smile worked its way onto his face. Though the cat was usually hiding somewhere, when he was upset it would lay on a part of him he could see easily, usually on one of his hands. Even if he didn't know who they were, if they would ever accept someone quirkless, he loved the comfort he got from his soulmate. Midoriya held the straps to his backpack tightly, ready to walk into the already loud class, but he didn't. A crippling fear was strangling him. Why couldn't he breathe? Why couldn't he move? What am I doing here? I'm quirkless. I don't belong here. He can't breathe. Why does his neck hurt? Why does his head and heart hurt? What is going on? He has to leave. Please let him. The strangling fear he once had dissipated, a steady pulse of pleasure replacing it. Midoriya could have sighed in relief, but the question arose, who was behind him? Turning around, he had to crane his head up to look at the scruffy man, who looked like he was having a similar reaction to the touch. Aizawa cracked his eyes open to look down at his newest student. They studied the other's features, not saying a thing, just relishing in the buzz that coursed through their bodies, but the sound of a bell blaring had snapped them out of the trance. He can't be, Aizawa cursed to himself internally, knowing full well this is what happens when soulmates touch each other for the first time. He had pulled his hand away slowly, not wanting to either oft or scare his soulmate off, but judging by the looks on Midoriya's face, he had no clue what that was. Midoriya had turned around completely. Studying the man in front of him, Aizawa would have found it endearing how quizzical the student was, if not for the fact that he was panicking internally. "New kid, get inside," Aizawa replied, then opened the door with a bang. In turn, Midoriya ducked his head low and entered the classroom. Aizawa grabbed the back of his bag and pulled him to the front of the classroom, placing him in front of the board. "Take your seats. We have a new student entering the hero course," he said gruffly, placing the stack of papers on his podium, then looked towards Midoriya, signaling him to start talking. My name is Midoriya Izuku. Nice to meet you," he stuttered out, bowing, then looking up at his teacher, who only sighed. "Take the seat in the corner over there," he pointed to the right side of the class, "and don't be another headache." Midoriya nodded, then sat down, the students talking amongst themselves, some even introducing themselves to him. Then a voice that chilled Midoriya to the bone, one that he didn't think he would hear today, call his name. "Deku, Kaken," Midoriya replied, a sudden feeling of dread and shock forming a pool in his stomach. He immediately stood up. A part of him wanted to hide behind his teacher. Instinctually, he felt safer near him, which he had found absurd. "What are you doing here?" Bakugo asked, his voice dry and bitter. All the while, he stalked closer to Midoriya, his hands open and bared, ready for the explosions that gave Midoriya nightmares. You never quit stuttering, did you, stupid Deku?" he asked. Aizawa was watching the pair. He didn't want to stop it just yet. They had a history and he can't tell what this will turn out to be just yet. Besides, he had a new student with practically no warning or information from Netsu. This could be one of the best ways to learn about him. How the fuck did you get in here without a quirk? Bakugo snapped. Drawing in closer, Midoriya had his back to the wall. Aizawa took note of how the boy stood under the explosive teen's gaze, hunched over, gaze down and head bowed. He was acting on instinct now. Whatever relationship these two have had, this has been going on for a long time, Aizawa thought as he was pulling his scarves down to intervene. Aye, Don, he replied. Ochako jumped up, shielding Midoriya from Bakugo. Midoriya stared at her in shock. No one has ever defended him before. That's enough, Bakugo. He's new here, she snapped, trying to keep her distance from the dangerous teen. Midoriya kept his head down, then he looked at the teacher, a pleading look on his face begging him to stop Bakugo before this got worse. Though a part of him knew it was useless, teachers never want to help a quirkless nobody. I knew the fucking idiot when we were kids. He never had a quirk. I almost feel bad for his fated, quirkless but not fateless. What a pathetic life to lead, he growled, the explosions going off in his hand, then held them up but they suddenly stopped. When that didn't work, he tried to charge Midoriya, only to be held back by capture weapons. Midoriya, take your seat. Bakugo, behave, Aizawa stated. He was beginning to regret letting it go as far as it did. He glanced at Midoriya, who only raised his head to look at the teacher with glassy eyes. The look on his face made Aizawa's heart clench. It was a look of relief, shock, and joy, like for the first time, someone stood up to Bakugo for him. Midoriya bowed his head quickly, then rushed back to his seat, while the class erupted in small laughs and conversations as Aizawa dealt with Bakugo. Quiet down, now for today. He was interrupted once again by the door slamming open. A few teachers Midoriya recognized from his hero analysis books walked in. Present Mike, the one who slammed the door open, walked in first, followed by Midnight and Snipe. Today we are working with the support class, learning about what they make and how they help. I have a few teachers besides myself who need support items. He looked towards Present Mike, then sighed when he saw Midnight, and a teacher who followed her soulmate. Hello Class 1A, I am Present Mike. For those at home who don't know, the voice hero. Midoriya decided for as cool as he seemed, he was just too loud for him. Does anyone know how my quirk works? As expected, no one knew. Midoriya raised a shaky hand to answer. Why, your quirk just amplifies the sound of your vocal cords. The vibration doesn't increase, only the sound produced. It can be loud enough to disable enemies with a sound quirk, but you can't stop it from hitting allies if they are in the way. Which is why you are here to talk about the directional speakers on your neck. He rambled, studying the teacher as he spoke. The class then erupted in cheers and questions on how he did it. He was just reading off one of the many memorized hero analysis pages. That's right, new listener. You also stole my thunder. Sorry, Snipe will talk about his quirk, even though it's not a support item. Present Mike shouted. Midoriya winced, bowing his head to the sound. Hey there, the name's Snipe. Y'all know what my quirk is, but question my taste in masks. He joked, motioning to the horse-shaped mask he has yet to take off. As a way to keep my vision clear. It's obvious my quirk relies on sight. Cause of that, villains have tried to blind me before. Another reason why I keep the mask on. The sight ain't too pretty to look at no more. He cleared his throat, then looked at Midnight, who smiled softly at him. Anyway, it's a filter for poisonous gases and any villains who don't hold a solid shape no more. You know I use capture weapons. I have no real clue. He glanced at Midoriya, who was muttering about quirks, then sighed. Midoriya, any idea? Well, it just might be excess energy that your quirk gives off. Usually, quirks need an outlet for energy or have a toll on your body, so I think you might just give off a different electrical field. Just static electricity and enough to keep your hair up and to use your capture weapon. He rambled. His page was just a bit longer than other teachers. He kinda idolized him. Other students started to crowd him, asking how he knew that. It only made him super anxious. Give the boy space, he clearly needs it. A feminine voice barked. His gaze shifted up to see Midnight crouching down in front of his desk. Are you alright? I just don't like crowds. I will be fine though. I just need time. He looked up at Kayama, then noticed Aizawa staring at him with a concerned gaze. It only made him smile a bit. Snipe, Present Mike, take the students down to the support class to talk to the students. Me and Aizawa will stay here for a bit, Kayama called. They led the students out, a few hesitant to leave him but decided it was for the best. What happened? Aizawa asked, crossing his arms. If Midoriya wanted to look, he could spot the ends of his soul mark sitting on the base of his neck. I just don't like a lot of people crowding me at once, he replied, then stood up, his tail flicking from left to right. How do you really know about our quirks? Kayama asked. Midoriya looked at her with a frown, then sat back down. Well, I study quirks. It's all I'm really good at. I keep track of all of them. Wait, that sounds bad. Well, I just analyze quirks, and so I don't forget, I write them in a notebook. He rambled, hating himself for revealing a bit more than he wanted to. How many notebooks do you have done? Kayama asked. Aizawa was leaning back and studying the boy. He couldn't understand him. Why would Nedzu add another student to an already full class? What was his goal? Well, by middle school I had 13. I might be on 17 now, well maybe 16, but I think He mumbled, trying to figure out which hero he left on in the last book. 17 books. Wait, what is your quirk? She asked. His head perked up like a dog whose name was being called. I don't have a ... we will end name for it. He managed to stutter out, then stood up. Aizawa took it as a sign he wanted to leave and meet with the class. Up to see what a support class looks like? Aizawa asked. Midoriya nodded, stood up again, then walked in front of him, genuinely excited to see what the rest of the school looked like. Aizawa couldn't help but feel like he's known who this boy was long before he met him, though he would grill him on details of his quirk later. A warm feeling settled on Aizawa's collarbone, right where the green bunny was usually sleeping. It yawned, then jumped down to his hand, making itself visible to Aizawa, who in turn smiled to himself, then shoved his hand into his pocket to hide the bunny. Aizawa and Kayama walked with Midoriya to the support class, where the rest of Class 1 was talking to different students. A few were even getting fitted for support items already. Midoriya shrieked as Hatsune pounced on him, her hands wrapping around his upper torso. Aizawa couldn't say why, but the need to protect the new student was almost suffocating. With a sigh, he pulled Hatsune off his body, then helped him up. Midoriya couldn't describe the buzzing feeling he felt on his back, Aizawa's hand never leaving his shoulder. He could have sighed in relief as the warmth, the pleasurable buzzing, keeping his head clear once again. This is the second time this has happened. Why does this keep happening with Aizawa-sensei? Midoriya thought an idea that the teacher could be his soulmate passed through his head. He couldn't be, even if he was. It couldn't happen. Don't jump on the problem child, Aizawa chided. The older man had stared at Hatsune but didn't acknowledge Midoriya, as the pleasurable feeling had almost made him shudder. Sorry, I've never met someone who's joined late and made it into the hero course too. She turned towards Midoriya. How did you get in? Did you do something special? Why did you come a few weeks into the school year? She rambled on with questions. Midoriya looked back up at the teacher, who nodded. You need a hero outfit. The rest of the class has been fitted with one, but since you came a few weeks late and into a new course, it would be good for you to reach out to the support class, Aizawa stated. His hand hadn't dared move from the spot he claimed for himself. All right, he stuttered, almost refusing to move, the buzz still coursing through him like an electrical current. He turned towards the bubbling student. She too was oblivious to what was occurring between the teacher and student. I will answer your questions. Did you need my measurements? Great, I have a few babies that could help you, she shouted. Midoriya recoiled slightly but smiled nonetheless. Thanks, he whispered, being dragged away from his teacher by his wrist. He glanced back at him only to notice he turned around and walked away, going to talk to Kayama. He felt disappointed but didn't say anything as he entered the rather large room, then taken to the large, empty spot in the back. Aizawa had walked back to talk to Kayama, his head cluttered with everything and seemingly nothing at all. What's got your panties in a twist? Midnight asked, her voice light and fun until she saw the state of her best friend. Aizawa, what's up? Nothing, just his eyes flickered to Hatsune and Midoriya. Aizawa watched as she measured and talked to him. He looked flustered. Their eyes met for a brief moment before he turned his head back to Kayama, pretending his heart didn't just skip a beat when their eyes met. Why am I acting like a blushing schoolgirl? He might be my soulmate, but I can't afford that, the man thought bitterly. Had waited 15 years to get a mark and another 15 to meet his soulmate, and yet he didn't want him. Cho? Kayama asked. He had closed his eyes and rested his body against the wall. She had a suspicion as to what was happening, so she reached over and pulled his scarf down where his soul mark was. Sure enough, it was blank. It's blank, isn't it? He questioned, watching as the green bunny hopped into view on his hand. It must have seen something because it had jumped, then ran towards it. Must have been his soul mark. Do you know who it is? She questioned, scanning the room for different students. Yay, I do. Well, who is it? It doesn't matter. I won't accept anyway. I can't afford to do that, and neither can he. With that, he stalked towards the testing area where Midoriya and Hatsune were. Kayama watched as they interacted, already subconsciously reaching out for the other. Shit show, you don't know anything. She only watched as they talked, Midoriya's face stricken red while Aizawa held a small smile. I don't think you realized what he's already done to you. It was at that moment that their fingers brushed that Kayama had almost squealed. Midoriya had no clue how he was going to lie his way through this. Okay, hold your arms out, please. She held a tape measure, then started to take his measurements, occasionally turning around to write something down on her clipboard. Hatsune would ask for details about his quirk. There has to be one he's memorized enough to give perfect detail of while not calling any hero out. As she wrapped the tape measure around his waist, he looked up and saw that his teacher was watching him. He felt his face heat up as they held eye contact, though Aizawa had broken it before it went on any longer. How much longer? He asked. His arms were becoming stiff the longer he's held them up. Done. Now what can you do? What? You were allowed into the hero course a few weeks late, so you must have some amazing ability. I can observe people. What? That's it? She asked, almost dropping her clipboard. And no, it's called superpower. I can move fast and punch hard. Midoriya cursed himself out internally over his very easy-to-spot lie. Nobody knew the true name of All Might's quirk. He is the #1 hero, but it seemed like no one in his class had an observational ability. That's very handy. I have some babies that might be able to help you, she replied. Then another pink-haired girl had bound up to him. Mina. Hey, what's your quirk? She asked, tilting her head to the side. I'm not trying to be mean, but you did join the class late, so we wanted to know. As superpower, it's an EE emitter type quirk. His head hung down, afraid to look up at his classmate. What's your name? Mina. I'm in your class. Do you mind if more of the class comes to talk to you? She asked. He glanced up at the curious faces, then at Hatsum, who was scribbling something down, then smiled to himself as she nodded. Sure, I don't mind, he replied. Mina motioned for Kirishima, Zero, and Kaminari to join her on the platform. They all smiled and waved at him, excited to meet the newest student. I'm Kirishima. If you got into the hero course late, you must have a cool quirk, he shouted. Midoriya noticed his sharp teeth, then smiled. Kirishima took it as a friendly gesture and smiled wider. What can you do? Zero asked. Hatsum took the opportunity to flip to a new page on her clipboard, then waited for him to talk. I can observe quirks, but I have super strength and speed. Can you tell me what mine is? Mina asked. His eyes started to scan her body, looking for any clue as to what her quirk is. I think I would have to see you fight. I mean, you have pink skin, so it could just be a side effect from your quirk. Maybe you excrete something from your skin, but I think the horns and your eye color are just a mutant variant of your quirk. I don't know what you excrete, but it's something that might make your skin raw over time, maybe leading up to this color naturally. Acid, he muttered, his eyes flickering over her body. That's right, she shouted, throwing her arms into the air. The other students around her looked at him in shock. His voice trailed off, unsure of how to ask his question. See, can I put your quirks into my hero notebook? Hero notebook? Kirishima asked, looking at Mina, who was equally confused. I analyze quirks and write them down in notebooks so I don't forget them. Sorry, it sounds really bad when I try to explain it. He turned his head away, a blush covering his face. That's super cool. Could you bring a few to class tomorrow and show us? Mina asked, her face now inches away from Midoriya's. Sure. Would you like me to show you how I analyze them? He managed to stutter out. Mina shook her head wildly. Yay, maybe you can teach a lesson tomorrow since Sensei likes to sleep during the first hour. Her voice trailed off, looking for their teacher. Wait, no. Aizawa-sensei, can you come here? She called, waving the teacher over. Meanwhile, Hatsum was having a ball looking through her bin of inventions for Midoriya. Yes? Aizawa asked, noting how flustered Midoriya looked while his other students were grinning ear to ear. He wouldn't admit it to himself, but he found it cute how flustered he was. A small smile sat on his face as he looked down at his soulmate student. Can Midoriya teach tomorrow and show us how to analyze quirks? Mina asked. The other students around them were chiming in with pleas and statements about how cool it will be. Yet they failed to notice what was happening between Midoriya and Aizawa. Midoriya. Aizawa looked at the blushing student, who was trying to hide his face by looking down, his hands fiddling with the ends of his sleeves. One had fallen to his side, gripping his pants. Aizawa had let his arm fall. He wanted to see how the boy reacted to him. Their fingers brushed up against each other. He would have jumped back in shock, but his head only whipped around to find the source. Well, please Midoriya, it would be super manly of you to teach us, Kirishima begged. He wasn't sure why they were asking him to teach. After all, he was new here. But why just started? He asked, looking at the group. Midoriya, you will teach homeroom in 2 weeks. If you fail to teach them how to observe and analyze, then you will be kicked out of the hero course, Aizawa stated, the decision final. He was pretty annoyed that Netsu refused to tell him why there was a new student in his class. Maybe even more annoyed that the student was his soulmate and he hadn't realized they were yet. Okay, he whispered, his hands now clammy. The students in front of him shot him a look of pity. I didn't think he would test you so soon, Mina said, her voice full of shock. But didn't he do that to us the first day? Zero asked. The group went silent. He did, just with physical activities. Wait, is that your soul mark? Kirishima asked. Midoriya panicked, then bowed his head, hoping they weren't talking about him. Seeing someone else's mark was a private thing. Kiri, not so loud, Mina hissed, making sure no one else heard him. Sorry, it has a habit of sleeping or walking anywhere, Midoriya muttered, keeping his head low. I can show you mine to make up for it, Kirishima suggested. Midoriya shook his head wildly. It's okay, he squeaked out. Hatsum had returned to the group with an arm full of gadgets, unaware of the new tension in the air. Aizawa was leaning against the wall behind them. A part of him wanted to see the soul mark, but he knew who it belongs to and he hated that he did. Midoriya, IBR Hatsum looked at the group confused. What did I miss? Nothing. The group had shouted all together, which only made her suspicious rise. Midoriya, right. A voice chirped. He lifted his head to see a round-faced girl staring at him. It was Uraraka. Next to her was Ida, who was only staring at him in curiosity. You're the girl who stood up for me earlier? Thank you, he replied. She only smiled and pointed to her cheek. Is it still there? Yeah, they aren't usually this active unless your soulmate was nearby. She replied. The now larger group had started to chat about who his soulmate was. What are your names? He asked, trying to diverge the conversation. My name is Uraraka and this is Ida. Why did you transfer into the hero course so late? She questioned. Aizawa had been lingering in the room to keep watch of his problem child, stepping in now before he said something he regretted. Special case. Nenzu decided he was fit for the course, he replied, not hesitating to glare at the rest of the students. Should you be working with a support student? Sorry, sensei. Bye, Midoriya. Uraraka decided that it was her cue to leave. Ida bowed to both of them, then walked away with her. The rest of the students walked away, sending him looks of pity as they left him with their teacher. Why won't you look up? He asked. Midoriya lowered his head even more, unsure how to talk to him. Well, my soul mark is on my face and it's sleeping, I think, Midoriya whispered, hoping it was loud enough for him to hear. Unfortunate, was all he said. He could understand having a difficult soul mark. The green bunny couldn't sit in one place for long. Sensei, Midoriya's voice trailed off. Aizawa looked over at the student. Currently, the teacher was resting against the wall and observing the rest of the class. Have you found your soulmate? No, was all he said, trying to keep it brief. Do you want to meet yours? Not really. I don't like the idea of being forced to date someone I don't like, especially since we have a 15-year age gap, Aizawa stated, his gaze on the other students rather than Midoriya, though he was curious to see his soul mark. Midoriya, lift your head, Hatsum asked. He shook his head no, but she only huffed then lifted it. There were some people who didn't care about soul marks, and she was obviously one. It's on your cheek, just wear this. Pulling a dirty bandana from her pocket, she quickly covered the mark with the bandana then tied it around his head. There, now I need you to try this on. She shoved a box in his arms. He almost fell over because of the weight. How do I put these on? He asked, setting the box down. A large grin appeared on her face. Well, these go around your waist. She immediately crouched down to buckle the new device to his waist, securing it then stood back up. Midoriya had to look away because he was so flustered in Aizawa. While for the first time the teacher was jealous. What is this? He asked, flustered that she was so close to his crotch, but he managed not to stutter it out. Just a utility belt. It can hold a ton of things, and since your quirk is a mystery to us all, the belt can hold anything you need. She turned to grab what looked like gloves, but the bell rang. She huffed then set them back down. I will have more babies made for you later. Please come back soon. Hatsum undid the belt then shoved him out of her space to start working on more things. Aizawa followed Midoriya out, confused about a few things that really didn't add up with him. Will you teach the class in 2 weeks? Aizawa finally asked. They were lagging behind the group of students. I don't think I have a choice. He smiled meekly up at the teacher as he was looking forward, though he did see the smile out of the corner of his eye and it made him happy for some reason. You asked about my soulmate earlier. What about you? Aizawa looked down at him for a split second. He was more curious as to why Nenzu put him in his class than learning more about him. I had a mark when I was born, though I think they are stubborn and like sleep. Why? No matter what I say, the mark loves to sit where I don't want it to. Usually if you ask it just goes somewhere else, but it never does. It's both endearing and annoying, Midoriya answered, a smile on his face as he spoke about his soulmate. Aizawa didn't say anything, though his heart felt a bit heavier now. What if you met your soulmate? What would you do? The student looked up at the teacher, Aizawa's face still blank and exhausted. I would tell them I wouldn't want a child as it fated. It's cruel to both me and them, Aizawa answered. They stopped at the classroom door, but the rest of the students had left. It's lunch. I usually eat here. Go make friends. A part of him wanted to ask the older man if he wanted to eat with him, but it was only his first day and it would be so very wrong. Bye, sensei, Midoriya muttered then walked towards the loud hall. Midoriya couldn't think during his walk to the cafeteria. His mind was muddled with the idea that his soulmate was his teacher, though there was a possibility it wasn't Aizawa. He just had this gut feeling that it was him, like his world was complete near him. They just met. This was going too fast for him. Why is it him? He couldn't ruin someone's life because of him. Maybe if he just never let his mark be shown again, maybe if he wore makeup to hide the mark, maybe. Midoriya, a voice asked, startling him from his thoughts. He looked up then noticed the people who were holding trays of food. Uraraka, Ida, and Todoroki stood there. Uraraka smiled then motioned to the empty table. Can we sit here? He nodded dumbly, moving over for someone to sit next to him. Todoroki took the space while Uraraka and Ida sat next to each other. It's nice to meet you, Midoriya. My name is Todoroki. he said dully. Midoriya smiled and nodded his head. It's nice to meet you. I'm Midoriya. Wait, you knew that? Sorry, he muttered, looking back down at his food. You seemed lost in thought when we walked over. Is everything okay? Ida asked, not hesitating to eat his lunch. Midoriya shook his head, then picked up his chopsticks. I am fine, just getting used to the school. He lied, then picked a bit of rice, chewing it more than he should have. Where did you go before? Uraraka asked, eating her lunch carefully. I was homeschooled, he replied, looking up at them. They were happily eating and waiting for him to continue talking. I don't know why Principal Nedzu let me in. I don't think Your quirk is super cool, and you can explain someone else's quirk so easily, Uraraka said, bits of food flung as she yelled with a big smile. You are here for a reason. You might not see it, but your entire class and the staff did as well as Principal Nedzu, she added softly. He smiled, then continued to eat, forgetting why he was panicking in the first place, that is until a teacher approached the table. Hey Midoriya, mind if I take you for a walk for a bit? Snipe asked. Midoriya looked at his new friends who nodded, then glanced up at the teacher and nodded. Todoroki stood up and waited for Midoriya to slide out of the booth, then sat down. He threw away the rest of his lunch, then exited the cafeteria with the pro hero. Where are we going? He asked Snipe. The teacher only looked back at him. Midoriya assumed he smiled, but it wasn't translated through his mask. He took note of all the empty halls, how quiet it was, and how weird this was turning out to be. Snipe took him up the stairs to the roof, closing the door behind him. There were only a few other people on the roof, Kayama, Aizawa, and Yamada. What's happening? Midoriya asked, suddenly feeling scared that he was confronted by pros. He took a step back. He loved heroes, but a quirkless student being cornered on a rooftop. Not ideal. We just wanted to talk to you. Well, I did, but these folks had a few words to spare as well. Snipe replied. Midoriya nodded, feeling stupid for fearing him. How come he likes you already? A loud voice called. Midoriya snapped his head up to look at the frustrated hero, who for some reason wanted Midoriya's attention. Don't tell me he's your other soulmate. Midnight practically whined. Snipe only chuckled, then ruffled his hair. Nah, Dong got the touch. The touch? Yeah. When you meet or find your soulmate, they make your skin all tingly, he answered. Midoriya laughed, but internally he was panicking. Didn't he feel that way when Aizawa was touching him? Aizawa was the only one who noticed his fidgeting. He was curious but didn't push it, especially in front of everyone. What did you need? Midoriya asked, looking at the other pros with his head cocked to the side slightly. What's your quirk? Aizawa questioned. Midoriya looked at him confined. He was really trying to sell his whole I have a cool quirk idea ... and it was failing. What? He replied, fiddling with his fingers. What do you mean what? It's pretty obvious there's something going on, the kid. Midnight had practically shouted. Midoriya couldn't keep his head up. It hasn't even been a full day at school and he's already been cornered into giving up his secret. He couldn't get the words out. His hands gripped the bottom of his shirt. He pulled and fiddled with the fabric. Aizawa felt himself wanting to reach out and stop him from fiddling with his shirt and ultimately breaking down, but he didn't. Midoriya backed up, bumping into him. Then he looked up, then back at the expecting heroes. Taking a breath, and he spoke with shaky words. I don't have a F flashy quirk. Why yet it F feels wrong that people think my quirk is obersensational. He managed to stutter out. He could feel the world around him crushing him like a piece of paper, as if at any moment it's gone. Any panic that Midoriya had was subsiding, yet he didn't know why. Aizawa had placed his hand on his back between his shoulder blades during his panic. What am I doing? Aizawa thought, looking at the other teachers with a straight face, ignoring the pleasurable feeling that coursed through his body. If you don't have a flashy quirk, what is your quirk? Aizawa asked, looking down at the boy who was fiddling with anything he could get his hands on. I can't tell you, were the words that seemingly broke Aizawa's heart. He despised the reason why. Sean, can you walk him back to the cafeteria? He asked. Sean's eyes flew open in surprise but nodded and walked him back anyway. Midoriya's eyes widened as he turned to see Aizawa lifting his hand off his back, a sense of dread and surprise washing over him. Okay, he called, keeping up the appearance that everything was okay. Let's go, Midoriya. Sean started to idly chat with the boy, who returned it with a large smile, though he was still questioning everything and his first day wasn't even done yet. When the door closed, Aizawa sighed, running his hand down his face. This isn't good, he muttered, sitting against the chain-link fence with a sigh. Shouta, what's going on? Kayama asked as he looked over at his best friends, then groaned. She already knew there was an issue with his suspected soulmate, but she didn't think it would be this bad. I think Midoriya is my fated, he replied, pulling the capture tape off his neck, then pulling his collar down to reveal his blank neck. I noticed it at the beginning of lunch. It's alive now and moving. It wasn't uncommon for an animalistic soul mark to come to life and move if their fated had touched them. It was more common to find someone with an item like flowers, or in the case of Midnight and Sean, a whip and gun crossed with a daisy. How did you know? Kayama asked, standing over him. I just touched him today and the mark came to life. Not to mention he rolled his sleeve up to see a happy green bunny run around a lazy black cat. The bunny got even more excited when it noticed Aizawa was looking at it. But the minute it realized someone else was looking at it, it hid back in the shadow of his sleeve, only its head was peeking out to watch them. That's definitely the new listener. What will you do, Shouta? Yamada asked. He was more in shock that his best friend had found his fated, even more that it was his student. I don't know. I doubt he realized it's me, only that he has one. And I plan to keep it that way, he answered, glaring at the sky, trying to curse whatever god did this to him. Why would you do that? He's just a kid, he snapped, glaring at Kayama. I want him to be able to choose someone his own age. If making him happy is all I can do for him, then so be it. With that he laid his head back, closing his eyes. I don't get it, Shouta. Why would you ignore the bond? Yamada asked, the hurt evident in his voice. He would do anything to have a soulmate he could hold and call his own, and yet his best friend was throwing his away. He's a kid who melted into your touch like ice cream on a summer day. Kayama fired back. Sean and his many metaphors had rubbed off on her. It was instinct, one that he shouldn't have had unless something was forming already. Kayama snapped. Aizawa didn't reply. He only opened his eyes and stared at the adult hero. He wouldn't admit to his friends, but this was painful even for him. Finding your soulmate was like finding your other half, and here he was trying to get rid of him like he was a virus. Even if I did accept the bond, I don't want him to get hurt even more. Being an underground hero has its advantages and disadvantages. I have enough people who want to hurt me as is. If a soulmate got in the mix, they would have a clear shot. Aizawa replied as if he rehearsed this already. Give him a chance. Kayama is right, you have to try, Shouta, Yamada replied. He bent down and smiled at him. The kid might surprise you. I won't tell him we are bonded. He has to figure that out and come to terms with it. He stood up, then dusted himself off. Saves us both the trouble if he finds out and doesn't want me. Aizawa walked away after speaking, the pain reciting around his chest as if it was being crushed. Midoriya had walked with Sean back to the cafeteria, but he couldn't stop thinking about his potential soulmate, Aizawa. Both times Aizawa had touched him, the tingles, as Sean put it, happened. This pleasurable buzz that he found only happened when Aizawa touched him. Testing the theory only in small amounts during lunch, like handing things to his friends or just giving high fives. He had come to the conclusion that Aizawa was his soulmate, but he didn't know what to do. Just earlier that day they had talked about soulmates, and Aizawa was insistent in denying a soulmate he didn't know, and because he was younger than him. He didn't know why his heart was breaking even before he talked and confirmed this idea. Looking down, he noticed the black cat that he had grown to love walking down his arm as he was in the bathroom with his blazer off and sleeves rolled up, then stopped and looked back. The green bunny from earlier had hopped down his arm, rocketing towards the cat happily. They tumbled a bit, then stopped. The cat was lying next to the bunny, though it didn't seem to mind, wanting to slow down and rest with it. If the bunny was active, that only meant his suspicion was correct. Aizawa was his soulmate. Everyone had a secondary mark, one that was inactive, merely a tattoo until their soulmate touched them. The mark, if it was an animal, was what represented them and how they found their soulmate, as their soulmate had their mark active. To really prove Aizawa was his soulmate, he would have to find a green bunny hopping around his body, which Midoriya doubted Aizawa would let him do. But Aizawa has worked hard for his job as both a hero and a teacher. It would be cruel to strip his soulmate of his titles because he wanted a happily ever after. Midoriya stopped in the hall. Sean had walked ahead, blind to Midoriya's panic, then sudden ease, though it was a painful idea. He would just give up on the idea of having a soulmate. He could be happy, just not with Aizawa. It has been a few weeks since the initial touch, since their hearts longed for the other, and both were in different states of disarray. Aizawa was more annoyed than usual. Whatever he did, wherever he went, his mind just went back to his soulmate. He figured if Midoriya didn't say anything about the bond, then he didn't want it, though a part of him was just hoping he was too nervous to say anything. Midoriya acted as he normally did, afraid and skittish of his surroundings, but around Aizawa, he was almost too quiet. His classmates questioned it at first, but when it came to their newest friend, being afraid and skittish was his normal. Midoriya wished he could tell his soulmate everything. He wouldn't give him a big hug or kiss like in the movies, but he wanted to make his soulmate happy. Midoriya, Uraraka questioned. His head snapped up to look at her, concern painted over her face. Yeah, he replied, picking up his chopsticks to eat some of his untouched lunch. His voice was heavy in sorrow, though his face was blank. This caused stress and worry amongst his friend group. Are you worried about tomorrow? Todoroki asked. They were about done with their lunch, but Midoriya had spaced out, thinking about other things. Tomorrow. His voice trailed off, confused about what tomorrow should be. I have to teach the class. He practically shouted. This time he wasn't in the corner of the booth, so he slid out easily, dumped his food, then sprinted to his class to get his book back. There was a reason he had almost half of his notebooks in there, but he had completely forgotten. Shoving the door open, he walked to his desk and pulled out the notebooks, looking at the ones he had grabbed. It seemed like he had his newest books. 8-16, number 13 and all its destroyed glory was in there too. A sad smile graced his lips as he sat down and opened book number 13, reading the semi-burnt pages. Aizawa was sleeping before the door slammed open. He was laying on the floor in his classroom trying to find peace and quiet. It was failing. He opened his eyes to look at who barged in. It was none other than the soulmate he was trying to avoid, Midoriya. Silently, he watched him pull out many notebooks, all with a different number scrawled at the top. The more recent ones had the term hero analysis with the number. The older ones had hero analysis for the future on top. What changed? Aizawa thought as he watched him shakily pull out a burnt book, number 13. It seemed to be the last one that had the title, Hero Analysis for the Future. I guess it was whatever happened with that book that caused things to change. Bakugo. Aizawa watched as Midoriya slowly sat down in his seat, shakily opening the book. Cracks could be heard as the pages were turned. Sensei. Why you don't have to keep staring at me? Midoriya managed to stutter out. He lifted his head to look his soulmate in the eye the first time he had the confidence to do so since the past 2 weeks. He didn't reply. Instead, he unzipped his sleeping bag, got out, and walked over to his soulmate, now reading over his shoulder. He's so close, what do I do? Midoriya questioned. He bit his tongue to keep his mouth from betraying him. How can you read this? Aizawa grumbled. His hand traced the burnt edges of the page. The rest was covered in bird ink, though some pages were better than others. I've memorized it. I've memorized them all, he whispered. His voice was sad and heavy as if years of disappointment and sorrow were ingrained in him. Aizawa wouldn't ever admit to it, but he did want his soulmate. He has wanted his other half ever since he had the mark. Even now all he wanted was to hold him, tell him that whatever happened wasn't his fault even though he had no clue what he's been through. An old friend of mine did this, Midoriya started, his voice so delicate that it could crack at any second. He didn't think I could be a hero. No one at my old school did. So, why is it destroyed? Aizawa wasn't sure if asking any questions would help him or if it would just revert him to his stuttering habits. He didn't think I could be a hero, so he destroyed my chance at being one, was all he said, still flipping through pages. Aizawa grabbed the more recent one, number 16, and opened it. He noticed Midoriya tensed when he picked it up but didn't say anything. Saying he was impressed would be an understatement. He had quirk analysis on all of his classmates. If there was room at the bottom of the page, he would leave fun facts about them. Aizawa flipped to Uraraka's page, skimming it, then noticed the fun fact at the bottom. Fun fact, Uravity gets sick if she uses her quirk for longer than a half hour with small objects, but any large objects she could only last a fraction of the time. I recommended she use her quirk on people during training. They aren't too heavy and could use it to their advantage while she got better at using it. Aizawa stared at his soulmate. He was proud of him. Words couldn't describe how proud he was. What was your quirk again? He asked, reading more facts and recommendations to help his students' quirks as he skimmed the pages. Midoriya tensed up at the question. They had been sitting together talking for the past few minutes and it was nice. Being with him was nice. But he couldn't lie to his soulmate anymore. Yet he had to. SS superpower. Show me. What? I said show me. Aizawa closed the book, looking his soulmate in the eyes. Midoriya almost finished being under this much scrutiny. Aizawa-sensei, Midoriya stuttered out, threw Aizawa through a loop. Unless you're lying, you have no reason not to show me right now. He was annoyed. He knew there was something up with his new student, but he lied about his quirk. How did Nezuo? Midoriya bowed his head, afraid to look him in the eye. He just had to tell him he can't lie anymore, especially since he was his soulmate. I don't have a quirk. He let his head hang lower, afraid to see the look of disappointment cross his face. No one wants a quirkless soulmate. It's what Kaken always said. What? Aizawa practically hissed. For the past 2 weeks he's been training him on physical exercises as well as methods to use quirks without overexerting himself. He's taught him like he was a part of the class when he was a quirkless kid with one hell of a Netsu, he grumbled, feeling his anger dissipate, though it was only by a bit. Sensei. Midoriya lifted his head to see the annoyance crossing his face. It was a look Midoriya hated to see. Why are you in my class if you don't have a quirk? Aizawa questioned. Midoriya stiffened as the capture scarves slowly unraveled from his neck. And then Netsu PP put me in a nursery class. Why? I don't be belong anywhere. Tears stung his eyes. He tried to will them away, but they still lingered. The idea that he had lied to say in a class he didn't belong in, that he didn't really have a place in the school where he belonged, hurt him. So he put a quirkless student in the top hero class expecting you to succeed. Aizawa was getting more and more annoyed. It frustrated him that he was just now finding out about this, but even more that this was the first conversation they had in weeks. And no, wait, yes, no. What is it? He wanted me to succeed as a quirkless hero, he started, his head falling back down to look at the desk. I was born quirkless, so I learned to observe and level the playing field. But after he told me I couldn't be a hero, I gave up trying to observe quirks for myself. Instead, I help heroes when I can, but Netsu said I didn't belong in a class for psychics, but being in a hero class was dangerous. Yet I agreed. Maybe I could learn to fight and tip the scales in my favor. But I see now, in his society, there is no room for the quirkless. His voice was so quiet, so slow as if every word was stuff he had said to himself, but in the end, he realized he couldn't be here. What are you doing? Aizawa watched as his soulmate packed his backpack, pulling the notebooks into his arms, then stood up. Leaving the hero course, it saves you the trouble. He walked to the door, leaving hero analysis number 10 behind. The door slammed open then closed, his footsteps growing quieter as he retreated to the Gen Ed class. The soul mark stung. Aizawa rolled his sleeve up to see the cat hiss and swing at the bunny, who shook in fear. The bunny ran away from the cat, hiding elsewhere on his body. He pulled his sleeve down, then grabbed the notebooks he left. There must be something inside his soulmate wanted him to see. He skimmed the pages, noting that most of the heroes in the book were teachers at UA. He stopped at the page for him. It was a bit more detailed than the other pages, but instead of a fun fact, there were two. Fun fact, he has to use eye drops because he has dry eyes. For such a cool quirk, it sucks to have a drawback, though it is understandable. It's a quirk focused around his eyes ... that must sting after a while. Fun fact number 2, he's my soulmate. Why did I do that? He knows now, he doesn't want me. Why did I do that? Wait. Unlike before, he was trapped in his thoughts. He had gotten used to the moments where Aizawa pulled him out. Even thinking about him usually helped him calm down faster. But the more he thought about him, the worse it got. Midoriya. Kayama's voice echoed around the hall. He snapped his head up to see Sean and Kayama holding hands. If she didn't call his name, Midoriya would have surely ran into them. The embarrassment would have caused him to spiral as he was sitting on a ledge with most of his body hanging off. Jay, just going back to class, he muttered, trying to walk past them. Sean shot out his arm to grab his wrist loosely, effectively stopping the teen, who couldn't look either pro in the eyes. But one eye is on the opposite side of the building. What Sean had stopped talking the minute he raised. Midoriya lifted his head. His eyes were red and puffy as if he was trying to rub away the tears that wouldn't stop falling. His lip quivered slightly as he shifted his gaze to Kayama, who was stunned. And quirkless was the last phrase the pros would have expected to hear from him. The amount of shame and sorrow that came with it sounded so heavy yet so familiar to him that it made the situation worse. But how? You were in the hero course. Kayama looked at Sean with a confused look, like nothing made sense in this scenario. Nedzu wanted me in the class, Midoriya replied sadly. He tried to shrug his wrist out of Sean's grasp, but he only pulled him back, almost knocking the notebooks out of his grasp. Then why aren't you going back? Aizawa-sensei knows. They stopped talking, knowing how ruthless the teacher was. Kayama noted how gloomy he looked. She could see a blur of green running away from something before a blur of black chased after it. You know, don't you? Know that he's my soulmate. Since I first started school. Tears pricked at his eyes once again. I figured if I didn't tell him we would both be happy, that maybe he could keep the titles he has worked so hard for. But I have been so afraid to talk to him and tell him the truth, to wait for rejection because no one wants a quirkless soulmate. The words were gritted out as tears slowly fell. Sean had let his arm go enough for him to pull it back and continue his walk back to class. What is he thinking? Kayama had thought as she stormed her way down to Aizawa's class. In this society, the quirkless are beaten to almost nothing. Kayama thought better of her best friend, yet he kicked out a quirkless kid and broke his heart in the same go. Nimuri, no. Sean could see the anger rising in his wife. Her head snapped back to the gloomy student that rounded the corner to his class, then towards the direction of class 1 where Aizawa was teaching. Nimuri, yes, she hissed, teeth grit hard as she stormed down to the class, taking the necessary shortcuts back. All the while Sean kept his mouth shut. If there was anything he learned from the many years of being bonded to her, it was to follow when she went on tyrants like this. Slamming the door open, Midnight ignored Sean's protests as she grabbed the half-asleep teacher and dragged him into the hall, shutting the door behind her. Give me one reason why I won't tell Hisashi. For being such a lovable person, the man would hold a grudge till the day he died. Is he coming back? Aizawa asked. He wanted to talk to him even if it wasn't private, but from the angry look from his best friend, and assuming Sean too, he doubted it. No, but he is crying and walking back to the Gen Ed class. Shouta, what did you do? Kayama hissed. She typically didn't use people's first names unless they were alone. There wasn't a doubt in her body that the headphone girl was listening to the conversation. I got angry at him, he said, simply shoving his hands into his pockets, all while he was ignoring the burning sensation that spread through his body as the soul marks attacked the other. I taught him like he was a part of the class. I found it strange that the problem child wouldn't use his quirk. Instead, he learned to fight. I never thought he would have been quirkless. But this was all Nedzu's doing. I know that. Aizawa turned to walk back in, but Snipe grabbed his arm and pulled him back, anger radiating off of him. Talk to the boy. If you're not careful enough, you will break this bond. You know those don't come back. he warned. Though Aizawa already knew this, he could feel the bond breaking as the animals fought. It wouldn't last more than a week at this rate. I can only try. With that, Aizawa walked back into his class more exhausted now than before they had the conversation. The class scrambled to get back to their seats, quiet as they waited for him to speak, though Uraraka had another idea. Where is Midoriya? She saw him at lunch, but after he ran to class to get materials to teach the class tomorrow, he disappeared. He had to talk with Nezu. I don't expect him back until tomorrow, Aizawa said simply as he reached for his sleeping bag. We're going to USJ in 2 days. Some of you have support items ready to be looked at. You can go, just don't be disruptive. With that, he fell asleep, leaving class one to their own devices, though some did leave in pairs to go to the support class. Midoriya. He lifted his head to face the teacher. Ectoplasm. Currently he was supposed to have math, but he was only spacing out. I thought I saw you in class 1A. Why are you back here? I didn't make the coup cut. He stuttered, rubbing his already sore eyes. Aizawa found out you were quirkless, he asked. It was no secret to his teachers that he had no quirk. It saved him the hassle of trying to explain why he could do quirk-related tasks. He asked me what my quirk was, and to prove it, he looked up at his teacher, then back down at his paper, unable to motivate himself to do the work. I couldn't. Lie to my soulmate, Midoriya. He had to inform Nezu that he was your soulmate, even if nothing happened between you both. The teacher looked at the class, then towards the clock. Since you have been working so hard, you have a 15-minute break. The class erupted in cheers and walked out, the last student slamming the door shut. He lost his job, didn't he? He knew it. Aizawa was bound to a quirkless student. He lost his job as a hero and a teacher. He must be furious with him right now. Midoriya wouldn't blame him. Maybe if he told Nezu he would break the bond, then he... No, soulmate bonds make it illegal for teachers or people in power to be fired over bonds. You can't help who you bond with. Ectoplasm sat down in the seat next to Midoriya. Though he couldn't express it through his mask, he was concerned for the boy. Oh, was all the teen could say. For as much as he talked, he didn't have anything to say about this new information. But it did fill him with joy. He wanted the bond to work between him and Aizawa. This was the only thing stopping him from properly talking to his soulmate. Why did Nezu let you into the hero class? Ectoplasm had an idea as to why, but letting a quirkless student in was a reckless idea. He said, my observational ability doesn't fit with a psychic, but it's not hero quality yet, so he put me in the hero class to challenge me. And you left. If I didn't leave, Aizawa-sensei would have kicked me out. How are you sure? What? He is famous for kicking students out that have no potential in the hero course. I say you have more than enough to stay. He may have been mad that he was lied to, but kicking someone out that had no potential wouldn't happen. Ectoplasm had a feeling he wouldn't stay in this class any longer, though there might be another issue preventing him from going back. I don't want to face him yet, Midoriya replied. If he did return, he would have to talk to Aizawa about the bond. He didn't want to be rejected. Not after learning he could have a shot in the class and his soulmate wouldn't get fired. You told him he was your fated? Yeah, I know he will reject me. Everything that prevented me from telling him before is not an obstacle anymore, and I thought I might have a chance, but if I went to him now and talked to him, I just know he might reject me, and I don't think I could live with that. I wanted my soulmate all my life, and now I met him and he will Midoriya, the teacher called, calming him down before his rambling escalated into a panic attack. Just talk to him. You need to go back to your class. Glancing back at the clock, he stood up and walked towards the door. Aizawa has a free period in a few minutes. It's usually when All Might takes over, and he spends it in his classroom sleeping. If something happens, you can always come back to class. With that, Midoriya shakily stood up, collecting his belongings, and walked to the door. Ectoplasm opened it, and he walked out, turning to face the teacher once more. He smiled and bowed slightly. Thank you. With that, Midoriya walked back to class, wanted to face his soulmate. Sensei, Midoriya called, opening the door, then shut it behind him. See, can we talk, please? Midoriya, Aizawa grumbled, sitting up behind his desk. Though the student had turned away immediately, a blush spread across his face just from his teacher uttering his last name. He couldn't simply say we need to talk about the bonds. It was too hard to do. We need to talk, Aizawa had said, folding his sleeping bag up, then placing it behind his desk. Why, yeah. He placed his bag and notebooks on his desk, then sat down, waiting for him to start talking. What do you want out of the bond? Was the first thing his teacher asked. Midoriya lifted his head to look at his teacher in the eyes. What do I want? He fiddled with his fingers, embarrassed to even speak. If you aren't ready enough to talk about this now, that's fine. Aizawa sighed. The marks were in turmoil again. His heart hurt. He didn't know how much more he could take before breaking the bond for good. And no, let's talk about it. Midoriya had stood up suddenly. Aizawa only stared at him with a neutral face, unsure what his student would say or do next. From the bond, I just want love. Aizawa was expecting a lot of things, from hero work to the possibility he wanted a relationship. But this was something he wasn't expecting. I'm quirkless and people don't think the quirkless should even be alive, so love isn't something I get. Even my mom has seemingly given up on me. She tries, but caring for a son who won't get far is difficult. I don't blame her. Midoriya looked up at the teacher, wanting to see what he was feeling, though he doubted there would be anything but a neutral face. He was wrong. Aizawa had only stared at him in shock, a drastic change compared to the annoyance he wore only an hour earlier. Aizawa-sensei, what do you want? Midoriya asked, now self-conscious of what he had said previously. Same as you, love, family. The room grew awkward after that. Aizawa had more questions, but he could see how flustered the teen was. Finally, he asked his next question. Are you okay with being bound to someone 15 years older? Why yay? Midoriya had practically shouted, afraid he would hurt his soulmate if he wasn't clear. As since there are no legal repercussions, I don't mind. I was just what? Aizawa had walked closer to Midoriya, testing to see how close he could be. Afraid you would lose your job, your life if our bond was found out. Midoriya had noticed him get closer, but was a bit relieved he was starting to accept it. What if someone your age wanted to date you? Would you ignore the bond for them? It was a question that made Aizawa ignore the bond. He just knew if a student had confessed, Midoriya would say yes. No, I would tell them I had a soulmate. Midoriya saw the small smile on his face, his growing a bit wider. Wouldn't you want to date present Mike? What? Leave it to his soulmate to figure out any past relationship he had. I noticed how close you guys are. I understand TTH that you are best friends and he's your. We had something in the past, deciding that if either of us didn't have a soulmate by the time we graduate we would have gotten together. Sorry I ruined that plan, Midoriya muttered. He felt bad that he had stopped their relationship from growing, though he couldn't stop his own birth, so the guilt was pointless. We got over it. Silence. Neither said anything once again, frankly. Both had so many questions they didn't know what to say. How long have you known? Aizawa asked, still judging if he should accept the bond or not, though he was almost certain he would. Since the first day of school, you. Midoriya had stood up. At this point, as Aizawa was getting closer and he was determined to prove he wanted the bond. Since I met you in front of the classroom, if he wanted to, he could have reached out and held the teen, yet questions and nerves kept both parties from doing it. If we accept the bond, would you live with me? It was common knowledge that the bond needed contact, from cuddling to hand-holding, just something to keep it active. Usually, after a few months of a stable bond, soulmates live together. If you would have me, Midoriya replied, shakily reaching out and grabbing Aizawa's hand. It was gentle enough for the teacher to pull away if he wanted, but at this point, both were seemingly desperate for contact. If Midoriya hadn't reached for him, then Aizawa surely would have pulled him close moments later. The current that had scared Midoriya and confused Aizawa at first was now a force that both welcomed. Midoriya had leaned forward, pressing his head against Aizawa's chest. In turn, Aizawa had wrapped his free arm around his shoulders, trying to bring him in closer. The bonds that were burning Aizawa had calmed down immensely. He knew if he looked they would most likely be cuddling together, though in Midoriya's case, he couldn't feel the burning. Years spent with his best friend has proved his nerves were no longer able to feel anything that was considered warm. But this ignited his nerves. Any tension, fear, or paranoia had seemingly slipped away. It was moments like these that kept his mind clear. But he knew if he didn't ask there wouldn't be too many of these moments. Sensei, he questioned, pulled his head away to look up at his teacher who was practically falling asleep. He cracked his eyes open and looked down at his soulmate. Do you accept the bond? He rushed out, though it wasn't loud and just his usual mumbling. Aizawa had a feeling he knew what the teen was asking. I should be asking you that, Midoriya. It was the last thing Aizawa wanted, his soulmate feeling pressured by him. Those bonds became toxic and died slowly and painfully. It was one of his few fears. Isn't it obvious? He whispered out. Though Aizawa wasn't happy with that answer, he wanted the consent more than looking for cues. If it's obvious, then tell me. Midoriya had seemingly gasped, burying his face into his soulmate's chest. Aizawa had found this almost too cute to resist. I want you, he muttered. In any case, Aizawa had already realized this kid could ask for the world and he would give it to him. What about me? Though teasing his soulmate was a bit too much fun. The bond. I want the bond. Midoriya looked up at him, his face red, and he was biting his bottom lip, but he kept his gaze focused on Aizawa. I want it too, Aizawa replied. The link, this pull that both males felt between them, had seemingly grown stronger, though the hug Midoriya was pulled into and their linked hands had sated this urge for now. Can we stay like this? Midoriya asked. Aizawa only hummed in response, finding himself once again falling asleep holding his soulmate. His head was buried in Midoriya's curls, the warmth and presence making it harder and harder to stay awake. When Midoriya moved his head to look up, he noticed how sleepy his teacher looked, which led him to gently moving out of his grasp and leading him back to his desk where he could sleep and Midoriya could read at his own desk. But when he had brought the half-asleep man to his desk and he tried to let go of his hand, the teacher wasn't having it. Instead, it led to Midoriya being placed in his soulmate's lap as he fell asleep. A different outcome than he predicted, as he didn't think his soulmate would be this touchy-feely. He leaned his head back, Aizawa nuzzling his head into the crook of his neck, his arms wrapped around his soulmate. Midoriya placed his arms over his teacher's, closing his eyes as they both relaxed. If he knew cuddling with his soulmate would be this nice, he would have. A voice had called, waking Aizawa up. Though it didn't scare him as much as it did Midoriya. Aizawa had let him go. Midoriya had quickly shifted out of his lap, though his hand was still covering Aizawa's. There you are. What are you? He glanced over to see a beet red Midoriya who was trying to avoid eye contact. Nimori, they made up. Way to go, Shouta, she called, and Snipe had closed the door behind them for privacy reasons, as he knew they would fawn over their new bond. Sean, Midoriya chirped, happy to see one of his new favorite heroes besides his soulmate walk in. Aizawa didn't like how close they were, though the jealousy did stem from instinct, as he assumed Midoriya was jealous when Yamada was all over him. Did you tell him? Sean asked. Midoriya smiled widely in return, nodding his head happily. Yeah, he accepted, he replied. Sean ruffled his hair happily. Aizawa wasn't a jealous person, but he didn't like this one bit. So, what happened? Give us the details, Kayama asked, sitting down next to him. He didn't say anything back, just watched his soulmate and Sean interact. A wicked smile crossed her face as she walked over and hugged the teen, pressing his face into her chest on accident. You are just a sweetheart, she cooed. Aizawa rolled his eyes, then closed them. He didn't want to watch anymore. Midnight, Midoriya stuttered. He felt rather uncomfortable and wanted to hide next to Aizawa. Sweetheart, I don't think he can breathe. Sean had chuckled out. She let him go, only to watch him scurry back over to Aizawa and bury his head in his chest. Aizawa wasn't a jealous person, but he didn't like sharing what was his. The bell had rung, ushering the trio out of the classroom, leaving the newly bonded pair sitting alone in the class. What Aizawa had learned was Midoriya got easily flustered, a fact he had learned the day they met, so it was used to his advantage. Every time one of his friends embarrassed the teen, he had buried his face into Aizawa's chest. Aizawa-sensei. The bell rang. The rest of the class will be here soon. Aizawa had cuddled up against his faded, then took a few-minute naps. Fine, you need to explain to your peers that you're quirkless, he had replied, letting him go. Midoriya, who was getting ready to walk back to his seat, turned around in shock. I can't they know. He stuttered out, memories of his middle school years bubbling up as if suppressing them was no longer an option. Aizawa realized he had made a mistake and stood up. The slight bit of panic subsided as he ruffled his hair, the touch calming him down. Not at once, just over time. You can't lie to your team, as all he said before taking his place at the front. Midoriya took it as a sign to walk back to his desk and waited for the familiar sound of shouts and cheers from his class to arrive. Not even a few moments later, the door was slammed open and Bakugo walked in, stopping when he saw Midoriya sitting there, writing in his notebook. Why are you back, Deku? Bakugo growled, the explosions going off in his hand. He noticed the small stack of notebooks on his desk and lunged for them, ready to burn off his final chance of being a hero. Though Midoriya was quicker, shoving the pile under his chest, he shields them. Aizawa erasing his quirk the minute he noticed things getting out of hand. Instead, he had beat his hand against his back, a groan escaping the teen. He raised his hand again to pound his fist on his back, but Kirishima had restrained him. Midoriya, are you okay? Uraraka asked. He looked up and nodded, smiling weakly. Doesn't hurt anymore, just took me by surprise, was all he said, sitting up slowly and adjusting the stack of notebooks on his desk. Aizawa sent Bakugo to the office, with Kirishima holding him back as they left. He would have to add this to the many questions he had to ask Midoriya. Are those the hero notebooks? Mina asked, walking over to his desk. Why, yay, did you want to read one? He asked, handing her number 12. He had updated it earlier to match new information he learned walking home a few days ago. Sure. She rubbed her hands onto her uniform. He had assumed it was to wipe off acid or sweat, before grabbing the one he had handed out. Mina opened the pages. Others read over her shoulder as they were in awe of the writing and hero costumes. You analyzed all of these? Uraraka asked. He nodded meekly. Aizawa hadn't said anything, but he was proud of his soulmate. Why, yay. He turned towards Ida and held out number 9. Your brother is in here. How did you? Not many people have engine-related quirks. It seems to be common between you and someone else, your brother, or as people know him, Ingenium, he explained. Ida smiled widely and took the book. Todoroki and Uraraka read over his shoulder as he skimmed the pages, looking for his brother. What about the UA teachers? Yaoyorozu asked. A few turned to look at him, but he only chuckled. And Nedzu thought it was dangerous. I had information, detailed at that, on all the teachers, so he had to take the notebook. But I've memorized almost all of these if you have questions, he replied. Yaoyorozu smiled, her eyes full of wonder. Let's see. Midnight, what would you like to know? Her quirk and fun facts. Her quirk is somnambulist. It causes people who inhale the mist her body gives off, like Mina and her acid, to fall asleep. Though if she could ever increase the potency of it, it could kill people or at the very least put them into a coma. Works better on guys than girls. I think it has to do with a hormone that she gives off in the mist. He rambled a bit, eyes darting from the other students as they read the notebooks, his gaze lingering on Aizawa a bit too long, who was watching him in return, then looked back at Yaoyorozu. Fun fact, she has 2 soulmates. Snipe, I won't give away his real name, and another unknown. How come you know the real names of the teachers and heroes? Zero asked. Aizawa stared at him with a small smile. He was smart but doubted he would explain why he knew. I just listen a bit too much to heroes when they talk. They aren't very protective of their identity. He stared back at Aizawa, a smirk lingering as he spoke. Really, the teacher had thought, though he had to agree some heroes were careless with their identity. Also, they are teachers. If they wanted for you to use their hero name or civilian name, they would have said. Midoriya opened his newest notebook and pulled out a pencil. Sensei, can he teach right now? Mina turned to look at the teacher, who was dully leaning against the board. I suppose he could. I'm rather tired anyway. Aizawa had pulled out his sleeping bag and slid in, falling asleep behind his desk. The students took their seats. A few had grabbed a notebook he had left out to help understand what he would say. I could use somebody as an example. Immediately he saw people raise their hands to come up. He pointed at Tokoyami, who had his hands lifted by dark shadow. See Tokoyami? Sure, he muttered and walked up to the front. What can you tell me about his quirk? Midoriya asked. Mina raised her hand quickly. He's part bird. You aren't wrong, but that's a physical mutation. Like your horns and skin color. What about his quirk? He walked over to the light switch and flipped one off. Dark shadow had come out more. Ida, his quirk relies on the dark. He replied. Midoriya had to hide the proud smile he held when Ida answered. Yes, but there is a drawback. Tokoyami's eyes widened in surprise. How did? If it's too dark, Tokoyami can lose control of him. Think of it this way. The more light, the bigger the shadow you have. Dark shadow doesn't like the light, presumably because Tokoyami casts a shadow. When there is a lack of light, he doesn't cast a shadow, so dark shadow gets stronger. I only thought of this because of your name, a shadow that thrives in the dark. No one spoke after. They were too busy writing everything down into their own notebooks. I'm impressed. Midoriya, Tokoyami said with a smile. Midoriya turned the lights on and walked back over. I would like to watch your quirk in action next time we get a chance. He replied. Tokoyami nodded and walked back to his seat. How can you analyze a quirk on the spot? Aizawa asked, scaring Midoriya slightly. He looked down and saw his soulmate sitting upright and staring back at him in the sleeping bag. There are always tells. Mina, for example, has pink skin, so you can presume her quirk has something that makes her skin raw from use or acid. Though that's not always the case. Asui is a mutant-type frog mutation, but I can't judge what else she can do unless I see her in her element, in this case water. His eyes flickered over to Todoroki, who was writing something down. Todoroki may be a bit easier since his hair reflects his quirk, half cold, half hot, but I can't tell how excessively he uses it unless I watch for signs. Perhaps frost grows if he overuses the ice, or he sweats more if he uses fire. I don't know unless I see. That is correct, Midoriya. Though I don't use my fire side at all, Todoroki said, raising his hand slightly. How can you tell someone's weakness? Asui asked. Midoriya smiled, enjoying the teaching position. Think of it as basic as you can. You have a frog mutation and you need to stay hydrated or it could damage your skin. I can only assume after all, but if you got paired in a fight with Todoroki, he would have the upper hand because of his fire. He broke his gaze with Asui, then faced the class. Everyone has an elemental weakness, or in the case that you don't have something related to the 4 elements, a physical weakness. Like mine, my weakness would be the lack of lipids to make a new item. Yaoyorozu asked. Midoriya nodded with a smile. Uraraka would be getting sick after overusage of her quirk, as well as Aoyama. He faced his teacher, who was positioned in a way that no one could see his soft smile that was directed towards Midori. There are some who have a psychological weakness, say Kota, and his fear of bugs, though his quirk allows him to talk to all species of bugs and animals. Aizawa-sensei, is that okay? Midoriya suddenly became aware of all the rambling. His teacher soulmate was proud and found what he taught to be sufficient enough. You passed, you can stay. He never wanted to take his soulmate out of the class, and he assumed Midoriya saw through that lie, but he had to see where his ability was at. Midoriya, how come we can't see your quirk? Kirishima asked. He snuck in towards the beginning after dropping Bakugo off. Aye. He looked to Aizawa, who nodded and closed his eyes, falling back asleep. I'm quirkless. It sounded more like a question. It took a few minutes, but the class had erupted into questions and screams. Any questions? It was a few days later when Aizawa had told him of their surprise class. Though Midoriya was told before the rest of them for 2 reasons. He was Aizawa's soulmate, and Aizawa complained about how tired he would be throughout all of this. He needed his hero costume, submitting ideas to Hatsum after she was filled in about his quirkless situation later, which is where they were heading now. Hatsum, Midoriya called. The sound of something falling to the ground before footsteps barreled towards them. "Midoriya," she called, pouncing on top of him, her chest too close to his face. "I've never made someone's entire hero costume before. I had so much fun making this. See, can you get off of me?" Midoriya asked. He saw the look of annoyance on Aizawa's face. "Sure, I want to show you the costume." She dragged herself off his body, then into the workshop. Aizawa followed quietly, almost lurking. Sitting in a pile was a mess of green fabric and armor. It wasn't much of anything until Hatsune lifted it and he smiled widely. A green bodysuit with black lines adorned the torso. Though it looked tight as he wasn't a fast person, it didn't matter. White gloves with metal under the fabric as well as bracers for his arms. The legs had similar designs, though they were black with knee pads and leg bracers. A red utility belt of a similar design from the belt she had him try on earlier, though it had fewer parts. A metal mask sat on the table with the gloves and leg bracers. A few smaller parts were there he couldn't make out. "You are quirkless and people can hit much harder than you. These babies retain the kinetic energy so you could hit harder. They have bracers and metal to keep you safe. The bodysuit does look tight, but it has metal woven into it, keeping you safe from projectiles. The mask can help you in water terrains and when a villain has hazardous gas," Hatsune rambled, pointing to each design. "There are smaller trinkets I can always make more of, like smoke bombs and flash grenades. Unless they have a special quirk, they can't see through this stuff and it should disorient them." "Hatsune, this is amazing." Midoriya held the bodysuit in his hands. It felt much heavier than he thought, though he could get used to it. "Midoriya, grab the costume, we have to leave soon." The costume wasn't done until the morning of the trip, so testing it out would only happen during the special class at USJ. "Coming, sensei." Midoriya bowed before Hatsune handed him a box with his gear. He didn't have a case like the rest of his class yet, but this would do. Midoriya ran out of the room, the box heavy in his arms, through a smile ever prevalent. Aizawa found moments like these to be his favorite. "What's USJ?" Midoriya asked. Since they were at the school early, it was only a few staff members and support students like Hatsune who worked through the night on projects with given permission, of course. "It's a rescue simulation. 13 will be helping us today. All Might was supposed to be there, but a last-minute meeting has him working this morning. So I took his place." Aizawa looked down at his soulmate who was peering into the box. He ruffled his hair, then led him to the teacher's lounge. "But you and I will be doing basic fighting. Only your observational ability can save you right now. But that's why I use it so often. I level the playing field. They aren't inherently quirkless, but once I figure out how they work, they are," Midoriya replied, setting the box down next to Aizawa's desk. Then he walked over to the couch, now a regular spot for them to lay down together. It's only been a few days, but sneaking into the teacher's lounge when people weren't there, like early mornings or after school, was now a moment Midoriya looked forward to. The bond was still weak, recovering from the potential breakage, though accepting the bond was the first step to healing. Spending copious amounts of time cuddling or in the other's presence was step 2. "Wouldn't it be better if you had the upper hand?" Aizawa replied, suddenly feeling tired. He looked towards the clock, then back at his expecting soulmate. 30 minutes couldn't hurt. "True, but for right now an even playing field is all I have," he said, waiting for Aizawa to lay down so they could cuddle. It was Midoriya's favorite and most effective way of strengthening the bond. Aizawa didn't prefer to be this affectionate in public, but they were alone and he was annoyed and tired. Never the best combination. Whatever. Both slipped their shoes off, Midoriya placing them against the couch while Aizawa left them where he stood. Aizawa laid down first, facing the back of the couch. Midoriya laid against the back so he could face his soulmate. "I set an alarm so we aren't late," he replied. Aizawa only hummed in response, curling his body around the teen. Both arms were wrapped around him, a hand petting his soft curls. Midoriya had nuzzled his head into his neck, gripping the front of his shirt. They could get used to a life like this. "SHH, don't wake them up. But we were sent here to find Sensei before the bus left." "Why is Midoriya sleeping here?" "Dummy, he's Sensei's soulmate. Makes sense why they were avoiding the other for 2 weeks, obvious." Midoriya rubbed his eyes. He sat up slightly, though Aizawa kept a grip on his shoulders. He was still able to feel around for the phone he left in his pocket. "Aizawa, we're gonna be late." "Don't care." The teacher had moved his body to block more of the view from his peering students who had only woken him up moments prior to Midoriya. "Go to the bus, tell the driver Midoriya, and I will be there in 15 minutes. He cracked his eyes open to glare at his nosy students, Kirishima, Jiro, Mina, and Kaminari. They scrambled out, shutting the door behind them. "Aizawa-sensei, I preferred it when you dropped the honorifics." "Oh." Midoriya held onto his shirt tighter, biting his lip. If he wasn't awake, he was awake now. "Aizawa, I need to get ready. Get changed and come back." "I don't know how to put it on," he muttered. Aizawa froze, trying his damn best to keep his head clear. Wasn't working that well. "Okay," he sat up, letting him go. Midoriya didn't bother slipping his shoes back on as he reached for the box. "There's a bathroom around the corner for only teachers. Come out if you need help." He pointed to the unisex bathroom against the wall. Midoriya nodded and walked it. quickly stripping off his uniform and sliding the bodysuit on. Adjustments were made when his underwear rode up and when it hugged certain places. He walked out softly, not wanting to disturb his teacher. Hatsune put the zipper in the back. Could you? Midoriya looked down. Embarrassed, he had to ask for help. Aizawa stood up, stretching before wordlessly walking behind him to zip it up, though large pink scars had stopped him from doing so. He pulled the left shoulder down a bit to look at a smaller one. They were burn scars. Midoriya, another time please when we have more than a few minutes, was all he said, the fear evident enough to drop the subject for now. Though it didn't stop Aizawa from pressing a quick kiss to the burn before zipping it up. Midoriya beelined back to the bathroom as quickly as he could, practically slamming the door as he went. Aizawa shook his head, though the small pool of fear made him question his soulmate's childhood or possibly lack thereof. A few moments later, Midoriya walked out, his clothes folded up in the box neatly. The teacher smiled to himself before motioning to his shoes. We have to leave. Put the box under my desk and get your shoes on. With that, Aizawa walked to the door, watching as his soulmate slipped the shoes on quickly before pushing back the chair and slid the box underneath. Let's go. Midoriya grabbed his hand and pulled him gently, ushering him out. Aizawa was happy he waited for his fated. Saying he wasn't bombarded by questions was an understatement. The moment Midoriya stepped onto the bus, his classmates had a million questions. Word having traveled quickly, though Midoriya couldn't blame anyone but Kaminari in this case. Aizawa-sensei is your soulmate. How long have you known? Isn't it kinda illegal? When did you guys bond? The questions made Midoriya's head spin. Aizawa motioned for the bus driver to start driving as he stood up to address the class. Just like I don't expect my students to talk to me about their bond unless there was a conflicting issue, don't expect answers from either of us. He glanced down at his soulmate, who was a bundle of nerves and panic, for now anyway. With that, Aizawa sat down. Midoriya shuffled over, pressing his body against the window as he grew comfortable. Aizawa looked over at his soulmate, confused as to why he was pressed against the window. It wasn't a lot of distance between them, but it was clear he was trying to give him space. Midoriya, what are you doing? Midoriya glanced over at him in confusion. Well, I just thought you would want space. Since the B bond is new and why you might not like all of the attention from the C class. He turned his head to look at his gossiping classmates. Midoriya whipped his head around, eyes flickering down to his hands as he fiddled with the gloves, then back to his soulmate, who was holding a softer gaze. Though the suddenly quiet bus was a dead giveaway to Aizawa's nosy students in this moment, he could care less. But once Midoriya was okay, he would scold them later. Sleep, Midoriya. You woke up early this morning. He watched as Midoriya pulled himself away from the window, hesitantly leaning his head against his shoulder. Their hands brushed together, then Midoriya carefully linked them together. As long as people weren't watching, this was all the affection Aizawa could give his soulmate in public. Good night, Zawa, Midoriya muttered. The nickname made his heart swell with joy and love. Love. Aizawa closed his eyes, deciding that he would deal with the new emotion later, as he was too tired to think of anything else. He rested his head against Midoriya's, his soulmate muttering something, but no words were passed as they fell asleep. Aizawa-sensei, Midoriya, we're here. It was a soft voice that woke them up. Aizawa opened his eyes to see a few of his female students waiting for the couple. We kicked the rest of the class off the bus before waking you guys up. We didn't want you guys to get hassled, especially Midoriya. It was Uraraka speaking. She had glanced down at their locked hands before back to her teacher. Standing around them, essentially blocking the view from the rest of the class, was Uraraka, Yaoyorozu, Asui, and Gyro. Kaminari. Gyro barked. Footsteps that had grown closer faded away. That's why she was here. Yaoyorozu. You and Ida find 13. They should be inside and have them debrief the class about what will happen today. He didn't have to say what he was going to do. The girls only nodded and walked away. Aizawa turned to face Midoriya. He was exhausted, though after today he might skip class or sleep through it. A smile tugged at his lips. He was out cold but curling up to him as he shifted and pulled away. If only they weren't on a bus. Midoriya, Aizawa muttered, shaking his soulmate slightly. He found this to be the best way of waking him up, as it startled him, though he wasn't sure why. It was another question shelved for a rainy day. Aizawa-sensei, are we here? He noticed the bus was empty and outside the rest of the class was being told what would happen inside USJ. Sensei, why didn't you wake me up earlier? The panic was evident in his voice, though their hands were still locked, making it hard for that feeling to swallow him whole. Because we were both sleeping. He ignored the honorific for now, as he walked off the bus, shoving his hands into his pockets as affection in front of people made him anxious. His class only stared at him. A majority of the class had large smiles and thumbs up or waving, some giving head nods as if they were saying, "We give you our blessing." It was both a reassuring and terrifying feeling, as he knew if anything went wrong, his class would be the first to kill him. Sensei, Midoriya called. Running off the bus, Minda had looked towards the couple with disgust, ready to say something to Midoriya, but Asui had caught on quickly, grabbing him with her tongue. Be quiet, Minta. We are learning about USJ. The threat was hidden in the sentence. It was more of a shut up or you get hurt vibe than anything. He stopped struggling and given a thumbs up. Asui let him go but kept a close watch on him as did the other girls. I was told you were sleeping, Aizawa. How was your nap? 13 teased, motioning for the students to follow them inside. The staff was all made aware of their bond, in case something happened that required the other, but it didn't stop the teasing. It was a nap, he replied, though he felt more well-rested near Midoriya. What's that? Has the training started already? Hiroshima wondered aloud. Midoriya froze in fear as dozens of villains appeared from seemingly nowhere. His gaze flickered over to the rest of his class. They too were frozen, maybe not in fear, but no one dared move but 13 and Aizawa. Stay back, Aizawa barked. Midoriya flinched when he raised his voice, the fear taking over his body as more and more villains walked out of the warp. Dealing with a single villain is one thing, but dozens, not to mention a warp gate quirk. Glancing over, he watched as his soulmate pulled his goggles over his eyes. That only meant, this is real, those are villains. The paranoia ebbed and grew in Midoriya. He was afraid for Aizawa, for his classmates, for 13, and yet he left no room to care about himself. Midoriya. Aizawa placed a hand on his shoulder. The darkness crept back. Even if it was just for a moment, he could see what was happening around him. A frown was set on his face, this one set deeper than others. Don't get involved. What? Aizawa, you are quirkless. I can't risk you getting hurt. He sounded more like a teacher than a worried soulmate. It only made Midoriya frustrated. So what if he was quirkless? He could still fight. He has been learning to fight. Turning his towards the mass of villains, his classmates started to talk amongst themselves. 13. Why aren't the sensors going off? Yaoyorozu asked, though Midoriya was starting to dissociate. As the feeling of anger melted away, this growing sense of nothing persisted. You are quirkless. Quirkless Deku, I feel bad for your soulmate. Quirkless but not fateless. How did a quirkless kid like you get into UA? Izuku, honey, I don't think UA accepts quirkless students. Young man, you can't be a hero without a quirk. The thoughts ricocheted through his mind, his world playing like a muted movie. 1 minute the sound was gone, then it sounded like his whole world was underwater. He watched as his soulmate mouthed something, or was he talking to him, casting an unreadable gaze over his shoulder before jumping down the stairs. You can't fight them on your own, Midoriya muttered. His classmates looked towards him. Your power works best in stealth and one-on-one fights. Midoriya. Uraraka watched as he just stared blankly ahead because once again, no one thought a quirkless student could become a hero. Suddenly he was thrust into darkness. The shouts of his classmates woke him from the nightmare he trapped himself in. Ada, run, he finally shouts, hoping that wherever his friend was, he could run away and get help. He was shielding his face, trying to find the edge of the gate, trying to find his classmates. Midoriya, Ada called back, his voice distant. Midoriya just learned a new aspect of this warp gate quirk. Run, get help. He could hear him talking to someone else, then his engines revved up and he was gone. Moments later he was thrust into water. Looks like that warp gate can only cover a certain amount of area while trying to send people away randomly. He thought as he swam up, his lungs burning as the surface grew closer. I'm going to eat you up. Nothing personal, kid. A voice shouted. His eyes grew wide. He opened his mouth to scream, though no sound came out. He could see the mutant-type quirk. Noting the similarities to a shark, once the villain was close enough, he took the last moment of clarity he had and punched him straight in the nose. A sickening crack was heard before blood rose in the water. Asui took that moment to use him as a launch pad after wrapping her tongue around Midoriya's body. She placed him down gently. Moments later, Minda was chucked harshly onto the boat they were in. Thanks, Asui, Midoriya coughed out. She smiled through, a bit annoyed. How many times do I have to tell you? Komitsu, he apologized after scanning the area for any villains. Midoriya, what do you see? Minda asked, pushing aside the relationship. Midoriya and Aizawa had to save himself. 16 villains, all have a water quirk. I couldn't tell how many manipulated water and how many had sea creature attributes. He muttered, watching as they drew closer to the ship. How did you know? When I was swimming up, I counted the shadows. They were too fast to be something overhead, and you would have rescued me almost immediately after seeing me. It could be less or it could be more, but 16 is the number we have right now. He looked over the railing to see the villains preparing an attack. Let's make the most of it. Where did he go? It was the one thought he had throughout the fighting. As more villains went down, his anxiety heightened slightly. His eyes darted around when he was able to look, of course trying to find his soulmate. Why did I say that? Eraserhead, look how cool you are, Shigaraki shouted as he knocked out 2 more villains. Aizawa watched as the warp villain surrounded almost all of his students before they disappeared, including a very quirkless Midoriya. The sound of metal dragging against the floor snapped him out of his daze. He jumped to the right and knocked out another villain. He was worried, though more worried that his quirkless student was going to get hurt rather than a quirkless hero. Soulmate was going to get hurt. After all, he was still his student, far from being a hero just like everyone else. So then why was he this scared? Maybe it had to do with the fact that he was his soulmate. The only one he would have, fighting for his life somewhere with hopeful students that could aid him. But maybe it was because he was quirkless. This fear that society had ingrained in him that quirkless students can't be heroes, they wouldn't survive a single fight, was now eating him alive. If he could just see. What the fuck are you doing, Midoriya? Mind to how many of those can you throw at once? Midoriya asked, pointing to his head. They were going over one of the stupidest escape plans ever. The villains were murmuring amongst the others, trying to see what they could do to bring down the ship. Dunno, I usually keep throwing until my head bleeds. Minda grabbed one and another took its place. He threw it into the water. Midoriya watched as the villain tried to shoo it away without touching it. Zu, how strong is your tongue and how far can you stretch it? He was tempted to grab it but pushed that thought aside. The villains were getting the attack ready. They were almost out of time. Pretty strong. I don't know how far I can stretch it, but I can make poison if that helps. She shrugged her shoulders. It was obviously a normal thing for her and her family, but that wasn't something he thought of. Sue, Midoriya questioned. He watched as her hand started to collect small drops of a clear liquid. I suspected you might be able to do it, but this comes in handy right now. What are we doing? She watched as the whirlpool got bigger and bigger. It was almost big enough to take down the ship. Minda jumped back, ready to hide on the ship. Minda, throw as many as you can into the whirlpool, then make a pile behind us. Sue, wrap your tongue around me, and Minda, then when I tell you to make poison, make a lot of it. What are you doing, Midoriya? Minda asked, throwing as many grapes as he could, screaming all the while. Midoriya climbed the side, trying to get a better view of how many villains there were. A few had already gotten stuck to the grape balls, disrupting the whirlpool, but it continued to grow. Watching for any changes. The plan commences when you get that pile ready, Minda, Midoriya explained. Minda threw a dozen behind him. Careful he wouldn't get them stuck. Now start jumping. Midoriya, that's stupid. Just do it. He was aware Minda was the only one who couldn't get stuck, which is why he needed to make as much momentum as he could. Now launch yourself towards the villains. Sue will catch you. He needed this distraction. The villains couldn't throw the whirlpool if they were watching someone else fly over them. That's crazy, he shouted, though by chance he slipped, launching himself off the pile and rocketing right towards the villains. Midoriya watched as their heads turned for a split second. The screaming ball of purple was a distraction enough. Now Tsu, Midoriya called. She wrapped her tongue around Minda and gripped onto Midoriya, launching herself off the railing. He hissed slightly when the toxin had touched his skin, though he knew it was an accident. Looking down, he watched as the villains got shocked enough that a few were getting caught in the whirlpool. Some being blinded or burned by the toxin had also fallen in, leaving a few left who hid on the ship. We did it, Midoriya whooped, though even after reaching the group ungracefully and sure he broke something, the fighting wasn't over yet. He pulled his glove off. He must have saved some energy from swimming at least, and noticed the angry black and blue bruise swelling around his wrist. This isn't good. There were patches in his clothing from the toxin. Red burns that had stopped the minute they fell into shallow water. If we follow the shore to the exit, we can get help. He covered his broken wrist once again and pointed to the exit like everything was fine. Though she noticed the patches in his costume but didn't want to mention it, they were equals in a job like this regardless of their quirks or lack thereof. Good idea. That way we don't have to meet up with any of the villains Aizawa-sensei is fighting over there. She cast her gaze from the exit to the central plaza where screams from the fight could be heard. Midoriya frowned. The words echoed around from earlier. No matter what he said, he couldn't be mad at his soulmate, couldn't be frustrated or sad because it's true. Quirkless people aren't heroes, and yet he was here to fight with his class. He knew Aizawa just wanted to protect him, to make sure he came out alive, but it hurt when he just told him he couldn't do it. The one person he longed to meet, and the first time they are in a scenario like this, and he's told to run because he's quirkless. But how long will he hold out for? He muttered, the sudden need to check up on his soulmate becoming unbearable. Even though he said quirkless students couldn't fight, he had to try, he had to protect him. Isn't he forcing you into some sort of relationship? I mean, who would willingly bond with a teacher? Minda spoke up. Midoriya looked down to see him glaring at the plaza. That pedo gets what he deserves. You don't have to pro. I wasn't forced into this, Minda. I chose to accept the bond. He fought back, balling his fists. Minda rolled his eyes and shook his head as if he didn't believe him. No student would date their teacher, I mean only in those videos, and it's disgusting. You guys have a 15-year age gap. He must have forced you to do something. He kept egging on. Midoriya took one look at him, then turned away. He was going to see his soulmate whether the pervert liked it or not. The bond is still new, and you can't stop a bond that isn't yours. With that, he started his trek to the central plaza to see if he could help. That was low, Minda, Asui stated, following her friend. Midoriya, we won't get involved, just check and see if he's okay. Okay, though he had no intention of doing that. Why is he coming this way with classmates? Aizawa thought as he knocked down the final villain. Even though it looked like he was staring at the area around him, he was only watching as his soulmate smiled when he took the villain down. First it was 23, the voice snapped him back into reality. He saw Shigaraki charging him, then it was 24, 20, and then 17 seconds. He elbowed the villain. He thought it was successful until he realized Shigaraki was gripping his elbow, even though he tried to pull away. He was holding onto him with a vice grip. A giggle erupted from the villain. You have a tell. Your hair falls down when you deactivate your quirk. A rippling sensation of pain tore through his elbow as it disintegrated. He activated his quirk once more, swinging forward before jumping back, holding his arm as villains started to surround him. Aizawa was going to fight to the end. His soulmate was there. He was watching and waiting for him to come out of this fight alive, even if he is coming out unconscious. That annoying quirk of yours isn't suited for drawn-out fights against big groups, is it? Shigaraki asked as he stood up. The villain stood on standby, ready to take the underground hero out. Aizawa just knew under any other situation, Midoriya would have told him I told you so, though not outright. He warned him before jumping into the fight, but all he did was tell him a quirkless student can't fight. That could have been the last thing he said to his soulmate. The last thing he did was put him down so much he probably didn't even remember seeing Aizawa jump into the fight. Don't you think you're a little out of your element here, Eraserhead? He continued. Aizawa kept his gaze on the villain, monologuing while shifting his attention to the others, trying to get a baseline, trying to figure out how much he needed to continue the fight without dying. You're known for surprise attacks, not for head-to-head, but despite knowing that, you didn't hesitate to jump into the middle of this fight to put your students at ease. The villain got too impatient and lunged for the hero. He dodged, but just narrowly, his mind elsewhere for a split second. I would even say you were protecting something more than a student. A secret, perhaps. The villains all lunged for the hero. He wrapped one of the villains up like a mummy, then used him as a shield, fending off a mace, then throwing him into the villain. He let his right arm go limp as he finished off the other two villains. Panting as he kept his mind clear, it was dangerous to even think about his soulmate. And look at you, you're still standing, you really are so cool, Shigaraki exclaimed, holding his arms out. Then they fell to his side. So who are you hiding from me, Eraserhead? Is it a beloved student? A lover? He pulled a hand off his face to show the wicked grin. A soulmate. Aizawa unintentionally flinched at soulmate, which only made Shigaraki laugh. Your soulmate is here. I wonder who it is. Maybe that hero Kuwajiri took care of. A student. Oh, the possibility is endless. He sounded like a kid in a candy store. He kept guessing and getting closer to the possibility of a student being his soulmate. Well, if your soulmate was here, they best come out of hiding now, because hero, he stood up a bit straighter. You could hear the amusement in his voice. I am not the final boss. Isui had to hold him back as the giant creature gripped Aizawa's head so hard. Blood seeped from his fingers. He felt the soul marks for once. Even during their fight, he could feel this burn. It wasn't a burn at this point, but a shock of pain that kept flowing from the mark, in rhythm with his heartbeat. You can't go to him. If you do, he will kill you. She wasn't trying to say he couldn't fight because he was quirkless, but telling him that logically, quirk or no quirk, the villain would kill him. Isui, he muttered, the pain making him angrier and angrier. With a soul mark, it alerted you when your fate was hurt, or in cases like this, dying, and in those cases, it just fueled their partner with anger and adrenaline. Soon Midoriya wouldn't feel the pain. All he would feel is a blinding rage. With each bash, with each groan that escaped his soulmate's lips, the rage grew. The pain he has endured through his life becoming gasoline to a forest fire. Midoriya, if you get up, you could both die. She realized if Aizawa wasn't in the picture, he would run out there. But saying he could die along with him made him stay in place, only for now. He watched as Aizawa used his quirk against the monster, but he only stared back and broke his other arm. A scream tore through his soulmate. And that's when Midoriya saw red. A laugh tore through the plaza. Even the Namu stopped, and Aizawa saw what the commotion was about. Standing there, soaking wet, was his soulmate, who was glaring at the Namu, his gaze flickering over to Shigaraki. Then Aizawa, his gaze was the most spiteful of them all. Is this your soulmate? He looks pretty angry. I've only heard what happens when you hurt one. I've never seen it. He pulled the hand off his face. A joyful smile that scared everyone but Midoriya was plastered on his face. What's your name, boy? Why should I tell you something about me when I know everything about you? This wasn't a complete lie. He could read everyone but that beast, though he had a few ideas as to what it was, but he was trying to buy time, create an opening for someone to get his soulmate away from the monster. Oh, he was hooked. Midoriya held his interest. And what do you know about me? Your quirk. It doesn't just make tissue rot away, it does the same to any material. So we are looking at a quirk that rots away anything. I would argue that you dry something out so much that it can't help but fall apart. It's as if you take away the moisture and make it decay. He rambled. Shigaraki was amused. It's been a while since someone made him this amused. That's not all. Your quirk can't just kill someone on the spot unless you hit a vital organ. You need prolonged contact to make it decay. It took a few moments before you got through Aizawa-sensei's shirt and a few more to break tissue. This is interesting. You're almost as cool as your soulmate. How do you know all of this? Where did you research the League of Villains? Midoriya was buying time. He walked towards the beast, testing every ounce of luck that he had. I just watched. Just like I know this creature has more than one quirk, at least one main and a few spare. He pressed his hand on the beast. It seems relaxed and let go of his soulmate, who groaned when his head hit the ground. The look of amusement mixed with pride on Shigaki's face was one Midoriya couldn't forget in a lifetime. I want you, kid. You would be great in the league, he started, walking towards Midoriya. His signaled for the Namu to walk away. It did so, but not without looking back and staring Midoriya in the eyes. There was something too human about the beast that made Midoriya anxious. The boy had Shigaraki in his court. Now it was up to him if he wanted to keep playing or end the match. How? Why would villains want a quirkless kid like me? Not even my soulmate thinks I could fight. Buy time, buy time, buy time. He needs more time. Eraserhead, you have this amazing soulmate, and because he was quirkless you wouldn't let him join the party. That's not fair. He scratched at his neck a bit before turning back to Midoriya. Sensei would love to have you. Someone who could read the enemy before they realized it would make taking All Might down so much easier. He told me I couldn't be a hero too. People like that shouldn't exist. If only we could kill your soulmate without killing you in the process. His voice trailed off before he put the hand back on his face. We can just take him prisoner. He turned around, but there was no opportunity to strike as Kurogiri swarmed the area. One escaped. He's going to alert the pros, Kurogiri said. Shigaraki scratched his neck furiously, annoyed and now pissed. That's not good. He turned towards Midoriya. What can you tell me about the boy who left? It was at this moment Midoriya realized he could act as a villain or stay stubborn like a hero. His eyes flickered to this soulmate he was standing near, to his classmates who were watching, to the entrance where a few of his friends were helping 13. He didn't have a choice. What's in it for me? Think like a villain, buy time, keep them safe. Oh, okay. Shigaraki stopped itching his neck and faced Midoriya. You can join the league and help me take down All Might. Tempting. As tempting as it was, the hero had literally crushed his dreams. He had to keep going. Alright, what would you like to know about the boy who left? And Midoriya don't. Aizawa groaned. He couldn't tell how serious his soulmate was. You hurt me, Aizawa. It's about time society had learned quirkless kids still have a place in life. He snapped. The emotion, the bitter emotion that he has suppressed for years, was finally surfacing, having a use. You don't want a quirkless soulmate. With that, he walked closer to Shigaraki. What's his quirk? Shigaraki asked, clearly amused that the student had seemingly rejected his soulmate. Engine. I have yet to watch him in action, but based off our current location in regards to his quirk, I'd say we have 10 minutes before he came back. 5 minutes as a baseline if he was quick enough. He hoped this was enough to get them to leave. Instead, it did the opposite. Kurogiri, don't you think Sensei would like him? The warp gate had floated closer to Midoriya. His eyes flickered across the mist in front of him. So that's how you work, Kurogiri, he muttered. His eyes widened before he recoiled and stood behind Shigaraki. He would, having a quirkless child who reads people better than those with a quirk designed to do it magnificent. His voice had a twinge of fear as he spoke. Midoriya smiled at the fear. Go back to the entrance. Be ready to deal with the heroes. I need to talk to our newest recruit. Kurogiri didn't say anything. Instead, he warped back to the entrance, talking to the students there. You accept my proposition? Shigaraki asked, his tone cocky as if he already got him. Midoriya smiled widely, walking closer to him. No. With that, he swung hard using the force he saved up and punched him in the stomach. Shigaraki flew back, falling onto the concrete harshly. Midoriya stalked closer to him, ready to attack the villain once again. He sank down, raising his other fist to punch him again, but hesitated. I thought we had something. He whined, coughing slightly, then sighed. Namu, get him off. With an instant, Midoriya gripped onto his wrists for dear life because he just knew that in 2 seconds he would be the monster's new ragdoll and his owner was the only shield he had. In a flash he was in the air, still gripping onto the leader, who was shrieking as they rose and suddenly falling. Midoriya was punched in the gut by the beast and now falling down and fast. With quick thinking, he pulled Shirogakiri up and slapped his hand on the Namu, who in turn shrieked and moved away from Midoriya. Dust rose as their bodies hit the ground. Midoriya and his quick thinking had pulled himself onto the Namu last minute to survive the fall, as he was hoping for it to be knocked out. Instead, he learned the beast could absorb shock. Aizawa groaned as he lifted his head slightly to check on his soulmate, but was presently surprised as he slid off the Namu, essentially dragging an unconscious Shirogaki behind him. The idea that his quirkless soulmate just took down a hero by outwitting him. He would laugh if it didn't hurt so much. Midoriya, not letting the body go, walked towards his soulmate, grimacing as he walked. Everything hurt. His head throbbed, wrist and ribs most likely broken as it hurt to breathe, perhaps even a sprained ankle. Hey Aizawa, he muttered, letting go of one of Shurigaki's wrists to brush his soulmate's hair out of his face. Aizawa responded by tilting his head into his hand. Seemingly cat-like Midoriya would have found it cute had he not been covered in blood. Midoriya, he coughed. The taste of blood in his mouth made for a bitter reminder. I am sorry. He failed to notice Midoriya stiffen up and continued talking. I thought a Kiwi coughed, pulling himself up slightly as the Namu hadn't truly damaged his torso. Quirkless student couldn't fight. You proved me wrong in so many, Midoriya. His soulmate shot him a pained smile, pressing a kiss to Aizawa's forehead and stood up slowly. Aizawa's eyes shot open in surprise, his smile making it seem like it was nothing, but being someone who had dealt with it already, he was probably crying inside. Midoriya took a shaky breath in, coughing as tears fell from his eyes. He didn't want Aizawa to see how weak he really was. Spitting out a mouthful of blood, he glared down at the half-conscious man. Eraserhead ... You have such a cool soulmate, Shigaraki muttered. Midoriya had grabbed both of his wrists and pulled him, took a deep breath as deep as he could in, ready to deal with him once and for all. He would have been more scared if the scars on his body didn't already prove he's had quite a few brushes with death. With a sad smile, he pressed another kiss to Aizawa's forehead, possibly the last thing he would do, and slowly walked away, dragging Shurigaki by his wrists. The kicking and frustrated villain screamed for the warp gate to help him, all while Aizawa stared at his soulmate, his heart heavy, and for the first time since UA, he wanted to cry. Not out of sadness though, that was a close second, but out of frustration. His soulmate was marching into battle once again, his back bloody, but he couldn't do a thing. He's accepted this. Midoriya Izuku was going to die. He lived a good life. He met his soulmate, made friends who didn't care he was quirkless. That was still debatable. He's lived a good life. So if he had to die protecting his soulmate and friends, then so be it. What are you doing? Let me go. Shigaraki whined. With all the strength he had, he threw him a few feet away, taking an offensive stance. The villain pulled himself off the ground slowly, coughing heavily as he did, almost staggering as he got up. Why, you hurt my soulmate, you hurt my class, and for that, you will pay, he snapped, though all the villain could do was laugh. You're a quirkless kid with an observational ability that won't protect anyone. Midoriya flinched, but he kept his ground. Glancing over his shoulder, he noticed how Aizawa stared at him with a determined look. Casting his gaze over, and he looked at Tsu, who nodded. Shifting his attention back to the villain in front of him, he smiled and brought his fists up once more. Because of that ability, we are at level playing fields. I know how you work. I know how you fight. So now it is a test of determination, Midoriya replied, his smiling widening. It reeked of his determination. Shurigaki ran forward, his hands outstretched to touch the boy. Instead, he ducked down. Without missing a beat, he pulled his other fist back. Missed, Midoriya teased. Using the glove Hatsune gave him, he unleashed the kinetic energy he's been storing and punched him square in the jaw. The villain flew back, landing on top of the Namu that had yet to move. His laugh comes in between breathy groans of pain. You are better than your soulmate. He defeated so many villains, but you ... It took one hit and I'm down. Shigaraki, the pros will be here any moment, Kurogiri interrupted, the warp gate wrapping slightly around the leader. We didn't even see All Might. Maybe if we kill some kids he will arrive. He tried to sit up, instead he coughed and groaned. We need to retreat. If you keep fighting you might die. The warp gate slowly surrounded Shurigaki, waiting for him to yell and say no. I can't get up, he coughed out, raising his head slightly. Until we meet again, soulmate. It was quiet. No one said anything. Midoriya then turned and staggered over to Aizawa, his vision blurring but still walking in the general direction of him. Once he was in front of the black blob, he fell to his knees and onto his chest, his ribs popping, or maybe that was his lung. I did it, Aizawa, he stuttered, watching as the darkness ebbed and flowed, matching the rhythm of his shallow breathing. I beat them without a quirk. Aizawa shakily rose his arm, wincing as the bones grind together. It was the one the Nama stomped after all, and placed a hand on Midoriya's cheek. His thumb dragged over his freckles gently. He tried to lean into the touch, but his head only fell to the side. Midoriya Izuku passed out, but he wasn't afraid as he closed his eyes. He was ready to greet death like an old friend. Midoriya, Izu. A constant ringing in his ears prevented him from figuring out who was calling his name. He lifted his head slightly, groaning at the sudden headache and neck pain. It must be someone close if they are calling him by his first name. Izuku. Why the ringing cut in again? But he had a feeling they were asking if he could hear whoever it was. The ringing. It'd stop. He grumbled. Whoever was helping him froze. Make would stop. The ringing is quieter now. That's nice. The ringing. His voice was slow, dragging almost, but it's gone now. Good. Do you know where you are? A different voice, but he knew her. No, it sounded like a question. He could tell he was on the ground. Everything felt cold, and yet his back was warm. We are at USJ. When does training start? He grew excited. Training at USJ, how cool ... But his brain was so foggy. He knew her voice and knew who was calling his name, but he couldn't think of his soulmate. Soulmate, Zawa, he whined, remembering how beat up he was. Where's Zawa? Fear overtook his body, panic rising like bile in the back of his throat. He needs to see Izawa. Izawa is fine. You are currently bleeding out, the woman hissed, trying to push him down as he rose up. Is that why my back is warm? He tried to lift his hand and touch the wound, but he groaned. My chest hurts. Okay, Midoriya, we have to lift you now. Tell me if it hurts too much. Okay. It's okay. Kaken has done worse, he replied, trying to ball his fist but winced. My wrist too. He has a large wound on his back. The muscle is almost gone. His wrist and ribs are broken. He hasn't said anything else hurts yet, she commanded, lifting him up slightly. A tear slipped down his face as his back contorted. Midnight, he muttered. His vision was clearing up a bit more. She leaned down and smiled, pressing a kiss to his forehead. I'm here, kid. Snipe is just behind me and present Mike is with your soulmate. Her voice wavered slightly as she spoke. Kayama didn't have a kid, but for some reason, he was as close to one, even sticking to their hero names because he couldn't remember who she was or where they were. Midoriya was the closest thing to a kid she's ever had, and it's only made her worry about him. Is everyone okay? He asked, his voice slow and uncertain as if speaking itself was something he was remembering. But at least he was starting to remember the fight he had maybe moments ago. All thanks to you. If you hadn't taken the villain on, which you will be scolded for later, there would have been more injuries besides the ones from fighting villains in other areas of USJ. The stretcher seemed to be weightless. Midoriya felt like he was floating. Looking down, he realized he was floating. Why am I floating? He tried to reach an arm out, but Midnight pulled it back in. It was more like a mother trying to wrangle her child going through a shopping mall. Hiroraka made it easier for us to pick you up. She's with the other heroes looking for casualties, though I think she's enjoying her job. He turned his head to see her pulling around a rather large bunch of villains tied up. She looked a bit sick, but if being sick meant she got to send villains into the air, so be it. Okay, kid. We are almost at the entrance. She tapped his face lightly as his head rolled to the side. What's my quirk? Analyze me. If he couldn't even do that, then something must be wrong. A concussion then. Your quirk is somnambulist. It makes people sleepy. For some reason, guys are affected by it more than girls. I think it's your hormone. He stopped talking, then smiled. Is your quirk active? I am very sleepy. No, you are just losing a lot of blood. I need bandages now, she shouted the minute they reached the top. People swarmed the area, turning him over and started to attach a large bandage. Suddenly they were in an ambulance, being rushed off. In all honesty, they moved too quick for Midoriya to realize where they were at first. Midnight, his voice grew quieter. He turned his head to see who else was in the ambulance. A large smile grew when he saw who else was in the ambulance. Hi Snipe, I punched a bad guy. Good job, Midoriya. What else did you do? The pro wanted to keep questions going, afraid his heart rate would drop. Can I sleep, please? He felt his head falling back, eyes closing. No, not until you tell me what happened at USJ. Snipe was trying his best, afraid if he fell asleep he wouldn't wake up. Sleep first, Midoriya replied. His head fell down onto the cot. The teachers watched as his heart rate slowed, but it didn't stop. By some miracle, this kid was still alive. Shouta, you can't be out of bed. He turned to see Yamada standing there with a tray of food. I get that he's your soulmate, but you need to heal too. Midoriya was still unconscious, and it scared Izawa. His soulmate needed 3 different surgeries to fix his chest, back, and wrist. Even a healing quirk couldn't fix crooked ribs and an almost collapsed lung. I'm awake. He isn't, so there must be something wrong. He hated the bandages that prevented him from holding his soulmate. Luckily, his chest was for the most part fine. Though both of his arms were put in slings, Yamada made sure of that. Or he just had worse injuries than you, Shouta. The kid could have been paralyzed, yet he fought like a hero. He protected everyone, including you. Let him rest. He needs it. Midoriya had opened his eyes, confused. He looked over. His eyes went to the doorway, then Izawa. He pawed around for his soulmate's hand, flinching when all he could touch was bandages. Lifting his head slightly, tears welled up in his eyes from both the immense pain he was in and the state of his soulmate. Zawa, what happened? Why are you bandaged? His lip quivered. A bit of his memory was blank, but what scared him more was the bandages that covered his soulmate. He couldn't remember what happened to him, but Midoriya remembered how angry he was at Shigaraki. Large tears rolled down his face. The spot Shigaraki touched was now pulsating with pain. He couldn't help it. He hated to cry in front of everyone, but he couldn't help it. You fought like a hero, Midoriya. I'm sorry I called you quirkless and told you to stay behind. Because who knows what would have happened without his soulmate there. Hizashi, can you get a doctor? He only nodded, still in shock that Midoriya was even awake and talking. Yamada walked out the door, only to poke his head in one last time as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, then walked away. Zizawa, he hiccuped, seemingly brushing off his apology, and tried to sit up, but the sudden jolt of pain was another reminder to his possible failure as both a soulmate and hero. Taking a shaky breath in, he pulled himself up in one go, using both his wrists to support himself. A loud cry escaped his lips. Too much pain. Kaken, don't. He steadied out his breathing, then looked at his soulmate who was trying to offer his assistance, though the cast and bandages got in the way. I am okay. Midoriya placed his hand on top of his casted one, sending a smile of reassurance. It's not the first time I've been hurt like this. He cut himself off. The look Midoriya gave him was another time. Sucking in a bit of air, he nodded. How are you feeling? Like I just almost died, he replied, uncertain if making the joke was appreciated, though the soft chuckle that escaped Aizawa proved otherwise. I know the feeling. He raised his arms only to see the look of hurt settle on his soulmate's face. Midoriya, I'm sorry, is just who I am. I can't give myself a quirk, nor will I ever have one. But if you think this will deter me from the hero course, then you're wrong, he challenged. Aizawa shook his head. A smile tugged at his lips. I didn't think you would leave. If anything, this doctors ran into the room as well as a few cops. How is he awake? One asked, raising the bed so Midoriya could lay back down, though he still kept himself elevated now out of sheer spite and determination. I don't know. He has a steady pulse and his oxygen levels are normal, another had said. He looked around wildly, afraid. Zawa, what are they talking about? He called. But a doctor had stopped the other two from doing anything. His quirk decayed your back. From the amount of blood you lost, we thought you were dead, he replied. Midoriya's eyes widened in shock. The muscle in the area is now gone, though it is expected to grow back. However, what he had to fix was the small nick in your spine. Any deeper and you could have had a disc inserted. So I could have. He glanced up at Aizawa, who had masked his emotions by the typically neutral face he wore, though expressed what he could by sitting on the bed, gingerly pressing his arms into his arm. The doctor didn't say anything. Instead, he continued, your ribs were broken, all of them, and with a lung on the verge of collapsing. By sheer luck it stayed open long enough for us to repair it. Healing quirks were too risky with your condition, so we had to do surgery. Though the easiest repair was your wrist. The disc was splintered off and fractured, so we had to go in and screw it back together. The pins are keeping everything in place. Then after a week we can use a healing quirk on you and remove stitches in the pins. Both Aizawa and Midoriya were in a state of shock, but Midoriya recovered quickly and was replaced with a smile. He couldn't be sad. He's alive and no one was hurt, right? But I saved everyone, didn't I? Was there anyone besides Aizawa that had injuries? The doctors shook their heads, all taking on a varying amount of cases to check up on the students, but none were hurt. No, a few had overused their quirks, but nothing a healing quirk couldn't fix. Everyone is okay. The doctor turned towards Aizawa. And you should be laying down and resting. Not while my soulmate is awake, was all he said. They cast worrying glances before relenting. We have a ward for soulmates. Once he's stable enough, we can move you both to a shared room and bed, the doctor explained, then gave a small smile. You did good, young man. Being quirkless isn't easy, but you saved your teachers and class. With that, they left the room, closing the door. A nurse popped in suddenly. She smiled and pointed to the IV. I'm here to show you how to use the morphine pump. She pointed to the yellow switch that hung by the bed. Midoriya shifted slightly, wincing at the pain, but nodded. She closed the door and walked over swiftly, teaching him how to use the pump before leaving. Anyone could feel the amount of tension between Aizawa and Midoriya, and no one wanted to be in between it. Can I see my back? He asked suddenly, then looked up at Aizawa, then Yamada, who was sitting in the corner waiting to talk to either of them. It wasn't like him to be quiet, but then again, he felt as if he wasn't much help when it came to soulmates. Do you want me to help since your soulmate has two bad arms now? Midoriya cast a look at Aizawa, then Yamada once more. If Aizawa trusted him, then he would too. Nodding, he pulled the blanket off, determined to stand, and not of a picture taken. He threw the blanket off and tugged the IV stand to his side, now waiting for Yamada to help him out of bed. This was the exact opposite of a good idea, and even worse than bad. Wait, Yamada walked around and held his arm out. If it hurts, stop, okay? Use the morphine. As if that would stop him, Aizawa snorted, leaning against his faded as he slid off the bed. Luckily, the hospital kept him in his underwear at least. With a shaky breath, he took a step. He all but fell to the ground, his knees buckling after the inactivity and yet abuse. A fat tear rolled down his face. It hurt to breathe. It hurt to move, but if he wasn't this determined, he would be in the hero class at UA. Taking another step, he cast a glance at his soulmate, who nodded, then Yamada, who smiled widely at him, proud he was even trying. As he walked, it became easier and easier to shift his weight in a way that he would soon be able to walk alone with little to no pain, though it would be a trial run without the bit of morphine running through his system. I came to. What are you doing? A nurse shrieked, dropping her clipboard and medicine. Midoriya looked up and smiled. I wanted to see my back, he said simply, as if what he was doing wasn't dangerous. She tried to usher him back into the bed while scolding Aizawa for letting it happen, but Midoriya shrugged her off, determined to move. I wanted to see if I could walk as well. The door was still open, as if any moment she would run and grab a doctor to help him, yet seeing how determined he was, minutes after waking up, she couldn't bring herself to. You shouldn't be walking. Your muscles are fragile right now. You need to rest. She had noticed how his back was flexing. the muscles seemingly shifting to accommodate the missing piece. It should hurt. He should be practically sobbing, and yet, why was he smiling as he walked? Well, I want to see my back. No picture will do, he replied, leaning less and less off of Yamada and onto the IV stand until he was hobbling himself. Taking a shaky breath, he suppressed the waves of searing pain from his lower back. Even his lungs burned, though it was expected. Opening the door, he leaned on the doorknob before pulling himself and then leaned on the railing inside. Yamada had looked towards Aizawa for permission. He shrugged his shoulders in response before he rolled the gown up as far as he could so Midoriya could see his back. Aizawa hasn't been this angry even after USJ. The fear he held was for Midoriya, and even then it melted into a rage as Midoriya faced off against Shigaraki. The rage he felt now wasn't like anything else, practically seeing red. Scars of varying sizes, mainly burn, covered his body, some even wrapping around his hips to the front. Though he could see it, he assumed his chest looked the same, even with the bandages wrapped around his body. He could only imagine how big they were. Just who does he have to kill now? Midoriya was in a state of shock. The scars didn't matter, he was reminded every time he changed, but the middle of his back was something else. In the middle of his back, under the tightly wrapped bandages, he could see a piece of his muscle tissue gone. He flexed slightly and winced, though he was able to watch as the muscle seemingly shifted as he moved. Not good. In my back. The muscle can grow back. Unfortunately, to continue hero work you need armor in your new suit. Your back will be much weaker now that your spine had to get filled. It could take multiple visits to a doctor or someone with a healing quirk to fully heal the muscle, and even then the pain may subside, but some might not grow back. But you will be able to continue hero work. You will just need a few things for your costume, the nurse explained. He nodded solemnly. This is the life of a hero. He wanted to be a hero now. There's no going back. The sports festival is coming up, was all Aizawa said before the class went into a riot. For a moment at least. Let's go kick some ass, Hiroshima shouted, excited to fight once more, but the energy interrupted by Kaminari. Wait a second. Is it really a good idea to hold a sports festival so soon after the villains snuck inside? Gyro asked. Usually Aizawa would have to calm the class down once the sports festival was announced. Instead, they were thinking more realistically, more like heroes. Okay, he was kinda proud. Apparently the administration thinks this is a good idea to show that the threat has been handled and UA is as safe as ever, he responded, glancing over his class, their faces struck with a mixture of shock and fear. His eyes landed on Midoriya. He was too stubborn, just like his soulmate, and came back to school when he did. Aizawa found it adorable and he was promptly smothered in cuddles. Well, gentle ones for now. Ooh, why can't we cancel this? Mind asked. Midoriya turned around to talk to him, though the back brace he was forced to wear as a part of a deal to go back to school was causing him both pain and annoyance. Minta, don't you know how important this is? He sure as hell does. This was one of the only ways people would look at a quirkless student with respect, how heroes got their start. I just don't want to get murdered, he gritted out. Midoriya couldn't help the comment he shot back. Like I almost did. Even Aizawa went silent after that. He looked up to see the rest of his class staring at him out of pity, minus Bakugo, of course. Bakugo had been glaring at him for most of the period. Everyone had flocked to his desk to talk to him, asking about his health and what really happened, as the full story hadn't been released yet. Anyway, he glared at Midoriya, who only smiled bashfully in response. Our sports festival is one of the most watched events in the world. In the past, everyone was obsessed with the Olympic Games, now reduced to a smaller stadium. People watching the competition will watch the biggest tournament, the UA Sports Festival. It was enough to motivate the class to start talking again, ideas bouncing between friends and classmates. Midoriya, would you participate in the sports festival? Uraraka asked as she approached his desk. He nodded and rolled his shirt up a bit, revealing a black brace. They filled in the nick on my spine, but only part of the muscle has grown back. Because of that I have to wear a brace. Everything is too weak. He flexed his newly healed hand. It was fixed up last night by a nurse. Aizawa had taken him as his mother didn't know yet. How? He told the hospital once he woke up that he was in his soulmate's care. As stupid as it sounded, soulmates younger than the other were able to care for them, a guardian, until they were old enough to get married. Aizawa wasn't too happy that his mother wasn't here. But it was just another save it for another day topic, and he was getting a bit tired of the excuse. That sounds scary. Did it hurt? She asked Todoroki, and Ida had walked over to talk to him as well, as it was too chaotic this morning for anyone to talk to him. I didn't feel it. Lies. I think I was on an adrenaline rush after I saw Aizawa-sensei getting hurt. He looked up at his friends and smiled widely. I'm okay. Stop lying. It was just a bit scary. They won't hurt me, and I protected everyone. Aizawa still got hurt though. Why can't I be better? Midoriya, Todoroki asked. He looked up from his desk and at his bi-colored friend. Sorry, I must have spaced out again. I was just thinking. He stuttered out, waving his hands frantically. Midoriya, if you aren't okay you can say so, Ada spoke up. His eyes widened, then he laughed a bit. I'm okay. You guys are my friends, I would tell you if something was wrong. He replied, missing the looks that his friends shared. It was one of uncertainty. Well then, if you're willing to talk. Uraraka leaned down close, cupping her hand. Let's talk about your soulmate. And my soulmate. He glanced over at Aizawa, who was sleeping on the ground in his sleeping bag. Though when he heard Midoriya mention something about his soulmate, he cracked his eyes a bit and stared at Midoriya. He couldn't help being curious. They were talking about him after all. You're bonded to Sensei. After all, we are curious. Todoroki agreed. He shrieked a bit and covered his now red face. What's it like being bonded to someone older? Ah well. His voice trailed off. He peeked through his arms to see Aizawa fully awake and staring back at him. Aizawa rolled over, his back to the class, and for some reason that hurt Midoriya. I don't mind it. So you don't find him handsome? Uraraka asked. He shook his head widely. No, that's not it. He smiled and stared at his desk, fiddling with his sleeves. He's more than what I thought my soulmate would be. Kind, caring, and he doesn't care that I'm quirkless. A part of him knew he was listening. These were thoughts he's had and never a chance to say them. So you do find him attractive? Uraraka said loudly. Midoriya yelped and pulled her down. He didn't want to get the rest of the class's attention. I do. But I don't want everyone else to know a lot about this. He stammered. She nodded dumbly, then he let go. A wide smile crossed her face. So then, what did you think your soulmate was like? What? I just said. No, silly. When you were little, what did you think he was like? Well, She giggled and looked over at Aizawa, who she was certain wasn't asleep anymore. It seemed Ada and Todoroki were interested in this conversation as well, though they were both too shy to ask the questions. She was. Well, I just wanted someone who wouldn't care I was quirkless and who would love me. Appearances don't matter. Sure, he's very attractive. He cut himself off. His entire body felt like it was on fire. Ada had coughed a bit, hiding his chuckles, and Todoroki only smiled, a tad jealous of their relationship. And Uraraka, she was laughing loudly, holding her stomach as she sank to the floor. Uraraka, he hissed, though he stopped paying attention to Aizawa and started to calm down. Uraraka, as the rest of the class was staring at them. Why you just, she giggled again, this time placing a hand on her mouth, though it sent her floating. Now there was a floating, laughing girl in the middle of the room, and Midoriya was just too embarrassed to say anything. A few moments earlier, his soulmate had no clue what he was doing to him, does he? Aizawa had turned over to not only listen better without him really noticing, though he had a feeling he knew already, and to hide his embarrassment. So you don't find him handsome? Uraraka asked. Aizawa wasn't a fool. He knew what she was doing, besides fishing for answers and teasing her friend. Midoriya had yelped loudly, then mumbled something before he answered louder. The muttering was something so him that Aizawa couldn't associate it with anyone but him. He's more than what I thought my soulmate would be. Kind, caring, and he doesn't care that I'm quirkless. Midoriya spoke a bit louder. He was trying to tell him that he cared what he thought of his soulmate. Aizawa's face had heated up a bit. Slightly flustered and happy, he turned around now. Though it wasn't the only reason why he was happy. Closing his eyes, he decided he would give him a bit of privacy. That was until he heard his soulmate's nonsensical rambling. Well, I just wanted someone who wouldn't care I was quirkless and who would love me. Appearances don't matter. Sure, he's very attractive. Aizawa almost gave himself away. The rest of the class was oblivious somehow to the other conversations, but he was certain Uraraka knew he was awake. Though, a small smile wormed its way onto his face. He thinks I'm attractive. That was the last thing people notice about him. A part of him relished in the fact that his soulmate thought he was attractive, very attractive as he put it. Uraraka, Midoriya hissed. Aizawa sat up in his sleeping bag, sadly still open because of his arms. He noticed the state of his class, more specifically the state of his problem child and his friends. Midoriya was groaning in his arms while Uraraka was floating in the air. Todoroki and Ida were just watching the spectacle. With a groan, he started to shift. That was until Midoriya grabbed his friend by her leg and pulled her down, taking her hands and pressing them together. He was done with her essentially. Aizawa huffed, a small smile on his face now as he laid back down, proud of his soulmate. Uraraka had calmed her, giggling as the class ended. Aizawa let them do what they wanted for homeroom, and no one was going to tell their injured teacher no. Midoriya, I wanted to ask. Ida had a serious face, much different than the amusement he wore earlier. The relationship between you and our teacher. Did everyone think it was forced? Ida, I bonded willingly with him. Is it permanent? He blurted at the same time Midoriya was trying to tell him something else. What? He asked, confused as to why he asked. Is the bond permanent? Ada asked once more, a subtle blush covering his cheeks. Why do you ask? Luckily they were in the hall. Midoriya was pulled aside by Ada, who had shut the door. Now he knew why. I have feelings for you, and I wasn't sure if the bond was permanent. He replied. It was a much different tone than the present class rep in class. Ada, he wasn't sure what to say. He had Aizawa, but he didn't know how to tell his friend that they couldn't be together. We can't. I understand. He's your fated, but I just thought Ida cut himself off, shaking his head. I will see you at lunch, Midoriya. Ida, he called out, but the boy just walked faster, afraid to look back at him. I hope we're still friends. Wincing, he walked back in to grab his stuff, but when he saw Aizawa leaning against the board awake, he had a better idea. I thought you would say yes, Aizawa said simply. It was a fear of his, that Midoriya would find someone younger and break the bond. You could have, I wouldn't have blamed you. Zawa, no. Midoriya shook his head, then walked over to him slowly. It still hurt to move around. He had pulled Uraraka down but regretted that motion instantly. I told you, I wouldn't break the bond even if someone my age said something. Midoriya butted his head under his soulmate's arms, careful he would hurt them anymore. He wrapped his arms around his lower back, his breath hitching when he raised his arms. Propping his chin up against his chest, he continued to talk. I thought you heard me earlier, His voice trailed off, uncertain and anxious to keep talking. Aizawa seemingly sensed this, pressing a chaste kiss to his forehead as if asking him to continue. I didn't lie. Midoriya buried his face into his chest, embarrassed. Aizawa knew he wasn't lying, but hearing it come from him was something different. How am I this lucky? He didn't mean to say it out loud, but he did and still didn't regret it. Carefully bending down, he rested his head in his hair, enjoying the touch. Zawa, Midoriya whined slightly. He couldn't move any more closer, his back hurt too much, so he opted to lift his head slightly. Though in doing so, their lips brushed, sending jolts of electricity through the bond. Neither moved, neither dared to move, as if the tension that grew would dissipate in seconds. He looked away at first. Midoriya wanted to press a kiss to his lips. He wanted to feel that close to Aizawa again, but he wasn't sure how to go about it. It was his first kiss after all. Aizawa didn't know what to do either. He's wanted to kiss Midoriya ever since he woke up in the hospital, and that was a week ago. The urge to just lean down and kiss him hard was unbearable. Yet he was afraid he could force his soulmate into a position he didn't want to be in. They were stuck. Midoriya was the first to move, standing on his toes though his back screamed in pain, and pressed his lips to the corner of his mouth. Aizawa could feel him fiddling with the back of his shirt, so he isn't the only nervous one here. Good. Will you regret it? He had moved closer. Midoriya stifled a giggle when his stubble scratched his cheek as Aizawa pressed a few kisses to his face. And no, would you? Midoriya would have been lying if he said he didn't imagine them kissing. Now, after feeling some sort of resemblance, he wants more. Never. Aizawa was frankly happy, ecstatic even that his soulmate wanted this as much as he did. Kissing someone is pushing the bond even further, and sex was, well, the bond was permanent after that. Midoriya once again stood on his toes, ignoring the throbbing pain on his back as he leaned forward, wrapping his arms around Aizawa's neck, and pressed another kiss on the corner of his lips, uncertain of what came next. Aizawa, in turn, had shifted downward more, making it easier for Midoriya, and in one quick motion pressed his lips against his. The kiss was anything but sweet, yet sloppy as expected from both sides. Neither knew how the other would react. Even with Aizawa's experience, kissing his soulmate for the first time was a feeling he couldn't forget. Midoriya couldn't comprehend his emotions at all. His mind for once was drawing a blank. Everything seemed so right, and yet he couldn't think of anything else besides the kiss, as if his lingering anxieties washed away. His lips tingle. The mark that seemed to run across his body was igniting every one of his nerves, pulling away slightly. Neither broke eye contact, their lips just brushing over the other's gently. This time, it was Midoriya who had started the kiss, and already it was improved. Midoriya pressed his lips to Aizawa's so timidly, Aizawa thought Midoriya would back away. But when he moved forward a bit, cursing his hands for being bound in medical tape, it was all the reassurance Midoriya needed to fight fire with fire. He reached up, pressing his hand on the back of his head, pulling him down for a much harder, desperate kiss. Aizawa parted his lips, tilting his head slightly before leaning back down again. If only he was able to hold him tighter, show him how much he needed this. Breaking apart once again, Aizawa pressed one last kiss on his lips, then on his forehead. That was. Midoriya giggled slightly. Butting their foreheads together, he could feel the bond grow even more with each passing second. Messy, Aizawa teased, pulling away to look down at his bashful soulmate. I was going to say sweet, but that works too. Neither said anything after. Midoriya had leaned his head against Aizawa's chest. He found it comforting to listen to his soulmate's heartbeat. Aizawa, what time is it? Midoriya finally asked. He was confused but looked at the clock. 9:23. Why then it dawned on him. Midoriya was supposed to be in class with All Might, and yet they were in the empty classroom kissing and cuddling. Zawa, Midoriya whined, trying to slip out of his grasp, but the teacher only huffed and held a bit tighter, still mindful of his back. Just say you had a soulmate issue. The staff knows we're bonded, so they can't argue on that. He said simply. I mean, they had an issue if you count Aizawa's jealousy as an issue, but it was all resolved now. Fine. Midoriya shifted his weight, then winced. And maybe we can sit on your sleeping bag. Aizawa didn't reply. Instead, he lifted his arms and let Midoriya slide out, then slowly lowered himself to the floor. Then he raised his casted wrist for possible support as Midoriya lowered himself on a weird angle, trying not to engage his back muscles as much as possible. Once they were on the floor, Midoriya had scooted into his lap. Aizawa raised his arms, then let them fall in his lap. "How's your back?" Aizawa asked, pressing a few kisses on Midoriya's neck, then burying his head into the crook of his neck. Midoriya giggled when his stubble scratched him, but bared it even more. "Hurts, but I'm used to it." "Why are you used to it?" Aizawa finally asked, the question gnawing at him for a while. "Shelf it. We have another 70 minutes. We have time," Aizawa said simply. If there was something that was essentially hunting down his soulmate, he would find out one way or another. "Zawa." He whined a bit, getting teary-eyed over the memories, but pushed them away. "I will answer only that question today." After all, that question had too much to unpack. He wiggled out of his arms, then walked towards the door, locking it, then shuffled back, afraid to answer. Midoriya sat down in front of him, the pain subsiding as he moved, or it could be he was repressing something else as old memories surfaced. I have to show you first." Midoriya was aware they were in an empty classroom, aware that once he showed this to him, there was no turning back. He shakily undid his tie, then the buttons to his blazer, then shirt. Aizawa only watched as his hands shook more and more. He longed to reach out and hold his hands to confront him. With a final breath, he shrugged off the shirt. And once again Aizawa's emotions betrayed him. Scars and scabs of different sizes covered parts of his torso, red and puffy in some areas while constricting and tight in others. His skin was discolored. Jagged pale lines dragged along some of the blank areas. It was the first time he really noticed his arms too. How scared his hands were. They held more of the burn marks and a few cuts. Aizawa looked up at Midoriya, who was biting his lip harshly, trying to form the words but too afraid to do so. Whoever did this, it must have been years ago, he thought, trying to reach out, but the casts once again prevent him from holding him close and giving him comfort. "Kaken, he has a cool quirk, and sometimes I made him mad and he would. Tears rolled down his face. He bit his lip harshly so it would stop quivering. Aizawa lifted his cast to try and dry the tears, causing Midoriya to giggle slightly. He took a deep breath and continued, with a cool quirk, kids are excited. I don't blame him. Quirkless people shouldn't exist," Aizawa asked coolly. He didn't mean to cut him off, but the train of thought Midoriya was leading was one he had gone through after particularly devastating battles. He lifted his arms and pulled his soulmate in for a semi-hard hug. Careful he didn't hurt Midoriya anymore. "Don't say that. Please." He didn't know what to do without his soulmate, as dramatic as that sounds. It's easy for you to say." Midoriya lost his stutter the faster and more energetic he spoke. "You were born with such a cool quirk. No one beat you until you were almost dead and you sat there waiting for someone to save you." Yet he bit his lip. It was obvious he didn't want to talk about this part, but he needed to tell someone about this. "Yet you knew in your heart that there will be no one to save you, so you have to pick yourself right up and get home." Aizawa didn't know what to say. Sorry wouldn't even begin to cover it, but he had to say something. It wasn't fair that someone so kind, so sweet, so protective over everyone was once the person getting attacked for being who he was. Now it made sense why Bakugo, Midoriya, his voice was low, seeped in anger and rage. Had he been teaching an abuser? "Is this Kaken you speak of, Bakugo Katsuki?" He stopped shifting around in his lap, sitting still now, afraid to speak up. Please don't take him out of the hero course. He can't go." Midoriya stuttered out. He shifted in his lap. Now he was straddling him, trying to look at him as they talked. Though the shifting only made his back hurt, and Aizawa noticed how the scars moved, seemingly unable to stretch. "A student used his quirk on you illegally. He hurt you and you want him to stay? Why?" Aizawa growled, feeling very protective of his soulmate. He's wanted to be a hero since we were kids," he replied, his arms wrapping around Aizawa's neck, trying to get all the comfort and safety he could. Aizawa didn't reply. He only stared at the scars and markings. Then he saw their soul marks. The bunny had hopped slowly from around his shoulder, clearly hurt. Then the cat ran over and curled up around the bunny. Aizawa knew the marks were telling him to comfort Midoriya. Even in the state he was, he would pull the casts off somehow just to tell him everything was okay. "I have to tell Nezu about this. You know this, right?" Midoriya didn't respond. Instead, he buried his head into the crook of his neck. "I know," he responded, a bit confused right now. "I thought you would be angrier." "I'm very angry. So angry that I'm calm right now." Rage was coursing through Aizawa's body. If he could get away with murder at this very moment, he would try his damn best to kill the kid the minute he saw him again. "Okay," Midoriya replied, his tone much lighter than it was previously. "What, you don't believe me?" Aizawa teased. Midoriya moved his head, a small smile on his face. It was better than the quivering lip he saw moments ago. He pulled one hand away, pressing a finger to his lip as if he was thinking, "I don't think so. You can't take your soulmate's word." He pressed a few kisses around his face, pressing another kiss to his forehead, but this time he felt something along his forehead. Where is this scar from? He was only guessing, but by the look on his face, He guessed right. Oh, I thought you saw it and didn't want to talk about it yet, Midoriya whispered. He took his free hand and lifted his hair to show a jagged scar that spanned for only a few inches. He let his hand drop, then it sat around his neck, fiddling with his fingers again. Can we talk about it another day, please? Aizawa couldn't fight this. Midoriya laid out one of his biggest secrets already, and asking for another was risky. He sighed, then pressed a kiss to his forehead. Another day, he agreed. Midoriya timidly lifted his head higher and pressed a chaste kiss to his lips. Another day, he echoed, and once again Aizawa was cursing the castes. They had spent the rest of the class period cuddling, sharing small kisses and conversations. It wasn't an ideal place to hold conversations, but Aizawa had yet to ask his soulmate over. Now that they kissed, the bond was already requiring more touches to keep it stable, being more stable once they. Aizawa really needed to figure out a way to ask him over. It was a few minutes until the bell rung when Midoriya decided to let him go. He was rather enjoying how close they were, even if he could be held properly because of his bandages and his back injury, though Aizawa was reluctant to let go. Zawa, Midoriya whined. He tried to pull himself away without hurting either of them anymore. You locked the door, so there is no need. Hey guys, why did Aizawa-sensei lock the door? A voice called. Midoriya slapped his hand over Aizawa's mouth, then looked down at the state of his chest still bare and would be unbelievably embarrassing if his classmates saw them like this. Aizawa, Midoriya whispered. Aizawa was used to hearing the nickname every time we're alone, but now that he said his real name, well, he knew how serious it was. Fine. He pressed a quick kiss on his lips before letting him slide away and get dressed quickly. After a few moments, he fixed his messy hair and watched as Aizawa laid in his sleeping bag and closed his eyes. Midoriya walked to the door and unlocked it, smiling. Hi guys, sorry the door was locked. Aizawa-sensei was trying to sleep and present Mike kept barging in. His classmates nodded in understanding. A soulmate's job was to care for the other, and if Aizawa wanted to sleep, then Midoriya wasn't in a place to stop it. That's nice of you, Midoriya, Yaoyorozu said, clapping her hands together. Why didn't you come to class with All Might? Recovery girl told me I couldn't fight, and All Might isn't once to be gentle about anything, he said simply. She nodded once again. True, All Might sensei isn't too gentle. She pressed her finger to her face as if contemplating something. If you want to learn how to fight, you can always ask us in class. We wouldn't push you too hard as the teachers would. She wasn't trying to pity him. She was trying to help, and Midoriya appreciated it a lot more than she realized. Why Yaoyorozu? Call me Yao Momo. All my friends do. She smiled brightly before sitting at her desk. He turned around to see Uraraka smiling widely with her thumbs up, Todoroki smiling, and he smiled. Though a bit nervous, he still wore the comforting smile that Midoriya appreciated. Walking back to his seat, he looked at Aizawa, who was only now getting out of his sleeping bag. A part of him wanted to rush over and help him up, but neither liked showing affection so easily in front of everyone else. Watch it, Deku. Bakugo shoved Midoriya out of his way, walking in a few minutes later than everyone. He couldn't catch his balance quick enough and was going to fall right on his back. He screwed his eyes shut, ready to bite back the shock of pain he would receive. Only it didn't happen. Instead, he felt his soulmate's capture tapes wrap around his torso lightly, keeping him from falling while the rest restricted Bakugo tightly. Bakugo, Aizawa grumbled. He hadn't forgotten how vulnerable Midoriya looked, how scared he was to show off the scars that covered parts of his body in an unforgiving way. Though the look Midoriya shot him was enough to keep him from revealing everything for now. Don't do it again. He set Bakugo down harshly while letting Midoriya go slowly, making sure he had his balance once again. Midoriya smiled bashfully. It was the small things like this that made him fall even more for him. Do it again. Hurt a quirkless student or your fucking soulmate. Bakugo spat. He glared at Midoriya before stomping over and grabbing his shirt, his quirk going off in his hands. It's fucking disgusting. You're 15 years younger than him and he's our teacher. What the fuck is wrong with you? Midoriya winced, trying to cower away from the explosions. This time it was his classmates that stepped in. Aizawa was only able to nullify his quirk in time, his capture tape still reeling back from grabbing his soulmate and bully. Uraraka had slapped her hand on Bakugo, his once recoiled fist as his quirk had stopped once again, and this time he wanted to leave a mark while Todoroki placed a cold hand on Bakugo's arm, giving him frostbite until he let go of Midoriya. Fucking extras, he shouted, trying to activate his quirk to propel him towards Midoriya. But it was still nullified and Aizawa was able to grab him out of the air. Hurt my soulmate again and you will get something worse, was all he said before throwing him out of the class and shut the door. Explosions raged against the door, though they were made to protect the students so it held up even as the scent of charred wood floated in the air. One last explosion went off before he walked away, presumably elsewhere, but he was dangerous alone. Aizawa sighed and walked over to Midoriya, who was shaking even while his friends were comforting him. Ida and Yaoyorozu, I need to take Midoriya to see Recovery Girl, can you? I am fine, just continue teaching, he muttered, taking a few deep breaths and smiled at Aizawa. He didn't buy it for 1 second, but he couldn't message Mike to take over for the hour. He was already waiting for a sub for ectoplasm to arrive, as the hero was caught up in a rescue mission and they needed someone to teach math. Sitting down slowly, Midoriya pulled out his notebook and waited for his soulmate to say anything. Fuck these casts. The day drew on. Aizawa was contemplating breaking the cast so he would have an excuse to leave the classroom. The sub for ectoplasm never showed up, so they had another free period, which frustrated both soulmates. Midoriya kept shooting glances over to Aizawa, who was sleeping. The teacher was resting his eyes. Proper sleep was never something he could get during a rowdy class. Aizawa simply wanted to hold him, press kisses to his lips, and over every scar, he could see that Midoriya would let him see. So many things happened to his soulmate and he wanted to heal him, help him past the obvious trauma he held. And Midoriya wanted to hold him close, make sure Aizawa knew he wanted him as a soulmate, as a best friend, as his partner. But sitting in a classroom where everyone was a bit too oblivious to notice the tension, and yet no one tried to talk to Midoriya except his friends, there was something off and no one knew what it was. Shouta, present, Mike shouted, making him aware they were switching classes, though the teacher was half asleep, so it scared him and his soulmate. Aizawa realized now that loud noises scared Midoriya like water scared a cat. Hey little listener, Yamada ruffled Midoriya's hair, looking back at Aizawa then at him. How do you deal with a sloth for a soulmate? Don't tell him I told you. But he's pretty cuddly alone, he joked. Yamada looked over again then snorted. Don't tell him I told you, but I know. Midoriya should have sensibly been jealous. Someone else cuddling with his soulmate would make anyone jealous, and yet he only giggled. A warm smile crossed his face. Yamada was expecting him to get angry too, though it didn't happen. You must be very close. His gaze settled on Aizawa, who was haphazardly tucking his sleeping bag under the desk. It must be nice having a friend for so long who cares for you. Aren't you? I know, he replied simply. It frankly made Yamada shut up for once, and the class, who swore wasn't listening, wanted to know what Midoriya knew that made him shut up. Shouta? Yamada asked, his voice betraying the shock he felt. Never told him. He figured it out. Have fun with the class. He walked out, not before looking back at Midoriya and shaking his head. Only Midoriya could make Yamada speechless. Present, Mike. Are you ready to teach? Midoriya asked calmly. A small smile resting on his face, he turned around to see the rest of the class ready. Some were in groups talking, but everyone had something on their desk. Shurim and Midoriya, we need to talk later. He winked and smiled, but the ball of anxiety still settled in the pit of his stomach. Though Midoriya for once wasn't anxious, he found this too funny. Get your homework out, everyone. Let's go. The bell rang. Midoriya packed up slower than everyone else. They knew he needed to have a talk with Yamada and yet wanted to know why. Aizawa had walked back in and waited. The minute the last student was out, he hooked his arm into the latch and closed it. Midoriya, Yamada started. He looked up and smiled at him, waiting for his questions. How did you find out? It's pretty obvious actually, the way you both act. He shrugged his shoulders. Anyone with eyes could see how close they were. Anyone with a working brain could see they were a bit too close for friends at the time. So Midoriya knew something was up. And you aren't bothered by it? He looked towards Aizawa, who was smiling at Midoriya. It was a look Yamada wished Aizawa would have shared with him at some point, and yet now it makes him smile. He found his soulmate and he was happy. No, I can tell it's an older bond. And Aizawa filled me in. Yamada whipped his head around and pouted. Shouta, you said you didn't tell him. He whined. Truth be told, Yamada didn't want to make enemies with Midoriya. They both cared too much about Aizawa to stay enemies. I didn't tell him. He figured it out. I only filled him in on what he missed. Midoriya had finished packing his bag, then looked towards Aizawa expectantly. Where are you guys going? It was lunchtime, but Yamada could never find Shouta or Midoriya. Teacher's lounge for lunch. Midoriya shrugged as if they did it every. Do you guys do this every day? Yamada shouted. Midoriya stifled a laugh as he nodded. No one thinks to look for us in the most obvious spot. They check everywhere but the teacher's lounge. It was risky at first, both afraid that someone would walk in, but after realizing that the teachers never ate there, or if they did, never saw them, they cuddled and ate lunch together. Usually, it was Aizawa sleeping while Midoriya ate. Sometimes he fed his sleepy soulmate. Can I come? He sounded like a whining kid begging his parents, which only made Midoriya laugh more. I don't see an issue with it, he questioned and looked at Aizawa, who nodded. Come to on, Midoriya, open the door and let's go. He bolted from his seat and opened the door for Aizawa with a large smile. Wrapping his hand around his bicep, he stopped walking and looked back at Yamada, who was standing agape like a fish out of water. Let's go, Yamada. Aizawa scowled. He didn't like how easily he dropped the honorifics with Yamada compared, and it was shown. Sensei, don't be so upset. I want him to like me. The tone he used when he said sensei made Aizawa blush. Luckily his ears were covered by his hair, or else Midoriya would see how much this affected him. Is that okay, sensei? Never mind, he knew. Be good. Don't say something you will regret, Aizawa whispered back. Midoriya nodded, remembering they had a guest today. Though that didn't stop him from flashing his soulmate a cheeky smile. This would definitely be used on him later. And Aizawa already regretted what he said. He opened the door to the teacher's lounge, then scurried over to the couch. He opened his bag and pulled out the bento. I made extra chicken today. He was aware his soulmate didn't eat often, and since his arms were bound, Midoriya would feed him if he was hungry. Anything sweet? Me? Midoriya asked without skipping a beat. It made Yamada sputter and cough, not expecting the typically shy boy to be so bold. Midoriya, he shot a warning look. He only smiled and opened the bento. Let's eat. He ignored the way Yamada coughed and laughed in the background and climbed into his lap, holding his food in his lap. Do you want any chicken? Yeah, Aizawa replied. Midoriya made his own food for a reason he wouldn't share yet, so he enjoyed eating with him. It was his soulmate's cooking after all. Midoriya picked up a piece with his chopsticks, then lifted it above his shoulder, not even bothering to watch him eat it. He's expressed in the past how much he liked Midoriya's cooking. Glancing over to the other couch, Midoriya saw Yamada just staring at them in shock. Shouta eating anything but cat cakes and ramen. What is in that? He poked at the meal, but it was Aizawa who got angry. He makes it, don't touch it, he snapped. Yamada held his hands up in surrender, then laughed. You were right, Midori, he is very cuddly. Yamada joked. He giggled and held up another piece of chicken for Aizawa. I mean, you would know. A part of Midoriya was truly jealous of their relationship. They spent years together, much longer than him and Midoriya, and yet he was ecstatic. Aizawa wasn't like him. He wasn't alone for most of his school life, well, teen life anyway. He finally found good people, and it took climbing a mountain to do so. He couldn't say for certain that Aizawa didn't have his hardships, but he had Yamada, so for that, he was grateful and happy they were this close. I can make something for you, Yamada, he offered, but it was Aizawa pulling him down with his casted arms that made him question it. No, you can't. Find someone to make your own food, Hisashi, Aizawa called out, which only made him pout and Midoriya laugh. Yay, he was grateful Aizawa had him as a friend. One day until the sports festival, Midoriya thought, opening one of his notebooks in Netsu's office. Once the principal saw the amount of detail in the books, he had to confiscate them. If any villains, now that Midoriya made his ability known to them, took him, they could take the notebooks too. And books on all the strengths and weaknesses of the heroes at UA. Who wouldn't want that? Does Aizawa know what you're doing? Netsu asked, sipping tea as he skimmed the notebook for a certain few pages. Know what? He replied in an equally playful tone. Netsu did like talking to the boy because of his remarks. That you will be entering the sports festival, he replied simply. Midoriya froze and looked up from the notebook. Don't tell him. I was given strict instructions to stay by him the entire time. But you're here, looking at the very detailed notebooks about all the heroes in UA. Tell me, he set his teacup down and smiled. Why do you analyze everyone? Oh, that? He closed the notebook yet kept his gaze cast down at the table or his lap. I wanted to be a hero, so I thought learning about their quirks could help me. I was told by someone close to me that I would never be a hero, and that it made me change my want of analyzing quirks for myself to be in benefit of everyone else. Speaking of, he pulled out a blank notebook labeled Hero Analysis #17B. Do I need to give you all notebooks? Well, I suppose you don't have to give it to me until it's full. What's that one for? Netsu found it a bit scary himself how observant he was. Watching someone fight for a few moments, and he could understand how their quirk worked for the most part. Spare a few things that weren't an idea yet. The sports festival. If I want to get far, I need to analyze. About the festival though, he reached into the pile and pulled out #178. Can I borrow this? It is pages on my classmates and I need to study and update it. Alright, you mentioned something about a classmate having an ability to make toxin. Netsu did enjoy the conversations they had. There were a few teachers who would talk to him for the sake of a conversation and few students. Sue, she has the frog mutant quirk and using that we got out of the shipwreck area, he explained, opening the notebook and skimming it until he found Sue's page, then erasing the question mark next to does she have toxin. I'm sorry I had to confiscate these. Netsu said, his voice a bit less cheery than Midoriya was used to. No, I understand, and after USJ I painted a pretty big target on my back. Netsu was less than thrilled when he found out Midoriya went up against the leader and somehow talked his way through it while Aizawa was on the ground. A teacher saved by his students. Now it wasn't the prospect of that, but simply he revealed his ability too early for Netsu's liking. Speaking of, how is your back? I know he decayed quite a bit of it and the sports festival is tomorrow. His tone held a slight worry. The boy was rather nice and smart and he wouldn't admit it, but he cared for him a bit too much, like a guardian. It's about healed, though I think after tomorrow it would need more time to heal. Really, Aizawa was the only one, besides Yamada, because he can't keep his mouth shut, who didn't know. He had to get his back brace approved by midnight, who was the referee for the tournaments. Well, I suspect Aizawa might be looking for you. He's rather protective of you. I just hope he won't get too angry over the prospect of participating in the festival. Oh, don't worry, he will be livid. It was the day of the sports festival and currently, Midoriya was sitting in Aizawa's chair waiting for him per Yamada's request. Yamada, he finally asked, noticing how there were a few minutes until the first race started. What is it, little listener? He was fiddling with the soundboard beforehand, knowing what levels the mic should be at before testing it a few times. Can I go and say good luck to my friends real quickly? Yamada looked up from the soundboard and sighed. You can't. I know. It hurts too much to even run, which is why I just want to say good luck, please. He flashed his big eyes that he knew for a fact made him coddle Midoriya like a little kid. Fine, be quick. I don't want Shouta to know about this. He got up slowly, pretending it hurts way more than it did now, and walked out of the door. Once he was sure he was out of earshot, he bolted to the entrance of the first race. Taking turns and shortcuts that Aizawa didn't use, he followed him for a few days beforehand to make sure he knew the route well enough. Finally, he saw the group of students talking and stretching, all looking nervous. Jumping down the last few stairs, he winced but kept going. Midoriya, Uraraka questioned. He jogged over, breathless yet with a wide smile on his face. It wasn't smart to run here, but in a few minutes, he wouldn't have another chance to join. And made it, he coughed out. Ida and Todoroki made it to his side, confused as to why he was here. Yount can't participate. You're back. Midoriya placed a hand on Ida's shoulder. I'm still doing this. It's about healed anyway, and besides, he walked over to the big crowd of students. I have something to prove. His friends seemed to know what that was, so they joined him in the crowd. Todoroki lifted Midoriya's shirt and placed his hand on the brace, cooling it down. It should help with any pain for a few hours. His ice didn't behave like normal ice, so the cooling ability would last a few hours, which was perfect for Midoriya. Thanks, Todoroki. Ready. He looked at his friends, then the front of the group. I think it's time. They started their walk as a group, and already his back was flaring up. He pulled a few pain kills out of his pocket and swallowed them, hoping it would be enough until he could take more before the second round. If he even made it that far. Shouta Mike's voice was heard over the speaker before he shook his head and started the introductions. Though Midoriya tuned it out as he felt the gazes cast down on him. A lot of cheering. He knew there were people who recognized him as the quirkless boy from Class 1A Heroics. Now give it up for the hero course students of Class 1A. Yamada shouted, making Midoriya tune back into his world. He reached out and gripped one of his friend's hands, trying to stand tall, and yet he was afraid. An arena full of people with powerful quirks versus a quirkless kid. Nice going. The minute they started walking, he let go immediately, trying to walk tall like his friends were, but his anxiety was skyrocketing. If only. Right, he was here to prove to heroes, and his soulmate, that you didn't need a quirk to be a hero. Taking a deep breath, he put on his best mask and looked proud. I didn't know there would be so many people, he said to seemingly no one, his voice betraying how scared he was. I hope we're able to give our best performances, Ida said coolly, as if he wasn't in a state of panic like Midoriya was. Present Mike sure did talk us up a lot. It kinda makes me nervous. Kirishima focused his attention on Bakugo. How are you feeling, man? I'm not worried, he snarked, feeling the urge and want to win and to beat Midoriya. It makes me want to win even more. He cast a glance at Midoriya, who was trying not to freak out. Present Mike announced the other classes. Midoriya had a feeling who he had to look out for, so he started to analyze what he could see. Only have an idea based on the mutant quirks he could see. A few were self-explanatory, and others he thought they would be similar to Takoyami's Dark Shadow. Now the introductory speech. Midnight called. Midoriya had made his way to the front to find his friends, then waved to her. She gasped slightly, then continued to smile. Why was he here? Midoriya noticed the blushes on his friends' faces, confused but kept waiting for the next announcement. Silence everyone, and for the pledge, we have Bakugo Katsuki. Midoriya felt himself shrink when she called his name, afraid of his very being. Bakugo pushed his way to the front, shoving especially hard when brushing past Midoriya, then stood on the platform near Midnight. I just want to say, I'm gonna win, he started, his class not surprised he would start out cocky. The other classes started to boo and curse at him. Why would you say that you are representing us all? Ida shouted. Bakugo turned and sighed. Not my fault, you guys are just stepping stones to my victory. Midoriya stifled a groan. He knew Bakugo would say something like that. And yet, I don't think this is overconfidence. The old Kaken would have laughed while saying that, making it a joke. This is him pushing himself, Midoriya thought as Bakugo once again shoved by him, not sparing another glance. Without further ado, it's time for us to get started. Midnight cheered, a pit growing in her stomach. Why was Midoriya here? He's going to get hurt more. This is where you begin feeling the pain, the first part of the festival. She gestured her flail upward. Midoriya watched as it spun until it landed on the obstacle course. Shit. A few moments earlier, Hisashi Aizawa started, opening the door only to see his chair empty. Where is he? I thought he went to find you after going to see as he cut himself off, looking up from the soundboard cursing mentally. Hisashi, where did he go? Aizawa asked again, knowing full well where his soulmate was, but he was letting his friend catch up with his friend's Oh, that's all you have to say after letting him go when I specifically asked you to watch him. Aizawa was getting annoyed. It wasn't like he could go down there and pull his soulmate out and embarrass him in front of all the heroes and making it known they are soulmates. Get ready, present mic, someone called. Yamada groaned, trying to look around at the students, trying to spot Midoriya. Shouta Idon, he started, seeing the familiar tufts of green curly hair, and started his introductions while Aizawa just stared at the group, hoping Midoriya could feel his glares from all the way up here. Once Yamada turned the mic off, Aizawa turned towards him, his face blank. "Once I kill him, I will kill you," was all he said, and waited for the first round to begin, sadly hoping he wouldn't pass. Midoriya hoped Aizawa was watching him. ... and not angry. He was here to prove to Aizawa and the heroes that you didn't have a quirk to be a hero, though he was certain his soulmate was livid. Todoroki once again placed his hand under Midoriya's shirt, scaring him at first, before freezing the brace once more. "Thanks, Todoroki," Midoriya replied. He sent a small smile back in response, waiting for Ada to meet them near the front. When did Ada and Todoroki get so close? Midoriya thought as they talked, both holding small smiles. Uraraka seemed to notice it too and looked at Midoriya with a confused face. When did they get so close? It's almost as if they turned around widely, excitedly. Are they soulmates? She whispered the second half, though he was sure they heard her. They might be, but why did he confess then? But what? She cocked her head to the side. He stared at her, then realized Ada hadn't told anyone he confessed. "And nothing, let's just stretch," he replied, starting to pull his arms out to the side. He was familiar with most of the areas around UA, though this was something new and he didn't like going in blind. The light started to flash, counting down. Aizawa gritted his teeth. Midoriya lowered his chest, getting ready to bolt. 3. Aizawa cursed under his breath, afraid to watch what happened, and yet he couldn't look away. "I have to go beyond what I can do," Midoriya thought, taking a deep breath of air in. 2. Aizawa turned his head. He couldn't watch his soulmate get trampled by other quirk users. "I hope you're watching, Zawa." He turned his head, trying to gauge once more any new quirks he didn't notice earlier. 1. Aizawa's eyes darted back to the crowd. He saw his soulmate lowering himself. Even more, a proud smile tugged at his lips. "Run, Midoriya." Midoriya smiled. The bond seemingly light and tingled. He was watching and he wasn't angry. 0. Begin. Midnight hollered. Midoriya took off, sprinting, his back already screaming in pain, and yet he couldn't feel freer. People passed him, those with a quirk suitable for speed or those like Bakugo that could propel themselves forward. Uraraka was running with him, slapping his back, though he hated it. His clothes did feel better. Then she took off once more, trying to weave her way through. I need to think he noticed how narrow the doorway was, and saw his friends amping to move. This is the first test. He reached out and grabbed a hold of Todoroki, who froze everything around him, including the rest of his classmates, then jumped, making sure the layer of frost didn't get to him. "Midoriya," he gasped. The ground had frozen under them. Midoriya shoved off of him during his state of shock and started to skate forward. "Sorry, Todoroki, I needed a way out," he thought, not bothering to look back as his other classmates used their quirks to propel them forward. And the race had begun. "How about some Cavalry, mummy man?" Yamada turned towards Aizawa, who was just staring at Midoriya as he grabbed Todoroki and pulled himself into first. He didn't know what to say. He knew Midoriya was listening, so it had to be something that would help him and the rest of the students. "Speechless are we, students in your class, impressing you for once," he joked, well aware he was impressed by his quirkless soulmate. "Anything we should be looking out for in the early stages of the race?" They got through the door, but next he cleared his throat, suppressing the bond's urge to cheer his soulmate on, only hoping he could feel it through the bond. "Will be some friendly faces from your entrance exams." Aizawa took a deep breath in. He felt the bond jump. Why was it this strong? Before today they couldn't feel the other's emotions. Maybe a few moments where emotions were strong enough to persevere, but why? "Hey, Shouta, what's up?" Yamada double-checked the mic, making sure the switch was flipped off before turning to his best friend. "Just a bond thing," he muttered. Everyone was staring at the robots, unsure how to get through, though he saw Midoriya turning his head. He was looking for something. And that is, he didn't break his gaze with Midoriya but answered anyway. "I can feel his emotions now." "Oh, congrats," he said simply. And it was a thing to be congratulated on. Bonds had the capability of being this strong, and yet not all of them were. "But why today?" Aizawa questioned. Yamada shrugged, then flipped the mic on, announcing how the group was stuck. Suddenly Midoriya jumped into the mess of robots while Todoroki went over in dramatic icicles. He cut himself off only to watch the robots, one by one, fail and his soulmate run out from underneath. "Stupid soulmate." His tone, despite the words, was light, and he knew Midoriya could feel his pride. "Mummy man." The mics on Yamada hissed before announcing an apology. Only the crowd rippled and murmured at this new prospect. "Great, sorry Midoriya." A few moments prior, where are the access panels? He thought. No one was moving, only dodging their way through. He suspected Todoroki didn't want to use his ice again in a large quantity, or else the bi-colored teen would have jumped over already. He could feel Aizawa's anxiety. Why did he have anxiety though? It had not gone through Midoriya's head the real question he should have asked about the bond. Instead, he was whipping his head around trying to find there it is. He leaped forward, Yamada announcing his movement as he broke the panel off and tore out wires. Narrowly dodging a large foot, he pulled another panel and wires out. The feet stopped moving first, making it easier for him to crawl through. But judging by the sudden frost he felt which did soothe his back, Todoroki gave up and used his quirk to get over. Todoroki made, and there's Midoriya who somehow deactivated the robots, Yamada shouted, before a much lower voice was heard over the mic. It at first sounded like his name. Midoriya did grow happy after finding out Aizawa was cheering him on, then the sudden murmuring among the already exhausted students made his heart clench. Stupid soulmate. Aizawa's voice rang out through his smile grew wider and he grew more determined. The phrase sounded bad, but it was his way of cheering Midoriya on, not knowing the mic was on, of course. Stupider move, soulmate. He should be worried, and a part of him was, but he had bigger fish to fry. He continued to run, looking back only to see his friends and classmates making it through the robots and defeating smaller ones he somehow managed to avoid. One made it out of the battle and started to follow Midoriya. This one just won't let up, and I don't have a quirk too. He shook his head. Reaching down for a piece of the robot Todoroki had obviously frozen over. Picking it up, he tore into the robot behind him, then continued to run. Keep going, run. His back hissed in pain as he sprinted forward, keeping the metal tucked under his arm. I can use this as a shield if I need to. The metal was designed to be lightweight for the robots yet durable, making it the perfect item he needs for this race. For those of you who thought the first obstacle was easy, let's see how you feel about the second one. If you take a spill, you're out. You need to rely on your balance for this once, Yamada shouted into the mic. Midoriya had frozen in the new area. I call this the fall. He bent down and started to pull himself across the rope, the shield now tied to his back. People above him started to fly or run across the wire. In a world where it's hard to get noticed by a flashy quirk, this may be your area. Speaking of not having a flashy quirk, how did you get by Eraser? Yamada teased. Aizawa groaned and rolled his eyes. Shut up, I don't know what you're talking about. He fired back, but instead of thinking about his past he thought of Midoriya, his quirkless soulmate, who was Yamada. Cut the mic now. But Aizawa then turned off the board like he's seen Yamada do a million times. What's Shu? I can't find him. Did he fall? His gaze flashed from screen to screen, showing the various angles of the round until he saw his soulmate tugging himself along, others passing him by. Hazashi, he's going to fall, and without a quirk and his hurt back he could die. Shu, be quiet and watch. I can only keep that camera on him for so long before people notice. He turned the mic back on and apologized for the disruption and continued to narrate. Aizawa watched as his grip slipped a bit, but he pulled himself up and kept running. What's with that piece of metal he's carrying? We are the final obstacle, the minefield, Yamada shouted. Todoroki took his first steps timidly, making sure he didn't step on any. In an instant, first place could be gone if he used his eyes. Behind him, explosions rang out as people flew off the field. He scoffed but kept going. Midoriya made it, but minutes later, everyone already ahead gripping the shield. He watched as Bakugo raged forward, using his. That's it. I only have one shot at this. If I'm not careful, I could take myself out right now, he thought bitterly as he dug up mine after mine. I hope you're watching, Zawa, because this could be the last time you see me in one piece. After all it took was another fall on his back and he could have permanent damage. ... And he was here proving himself to the world and his soulmate that you don't need a quirk to be a hero. Todoroki and Bakugo are in the lead, neck and neck, knocking the other for first place, Yamada shouted. Midoriya tightened the wire around his hand, then ran back. I have one shot. Thanks for the idea, Kaken. Running forward, he slammed his body down, making sure it was done at an angle forward, super explosive turbo speed. The field was covered in a shockwave of a pink explosion, blinding everyone, that is, until Midoriya rocketed forward. Aizawa cut himself off, clearing his throat as he sank back down, almost giving himself away. Luckily this time the mic was cut. I thought you didn't want him to participate, Yamada teased. Aizawa couldn't turn away from the screen, watching as he grew closer and closer to first. I still don't, but I wouldn't be a good soulmate if I didn't support him, was all he said, making a promise to show how angry and yet proud he was. And Midoriya does it. He takes first, Yamada shouted as he plummeted towards the ground. Bakugo shouted in protest as he used his quirk to pull himself back to first. Deku, what the hell do you think you're doing? Bakugo shouted as he caught up to him. Todoroki started to run on his ice, no longer caring if people were going to catch up. They needed to beat Midoriya. I had more force than I thought, but I didn't think how I was gonna land. He felt himself slipping off the piece of metal, no longer containing enough force to hold on. Look at that. This fight is still far from over. It looks like those two have a common enemy now, Yamada shouted. Aizawa couldn't suppress the grin that was rising on his face. He wanted to watch as his soulmate, a bullied, quirkless student, could beat two people with some of the strongest quirks in their class. Come on, Midoriya, he muttered, watching as they caught up, almost neck and neck while Midoriya kept falling. Don't make this idea stupider. If I don't time this right, I will lose. I could get sent back once everyone catches up. I have to keep on going. I have one chance to prove myself. He was falling headfirst. Without missing a beat, he grabbed the piece of metal and flipped it, slamming it on the ground on a mine. It exploded once more, sending him back into first with enough speed to keep him going. Run, I need to run faster. He was going as fast as he could, his back screaming with every step he took. Every deep breath of air was another sharp pain somewhere in his body, and yet he was doing this. He was going to beat his classmate. In a stunning move, he blasted past his classmates in 1A. I don't believe it, he passed that minefield in an instant. Yamada was ecstatic. He too was cheering on the boy as the world didn't know it yet, but they had a quirkless hero in the midst. Eraserhead, your students are amazing. What did you teach them? Yamada cheered, turning to his best friend who was now grinning. Each of them is powered by their own drive to succeed. He wanted to say something to Midoriya, but he had a feeling it would be enough for now. He could feel the anxiety and yet over-ecstatic joy as his soulmate ran. It was enough to make Aizawa's smile grow a bit wider. The first to make it to the stadium is our winner. Aizawa noticed how the cameras were still focused on the minefield, no longer following who was ever in the tunnel. Our first place winner is Midoriya Izuku. Aizawa stood up quickly, the chair almost falling over, the grin never falling from his face. His pride swelled. His quirkless, yet stupidly determined soulmate did it. He took first place from some of the top students in his class, and he couldn't be prouder. Shouta, go, I can cover for you for a bit, just find him. Surprisingly, his voice was gentle, though it was all Aizawa needed to hear before Yamada opened the door for him and he took off. Where is he? Where did he go? Midoriya looked up to the box to see it empty. Yamada returning to his seat to announce the follow-up winners, Todoroki and Bakugo. Where is Zawa? He felt hurt until his fear started to take over. There were so many people cheering for him, and yet he couldn't see Aizawa. Don't be too let down if you didn't make it. We are only taking the first 42. Don't worry, you will have other ways to shine. Midnight explained, then pressing a finger to her ear. Due to a special circumstance, you will have a 10-minute break. As much as I would like to push you until you break, there are a few of you who have yet to recover from their injuries from the USJ attack and need to be seen immediately by Recovery Girl. Midoriya felt himself shrink. People gathered around as they listened. The crowd murmured in response, uncertain of these new events. Don't worry, there are others who need to see her too. It's a good time for a commercial break while they heal a bit. Midnight called. The students were led inside, and almost immediately Midoriya was ushered away to see Recovery Girl. His back was throbbing now. Instead of being healed, in this case, he was only given painkillers. He saw Aizawa even more exhausted and tired, but without his bandages. You are made for each other, stubborn through and through, Recover Girl chided. She tapped her cane on Midoriya's ankle. You need to take that medicine and lay down with an ice compress until the break is over. I fear you won't make it out of the second round if you are this beat up. With that, they walked out, leaving Aizawa and Midoriya. Yet despite his injuries, he flew into Aizawa's arms, finally able to be held once again. Zawa, Zawa, he called, falling into his soulmate's arms, his head resting against his chest, while wrapping his arms around his lower back, the easiest position without hurting his back more. Were you watching? I was, but he glared at his soulmate, watching as Midoriya shrank under the glare. I was supposed to be watching you in the booth, not running and almost dying. I just wanted to. His voice trailed off, biting back. More tears of pain and less of joy. Was that all Aizawa was focused on? Wanted to what? His voice was still icy, but the tone was less harsh now. Prove to you and other people that you don't need a quirk to be a hero. He fought back, trying to squirm out of his arms, but Aizawa kept his hold soft yet rigid. Let me go, I need to get back. You still have 5 minutes. The rest of the time is there for you to walk back, Aizawa argued. He led Midoriya to the bed, then sat down, sitting Midoriya on the bed, then laid him down. Did you wanted to prove to me that you can be a quirkless hero? Even though I saved you and the rest of the class at USJI, I still thought you didn't think I was a hero unless I had a quirk. He stuttered out, feeling embarrassed. Aizawa sighed, then shifted Midoriya, sitting him up gently. I thought what you did was reckless. You could have died, killed your classmates watching, or even heroes. Even today you were fighting out there tooth and nail to prove yourself. He started. Midoriya held his head in shame. And yet that's exactly what a hero does. You were a hero the minute you stood in front of that villain. A hero the minute you started to fight the bullies away from the best you could. Aizawa wiped his tears away, then pressed a kiss to his forehead. Midoriya Izuku, you are my hero. Zawa, he hiccuped, and for the first time, Aizawa was able to hold his soulmate and press kisses across his face, making him giggle as his stubble scratched his face. Zawa, that tickles. Good. He scooped him up, setting Midoriya in his lap as he buried his head in his neck. Pressing more kisses, though the need to mark him was slowly eating him away, so he had to pull away and just stared at his soulmate. How did I get so lucky? Why you, lucky? He started. Aizawa prepared himself for the ramble of how much better Aizawa was than Midoriya for self-deprecating reason. Instead, Midoriya pressed a chaste kiss to his lips. I think I'm the lucky one. Aizawa chuckled. Knocking their foreheads together, he let his arms draped around his waist, gently pulling his body closer. He lifted his arms and pressed his hands into his face. Midoriya nuzzled into the touch, closing his eyes as if he was a cat. Our mind. Midoriya was promptly cut off by Aizawa, who pulled him in for a searing kiss. He involuntarily groaned as Aizawa raked his hand through his green curls. Midoriya kept his arms around Aizawa's neck, content with them there. Midoriya frankly had no idea what to do, but everything Aizawa was doing was making him feel hot. He wanted to take his gym uniform off. He was just too hot. Aizawa, let your soulmate breathe. He has a few minutes until he has to go back. A voice called from outside the door. It was Midnight, who was stopped by Recover Girl from going inside. I wanted to talk to him on the way back to the arena, but it seems like you found him first. MMPH. He broke the kiss, then stared at his panting and obviously flustered soulmate. I guess we have to continue later. Luckily, there is another intermission, an official one between the second and third round. Why? Midoriya asked, pulling his now shaking legs together as he slid off the bed, then walked to the counter where he left the water and pills. He could still feel Aizawa's touch, his hands grasping his curls, and it still left Midoriya hot. Cementos has to make the arena after the second round. Takes him about 15 minutes, but everyone else gets a break too. It ends up being 30 minutes until the third battle, he explained. Midoriya hummed as he took the pills, then guzzled the water. Aizawa pulled himself off the bed, then walked over to Midoriya, who was still trying to forget the feeling before going out in front of hundreds of people. Aizawa, he needs to leave now, Midnight called. Barging in, she noticed the red tint to his face and how messy he looked, as well as Aizawa. Now clean yourselves up. I can work a few minutes more out of the break for this issue. With that, she pressed her finger to the earpiece, then started to bicker with whoever was on the other side of it. Remember, Midoriya. He bent down and pressed a kiss to his lips gently. I'm watching, and I think you will prove to everyone that quirkless students can be heroes. He pressed a kiss to his lips. Midoriya held on to him a bit longer than before, then they broke when Midnight walked over. We have a few more minutes, but I say let's leave now before Aizawa eats you up again. Midnight winked, then she ushered Midoriya along gently. That boy has you wrapped around his finger, Recovery Girl chuckled, tossing him a bottle of water. Be careful. Even if there are no legal repercussions, people don't take too kindly to your age gap, especially with your profession and his status in mind. Thanks, I know. With that, he bowed slightly before leaving, finally able to use his hands, though it was for a more selfish reason to begin with. He just wanted to hold Midoriya and tell him how proud he is, but those can be said later. He was just satisfied with the kiss he left on his soulmate's lips. The sounds he made were an even better treat. And we're back, Eraser. When did you come back? And where's Mummy Man? Yamada shouted in surprise as Aizawa stretched, then sat in the chair. I got healed, he said simply, watching Midoriya walk out nervously. It was still something to get used to a bond being so strong the fated can feel the other's emotion. But it did have its perks. For one, Midoriya could feel Aizawa's presence just enough to not have a panic attack at times. Another reason is he could send reassurance, as weird as that sounds to Midoriya, if he ever felt timid and wanted to back away instead of fighting. Aizawa enjoyed having a bond like this, as rare as it is, because he could just sense him. This constant reassurance that Midoriya was okay is something grounding for the pro. So Eraser, you've been spacing out and everyone is dying to know who is that soulmate of yours. Yamada shot him an apologetic look. The producers hounded him to ask while they had a break before the second round started. Aizawa knew it was out of his best friend's range as well. After sitting in a radio booth for hours just waiting for a show to be done, only for a higher-up to demand something new of it. Someone close to me, he replied, sighing as he felt Midoriya calm his own anxiety. Eraser, he is your soulmate after all. Of course, he would be close. Does the audience get any hints? Aizawa knew he had to say something. Yamada would get in trouble for not asking after all. My soulmate is cuter than all of yours. Aizawa could feel the pride and anxiety coursing through the bond. He didn't have to look to see how embarrassed Midoriya was. A small smirk rested on his face. He would definitely tease him later. Well, I think that's all I can get out of the former mummy man. But at least we know he's proud of his soulmate for entering the tournament. That got roaring applause and cheers for the bond. It wasn't easy living with a bond, and one that had an age gap like theirs was even harder to have, with all the hate people can get from it. So it was easy to say both Midoriya and Aizawa were ecstatic for the other. After that break, you must be dying to see what tortuous even we have for you next, Midnight called, licking her lips, and don't worry, the punishment is worth the wait. Once again the board had started to roll. Different punishments, as Midnight called it, were flashing, and it was slowing down quickly. It came to a rolling stop on one Midoriya thought was good for a quirkless student if they knew how to think and observe, that is. Prepare yourselves for the cavalry battle, Midnight called, a sly smile on her face. For those of you in the top, you will suffer the most. She pointed the flail towards him. Midoriya, Izuku will be worth 10 million points. Midoriya's head hung low. He could feel the burning gazes from the other classes and even his own classmates. His heart throbbed as his anxiety started to swallow him whole. You will never be anything more than a quirkless Deku. I'm sorry, young man, you can't be a hero. You're quirkless You're my hero, Midoriya. That thought resonated louder than the others trying to poison him. He could feel the bond thrumming, trying to soothe his almost spiraling panic attack. Looking up to the booth, he could see Izawa ready to speak into the mic, but Yamada was bickering about something. Stop feeling and think, he thought, Midnight's voice droning on. Everyone else will want to avoid me. I have a chance to prove that you don't need a quirk to be a hero. I just need a team who believes that too. He looked up to see Izawa turning away from the scene. And Yamada smiled once again, though Midoriya could clearly tell it was fake. Once again, Eraser was bickering over his soulmate. I swear he's about as stubborn as he. Yamada paled and cut the mic. It only brought an onslaught of shouts of confusion from the audience. Eraserhead is bonded to a male student. Who could it be? I wonder if it's someone from his class. Was the bond forced? Maybe the poor kid was forced into it. Midoriya, don't, Uraraka whispered. Midnight was calling something into the earpiece, most likely scolding Yamada for revealing too much. Midoriya was ready to call out and defend his soulmate. It wasn't forced and he cared too much about him, but Uraraka sensed this somehow and stopped him. If you reveal now that you're bonded and quirkless, people might think you're only in the hero course because he's your soulmate. She wasn't wrong, and Midoriya despised that she wasn't wrong. He fought tooth and nail to be where he was, and shouting about his soulmate would ruin everything. And yet that wasn't the reason he didn't shout. Now you have 15 minutes to make your team. I recommend you get started. Midnight suddenly shouted, then marched away, presumably to shout into the mic at Yamada. I have 15 minutes to make a team. It doesn't matter their points because I have so many. I just need to make sure I pick the right people, Midoriya thought. Then he snapped his head up, trying to see what was happening. He started to walk around, trying to find his ideal teammates, though he has planned for this in a way so there are many combinations to try. But the more he walked, the more and more people avoided him. This isn't good. I won't be able to find a team I have a combo for at this point. Hey Midoriya, did you want to be in a team with me? Uraraka called. He started to get teary-eyed. His panic was subsiding as she walked over. Are you sure? He stuttered out, whipping away any stray tears. She nodded, then looked around. It will be hard trying to find other people. Midoriya started to drone her out, trying to remember all ideas he had for her quirk and who he had paired with her. Ada, where is Ada? He snapped his head around before running straight towards him. He pulled him aside and started to strategize. I know it's not much, but it's the only evasive plan I could think of in such little time. It was a lie. He's planned for too many scenarios and groups now. He was ready to throw another one out there when Ada spoke up. A good strategy, but I'm sorry, I must refuse your offer. Midoriya had a feeling he would. After his confession, they haven't had time to talk yet. Since this all started, I've been losing to you. Please don't take this as an insult. You're a great friend, but if I continue to follow you, I won't get any better. I understand, Midoriya said simply and walked away. Even though it was on its surface an apology for not joining, it was really his apology for trying to get in between Midoriya and Izawa. He turned his head to see Ida beaming brightly. His apology was accepted and he didn't lose Midoriya. Midoriya, Hatsune called. He lifted his head to see her running towards him. Are you still looking for people to join your team? I can join. Hatsune. He was a tad confused, though it wasn't like he hadn't planned for a support class member to join their team, just not one who was wearing a ton of gear. You're the team to look out for, the team with the most spotlight, and my babies need the spotlight. She practically shouted. Midoriya knew what she was talking about and asking for, but Uraraka was still confused. All right, tell me what they can do. In a moment we need another person, he said, knowing fully well she would start to ramble the moment he finished talking had he not said to wait. Takoyami, will you join my team? He asked, though this wasn't a planned-out team. Uraraka and Hatsune were he would take who he could get. Now, this is what's going to happen. Listen, Sho. It's okay, Hisashi. Izawa cut him off, knowing his best friend would apologize at the first moment he was free. I said something, and of course you were going to be told to ask questions. I don't want Midoriya to hate me, he replied. Izawa watched as people avoided him, though the bond kept a reassuring pulse of determination that wasn't his own. He doesn't hate you. In fact, he wants to stay friends with you. I don't know why before you ask me, Izawa added, a small smile on his face as he watched Uraraka and Hatsune join him. Would you tell the world he was yours? Yamada asked quietly. It was times like this when Izawa knew when his best friend said present Mike is different from Hisashi. During moments where he was supposed to be present Mike, a fun and loud guy, there were moments where the mask slipped and the sad thought of Yamada was heard. I would. Though once they figure out he's quirkless, people might think he was only let into my class because of me, Izawa responded, watching as he approached Takoyami. Then they ran to a corner to strategize away from everyone else. Do you think he's planned for this? Absolutely. And time's up. The battle begins shortly, Midnight called, stretching her arms. I'm going to love this punishment. The crowd roared with cheers as the board now switched from being a clock to a countdown. Ready. Midoriya was the rider. He wasn't strong, but he could be quick, plus he needed higher ground to observe and strategize. Set. People were leaning towards Midoriya. They were going after him first. Go. In an instant, people were after Midoriya like a bull chasing a red cape. But he planned for this, not even giving us a chance to think. Such is the fate of the persuade. Tokoyami said. Dark Shadow nodded his head in agreement. Make your choice, Midoriya. What are we doing? We're running away. He had planned for this. They could attack, but he wanted to save energy for later. Dark Shadow, hide for now, please, he whispered. The spirit nodded and hid in their shadow. It made it easier for Tokoyami to conserve energy too. No, you're not. Tetsu shouted. The guy in front activated his quirk, causing them to sink in the ground. What's happening? Uraraka called. As their legs sank, Midoriya was trying to study the other classes more than 1B, but he had forgotten about this quirk. Watch your faces, Midoriya said, pressing a button to activate the jetpack he was wearing, thanks to Hatsum, of course. They flew. Damn support course, Tetsu shouted. Midoriya had no clue how to steer it, but as long as this kept them steady, he was fine being in the air. Suddenly, Dark Shadow flew out and swiped at the air. Gyro was trying to use her quirk on them, but he caught it. Thanks, Dark Shadow, Midoriya called out. Looking around the arena, you're just what we need to cover the omnidirectional blind spots we have. You are the one who chose me, Tokoyami replied, though he was preening at the compliment inside. We're landing, Uraraka called. Hatsum activated her boots that kept them hovering for a few moments before they landed on solid ground. Your quirk is amazing, Midoriya called. She was making everything but the equipment and herself float. Once they hit the ground, they continued to run. Dark Shadow was once again in the shadow of the group, but his head was poking out almost like a land shark. So, what did you think of my baby's cuteness? Can be manufactured, you know. Hatsum shouted. Midoriya nodded. They have excellent mobility, Hatsum. Your babies are amazing, he responded, missing Uraraka's bitter comment about how she was making them float. This is too easy. This isn't even a fight, it's a massacre. Minda shouted. Midoriya's head snapped towards the direction of his voice. It was coming from Shoji. Is that even allowed? Midoriya called out, instantly recognizing how Shoji's arms were folded up to hide something or someone. Judges say yes, Midnight called in response. He groaned and looked over to see another group running towards them. We need more breathing room, Tokoyami called. Midoriya ducked the minute he saw Asui's tongue fly out for his headband. Quick and observant as usually, Midoriya, she complimented. He flashed a smile back before studying the groups after him. They have Asui with them too, he called. Uraraka lifted her foot only to notice she was stuck. And we're stuck on Minta's quirk. I told you to call me Tsu, Asui shouted. A flurry of grape balls were thrown as Asui was trying to attack the headband. We need to leave now, Tokoyami shouted. Midoriya pressed the button once more and they flew straight up against the cries of Hatsum. My baby is broken, she cried. Midoriya kept his gaze down, trying to watch the battle from above. Sorry, but we got away, he replied, only to hear a loud explosion from the ground. He knew the sound and it gave him instant anxiety. At once he felt Aizawa calming him, his soulmate aware of the fear he possessed because of Bakugo. Fucking quirkless Deku, don't think for a minute you're safe, Bakugo shouted. Midoriya drowned out the audience, who was now murmuring, confused at the statement. In a last-minute move, he brought his hand up, trying to push him away, but instead he grabbed his headband and Dark Shadow acted as a shield for his quirk. Midoriya not only has the chart-topping band, but now he took Team Bakugo's. Present Mike shouted. Midoriya looked down to see that he had indeed taken his headband out of sheer luck once again. Good job, Midoriya, Uraraka cheered as they landed. But I can't land anymore with only one boot. She's right. We can't risk taking to the skies again. We only have one choice, and that's to survive on the ground. He tied the band around his neck, the feeling almost heavy. In an attempt to stop him from taking my band, I grabbed his instead. It's been 7 minutes. Let's see how the teams rank, Yamada called. Instantly the roaring audience was now silent. It seems like Team Midoriya is the only group from Class 1 with points. What? Midoriya became aware of the team running next to everyone, who was in a state of shock. The boy only smirked as he tied another band around his neck. Midnight said the obstacle course was just the first game, so I figured a group that large wouldn't stay either. An estimate of 40 or so students would make it to the next round. He turned and smirked at the team he stole the band from. So Class 1B watched as you used your quirks while he learned what your weaknesses were. Did all of Class 1B do this? Uraraka asked. Midoriya couldn't answer, as he felt all eyes on him. Class 1B watched and waited, but there is one person who has yet to use their quirk. Monoma stared at Midoriya, who was watching his surroundings, all while being acutely aware of the many eyes watching him. And we are excited to see what the wait is for. It looks like Class 1B is declaring war on Class 1A. Present Mike shouted. Midoriya ducked his head as another hand reached out for his band. Come on, Midoriya, show the world that you aren't quirkless, Monoma shouted, expecting him to suddenly rage like his classmate, but instead, He only lowered himself, a smirk present on his face. And so what if I am? He called out. The audience grew quiet, but he didn't care. But the waves of pride he felt from the bond made the reveal worth it. The crowd was quiet. Even the teams had stopped talking and moving and just watched Midoriya. He's quirkless, someone from 1B shouted. But some of his classmates want to both protect Midoriya and beat 1B held him in this case. Midoriya, use your quirk already, show 1B we are manly. Kirishima shouted. It was a smart idea. He gave the impression that he was quirkless, but if his classmates hyped him up enough they could paint the target on his back while keeping Wano looking strong. Kirishima, it's too dangerous, he replied. The game was now in starting once again. The occasional shouts from Wano towards Midoriya only made 1B annoyed that he wasn't like them, that he wasn't easily angered. That is, unless you knew what made him angry. And calling a kid quirkless after society has beaten them to a pulp is nothing. Eraser, could you give us insight as to what Midoriya's secret power could be? It seems like everyone is confused. Is he really quirkless? Present Mike had to ask the questions. Keep the game moving, though it made him sad to ask if Midoriya had a quirk. He cut himself off. He could like and say that he was in risk getting him disqualified by the angry crowd if people find out. Keep watching. Looks like even Eraser wants to keep this a surprise. Yamada shouted, silently thanking his best friend. Come on Midoriya, show us your flashy quirk that landed you in the hero class. Monoma shouted. He was fairly annoyed that he couldn't get Midoriya to use his quirk. Why show a quirk when I can use my skills to get me by? He responded, ducking under another hand that was reaching out for his band. Midoriya. This time it was Todoroki, and the other teams were at a standstill, ready to move when they saw the opening. Todoroki, he said simply, ducking under Tsu's tongue once again. No hard feelings, he asked. The bi-colored boy didn't want to lose one of his friends. No hard feelings, Midoriya replied simply. He looked down at his other classmates too and nodded. Then I will be taking that now, Todoroki said simply. Midoriya placed his hand on his head just to make sure the band was there before tightening it. Well, I didn't think this confrontation would happen until later in the contest, Takoyami said. Midoriya only nodded, then waited for their first move. Now Ida, forward, Todoroki said. Ida responded, then started to run towards them. Midoriya kept his team where they were. He needed to see what they would do, and as long as the top team in terms of quirks was after him, the others would try to go after Monoma. Yaoyorozu, be ready to protect us, he shouted. Midoriya watched as a long blade formed on her arm, but something else was being formed. It looked like we have to get out of here now, Midoriya shouted, knowing what was going to happen next. He heard Kaminari talking about it after USJ, how Yaomomo used a blanket to protect her and Gyro from Kaminari's electricity. What's happening? Uraraka asked. Midoriya sent a look of pity at Dark Shadow. Dark Shadow, I think you need to protect us, Midoriya responded. The spirit nuzzled him before standing guard. Kaminari, oh, I know what I gotta do, he replied, feeling his quirk start to build. Watching our surroundings, Midoriya muttered as he ducked once again, then slapped away another arm. Now that they were moving, people were attacking more. Hope you made something strong, Yaoyorozu, Kaminari started. Midoriya watched. They pulled a blanket around the rest of their group. Indiscriminate shock. 1.3 million volts. Suddenly the teams around them were being stunned. Then Dark Shadow flew up and protected them from the electricity. He cried out in pain but stayed there until it was done. Then Todoroki used the sharp weapon Yaoyorozu made and started to freeze the ground behind him. Todoroki just took out half the competition, Present Mike shouted. Aizawa was just speechless watching Midoriya hold the shadow spirit before it melted away into the group's shadow. Monoma, some in Class 1B shouted. The boy was snarking off at Bakugo again, taking his frustrations out on him. Tell me, is that boy Midoriya, is he really quirkless? He asked, though Bakugo didn't answer. He was too pissed off to say anything. He isn't. How sad would it be if the great Class 1 of the heroics department had a quirkless student in their midst? That's practically saying anyone can be a hero, and that's not the case. Midoriya had to steel himself because it was true that you needed a quirk to be a hero, but that's why he was there. Monoma was desperate at this point. The second round is practically over and Class 1 was still in the lead, and yet Midoriya's quirk hasn't been used yet. Unless, I think I've figured out who Aizawa-sensei's soulmate is, Monoma shouted. Most of Class 1 froze, including Midoriya. Midoriya, do you have something to say? If you're trying to get me to use my quirk, it won't happen, he replied, still running from Todoroki. And I won't tell you who Aizawa-sensei's soulmate is. I promised him I wouldn't say. So it isn't you, the quirkless hero of 1A? Monoma asked. The crowd went silent. Even Todoroki's team stopped running. If I'm quirkless, why would I be in the heroics department? He asked. Dark Shadow once again came back from the shadow, feeling better now. No one wants a quirkless soulmate, so why would a pro want one too? Monoma didn't know what to say. He was right, a pro would only be weighed down by a quirkless. Thanks for the points, and your observation ability is good. Midoriya ran by him snatching a few bands. But it's not as good as mine. Monoma was annoyed before but pissed now. In Class 1B he was regarded to have high observational ability, but if this Class 1A student thinks he has a better observational ability, then he's dead wrong. It seems like Team Midoriya has secured his spot, and look at Team Todoroki. It looks like they have one final attack plan. Present Mike shouted. Midoriya turned around a bit too late. He felt the band get snatched from his forehead, even a few of his neck. No, he shouted. They were going to lose and they didn't have enough time to plan another attack. We need those points. Let's go, Midoriya. Uraraka shouted. Suddenly the team lurched forward, and their goal, now like everyone else, was for the 1 million point headband. Todoroki brought his arms up, his left arm ablaze while the other gripped a headband he had yet to put on. I will get burned if I do this, but I have no choice, he thought, grabbing Todoroki's arm and held it while lunging and grabbing a headband. Then the team pulled away. The scent of burning flesh rose and stung everyone's noses except Midoriya, who was all too familiar with the smell. Midoriya. Maybe I got something in my eyes, but Midoriya looked down to see a 70-point headband. No, this isn't enough to bring us back. He looked at the scoreboard, and paired with the single band around his neck, they were in 6th place. It looks like Team Midoriya didn't get the 1 million point headband, and with only 10 seconds left, what will they do? Present Mike shouted. Aizawa was sitting on the edge of his seat, but yet he knew somehow Midoriya would pull through and would win. Come on, Aizawa muttered, just get a higher band. Midoriya smiled to himself. He could feel the pride from Aizawa. He knew this was no longer just about Aizawa, but now helping his friends who had a goal of their own. Takoyami, Midoriya shouted. Dark Shadow lunged towards Todoroki as he shouted for Kaminari to use his electricity. Dark Shadow yelped but lunged again before pulling away. He hid in the shadows, seemingly empty-handed. One last time, Midoriya shouted. The group ran forward as Bakugo emerged from the ice, shouting and running towards Todoroki. In a last-minute move, Bakugo shot himself off the team and flew to Todoroki. But the buzzer ran out. Midoriya's stomach sank as Present Mike called the winning teams. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe you need a quirk to fight in this world. Midoriya, Uraraka said as she walked over. Hatsune took the jetpack off his back, then smiled widely. We finished. But we did. Midoriya was cut off by the large grins Hatsune and Uraraka wore. He looked back at Takoyami, who was smiling. If it wasn't for your distraction, Dark Shadow wouldn't have been able to get another band. We were aiming for the 1 million headband, but this is just enough to secure a spot, he explained. With tears in his eyes, he watched as the board changed. And in 4th place, Team Midoriya. How did they? Aizawa had stood up suddenly. He could feel the anxiety Midoriya once held melt away into pride. He watched as Midoriya turned his head and looked up at the box where Aizawa and Yamada were commentating. He was looking to see if his soulmate was watching. Shouta, your soulmate has too much dumb luck, Yamada explained. This was their time for a break while Cementos made the new field for the one-on-one fights. And skill, he added. It was hard to ignore his ability to observe when he points things out that you wouldn't expect him to say or find out about. And skill, Yamada echoed. Where are you guys meeting up? The door burst open to reveal a very exhausted and yet very happy Midoriya. Aye, he coughed, unable to catch his breath. I did it. You did it, Aizawa agreed. Midoriya took a few steps before crashing into his soulmate's arms, neither one caring how sweaty Midoriya was. I will get us something to eat, Yamada suddenly said, leaving the room and closing the door behind him. Do you think people know I'm quirkless yet? Midoriya asked Aizawa to press a kiss to his mess of curls. Some might. A lot of people think a quirkless student couldn't be in 1A, so it's unlikely, Aizawa replied. A large smile grew on Midoriya's face. Perfect, was all he said before cuddling up to Aizawa, pressing kisses to his face and neck. Were you watching me? Every second. Were you proud? Every moment. Aizawa pecked his lips, then pulled him into his lap. Midoriya, practically straddling him, though his limbs were hanging off, made him look more like a sloth clinging to someone. Can I sleep? Midoriya asked. Aizawa only adjusted his grip, making sure he didn't hit the brace. Is your back okay? Aizawa asked instead. He nodded, then buried his head into his neck. Painkillers, really strong ones, was all he said before his breathing evened out. Just a few-minute nap. You have to eat soon. Midoriya only grunted slightly, falling into a deep sleep. Hey, the line was Pret. Yamada opened the door to see Aizawa looking at his phone and Midoriya asleep. He's asleep. How much time until the break is over? Aizawa asked Yamada. Closed the door quickly, then set the bentos on the chair. About 20 minutes, he said, then picked them up and watched as Aizawa shifted Midoriya. You need to wake up, he said. Midoriya only huffed, blowing hot air into Aizawa's neck. Don't wanna, comfy, he whined. Aizawa only rolled his eyes when he saw Yamada recording. Azashi got food, he added. Midoriya stopped shifting around, then lifted his head. Zashi has food, he slurred, and at that moment he has never wanted to kill Yamada more. That's Yamada too. Midoriya, you can call me Zashi if I can call you Izu. Okay, Zashi. He yawned, then turned around in Aizawa's lap, unaware of the jealous rage he has unleashed on Yamada. Here, he snickered. Still recording here, Izu. It's a bento. The teen rubbed his eyes, then grabbed the bento with his bad hand, hissing at the pain. What did you do to your hand? Aizawa asked. Looking at Midoriya's palm, Yamada stopped recording to look at it. I grabbed Todoroki's arm to grab a headband. He was sober now, opening the lunchbox to see what was inside while Aizawa and Yamada inspected the burn. I will get Recov. Don't her quirk uses my stamina to heal. I just need burn cream and a bandage. These aren't my first burns, Midoriya said, fully awake and now a bit panicked. Yamada looked at Aizawa, who only nodded, his soft gaze making it hard to say no to the boy. Okay, I will be back in a bit. With that he left and closed the door, leaving Aizawa and Midoriya. I'm hungry, he muttered, picking up the chopsticks, then started to eat the bento. Zawa, you should. How come you don't address me by my first name and yet you do it with Yamada so easily? Aizawa asked. He was far from over the topic. Well, his voice trailed off. He swallowed the bit of rice he had in his mouth, then responded. He's more like a friend and you're my soulmate, so it's a bit more embarrassing. Can I call you by your first name? Aizawa asked, enjoying how red Midoriya's face got. Aye, if you want, he replied. Aizawa pressed a kiss to his forehead. Okay, Izuku. Midoriya let out a noise of embarrassment and shock. He didn't think Aizawa would do it so quickly. Izuku. Aizawa pressed another kiss to his face. Izuku, another kiss. Izuku. He pressed a firm kiss against his lips, enjoying how embarrassed Midoriya was. Shouta, he managed to stutter out. And oh, did it make Aizawa angry they weren't in a private room together. I'm the only one you should be on first name basis with. He was jealous, and Midoriya couldn't say he didn't like how possessive Aizawa was over him. Oh, our friends get nicknames but not full name? He asked. Aizawa stared at him before nodding. Fine, he replied, letting Midoriya eat once again. Midoriya would be lying if he said he didn't have plans to make Aizawa even more jealous in the future, but for now, it was time to eat and relax with him. By the time he finished eating, Yamada had returned with the burn cream and a bandage. Hold your hand out, please, he muttered. Midoriya looked back at Aizawa, who nodded and sent him a glare, as if telling him you better do this. Midoriya groaned as he snatched the burn cream out of Yamada's hand, plastered it on, then rolled the bandage around. The burns still hurt. His nerves were damaged, but not totally yet. It was a habit now. No one sees the burns and no one cares. But this time it was different, and Midoriya didn't know how to feel about this kind of difference. Well, okay, it looks like you have it covered. Yamada chuckled, but the amusement was lacking in his voice. When did you? Zawa can tell you. Off to stretch. Bye. He rushed out, pecking Aizawa's lips quickly, then raced out of the room, accidentally slamming it behind him. Shouta, what's he talking about? Yamada shakily asked. His mind was connecting the dots slowly, but the more he thought about it, the more it stung. A classmate has been bullying him since he was a kid. He replied simply. The words held a bitter taste in his mouth. Yamada's mouth dropped open. He tried to speak, but no words came out. How bad? He felt the need to ask, but by the way Aizawa looked at him, he just knew how bad it was. Who is it? Bakugo Katsuki, explosion quirk. He's used it against Midoriya. His sentences were choppy, as if speaking about the boy would make the situation worse. Why haven't you told Netsu? Sending him out there with Midoriya as he cut himself off when he saw the glare Aizawa shot at him. I couldn't, at least not then. Midoriya practically begged me to let him stay longer. I can't tell if it's out of irrational fear or the need to see everyone succeed, Aizawa muttered, watching the classes walk back out to the field. Then as the judges got in place, what will you do then? Yamada asked, removing his glasses to wipe them down and placed them back on the bridge of his nose. Once this is over and Midoriya has proved himself, I will tell Netsu. Prove himself to who? Yamada didn't want to think Aizawa was testing his soulmate, and yet it seemed so like him. The world, that you don't need a quirk to be a hero. Where were you? Uraraka asked Midoriya as they walked onto the field again. He smiled sheepishly and pointed towards the box. Were you eating lunch with? Not so loud, he hissed, slamming his hand over her mouth, then lifted his head, looking to see who was around him. It was at that moment that Monomo looked at him and shot him a knowing smile. Midoriya didn't care who found out, but the way he looked at him was almost taunting. The group split, most returning to their given seats. Luckily that included Monoma, who smiled once again at Midoriya and waved. That's creepy, Uraraka said, though her mouth was muffled. Midoriya pulled his hand away and nodded. I think he knows about my bond to Shouta, he said. Saying his name was easier than he thought, but the little experiment only made Uraraka squeal loudly. You guys are on a first name basis now? She asked wildly. He nodded, rubbing the back of his neck with his good hand. Todoroki approached them, Ada not too far behind him, and bowed slightly. I'm sorry I took it too far, he said, then lifted his head only to see Midoriya extremely flustered. That's okay. There are and no hard feelings are, remember. He frantically waved his hands. Todoroki, in turn, placed his hand on Midoriya's back and froze the brace, then on his bandages. Ask me if you need me to cool you down again, he replied. Midoriya nodded, then smiled coyly. Are you and Ida bonded? He asked aloud. Ida's face was stricken red while Todoroki had a pale blush. We are. Is there an issue? Todoroki replied bluntly. Ida, on the other hand, was so red Midoriya thought he could burst. No, just curious is all. He wasn't lying. In fact, he was very curious, yes, over their bond, but about the fact that Ida had confessed to him not even a week ago. Why did he confess when he was bonded to Todoroki? Ida seemed to understand the puzzled look inside, motioning for him to follow and pull away from the rest of the group. Ida, did you? I didn't tell him I tried to pursue you. He cut him off promptly, holding his hand up. I couldn't let him find out that I had feelings for you. Though they still linger at times, I think it was more misplaced than real. A smile grew on Midoriya's face, letting out a sigh of relief. Tell him, if not for you, do it for me. A bond shouldn't have lies. Even now I struggle to tell Shouta more of my past, but with something as easy as a confession with misplaced feelings, he may be a bit hurt, but it's better than the position I am in now, Midoriya explained. Ida's brows furrowed in confusion. They had a healthy bond, so what gives? What's happening? Ida asked. Midoriya glanced over his shoulder, surveying the area, then turned to see his worried best friend. I have a complicated past, and as caring and loving as Shouta can be. What's so funny? Midoriya stopped talking when Ida started to chuckle. I'm sorry, that was incredibly rude of me, but calling our teacher caring and loving, I never thought I would hear that, he explained. Midoriya joined him in a chorus of giggles. I guess you're right. It's hard to image Shouta to be so cuddly, but never let him find out I told you this. He leaned in, cupping his mouth with his left hand. He's more affectionate than your Uraraka. Really? Their gazes shifted to the box where Aizawa was lazily talking to Yamada. I never would have guessed. I assume Todoroki is the same way. Midoriya asked. Ida nodded, his face turning a medium shade of red. The bond is still new. Only a week into it. I guess that's why I wanted to know if your bond was permanent more than asking because I wanted to date you, Ida explained, rubbing the back of his neck, letting his hand linger a bit longer before it fell to his side. But Todoroki is very cuddly. He won't ask either usually. Ida was cut off when a pair of arms wrapped around his waist, a tuft of white and red hair seen as he adjusted his hands. Todoroki then buried his face in Ida's neck, clearly enjoying the comfort. My supposed father is here, was all he said. Ida turned his head around to see Endeavor standing on the top of the stairs, staring down at the pair, with no clue as to where the sudden confidence came from. Ida turned his body, wrapping his arm around Todoroki while the other held Todoroki's head, his fingers threaded throughout his hair. Ida glared upward. He was almost challenging the number 2 hero, calling his bluff essentially. Yamada had shouted over the pause system at the sudden revelation, though the trio ignored it as Midoriya too was glaring up at him, his fists balled. He knew Todoroki, and if he was to show this much affection in a stadium this big, there had to be a reason. Endeavor huffed, turning around, then walked back inside, now out of view of the pair glaring at him. What was that? Midoriya and Ida from Class 1 is suddenly having a silent showdown, and Endeavor backed out. Yamada called. Some cheers were heard when Endeavor was said to have lost the match. Even Yamada sounded ecstatic. Todoroki shifted, able to look up at Ida, and smiled softly. It was an obviously private smile, so Midoriya knew to back away and head back to the rest of the group, though what he saw next kinda made it worth the semi-guilty feeling he had. Ida smiled in return, pressing a kiss gently to Todoroki's forehead, as if the small kiss would make Todoroki shatter. The crowd went crazy. An essential power couple in Class 1, where one protected the other from a seemingly ruthless hero, then held a gaze softer than clouds. It was a movie-worthy moment, and Midoriya was thankful he didn't turn around. It looks like we have answers, folks. Ida and Todoroki from Class 1 are a bonded pair. This made the audience roar with applause and shouts of joy. 2 bonded pairs within Class 1A, though one was still lurking in the shadows compared to the spotlight cast upon the new pair. As great as this moment is, it's time to announce the final punishment of the tournament, Midnight shouted, raising her flail into the air. The audience roared even louder, almost deafening. Though in this moment everything was quiet, as Midoriya lifted his head and smiled at Aizawa, both wishing they were Todoroki and Ida right now, able to hold the other and now receive judgment. It was one thing for the audience to support the relationship when only a few clues were given. It was another when Aizawa and Midoriya were embracing as Todoroki and Ida were. I withdraw. Ajiro shakily rose his hand into the air. Gasps were heard around him. I don't remember much, only a little. Why would he withdraw? Midoriya thought. The world around him went quiet as he started to think more and more, the puzzle growing ever more complicated. Who was in his Cavalry group? When another pulled out, Midoriya crossed him off too. His world was silent as he ran through who it could be. Lifting his head, he made eye contact with a purple-haired boy who looked too satisfied to now be a part of this suspect list. Name, unknown. Quirk, unknown. Class 1C. He went through the list in his head, though with the fact that 2 of the 4 people in the group had no recollection of what had happened, it made his mind run rampant with ideas. Before settling down on something that seemed to fit the bill, could he be taking over their mind, almost like a puppeteer? Shinso waved to Midoriya before walking over to his Class 1B friends and talked to them. The 2 walked back to their seats while 2 others were called down to join them. Midoriya couldn't focus on the world around him. He was so caught up in his world that he didn't hear the pairs get selected. He didn't hear the nervous chatter around them. Midoriya, Uraraka shook him a bit, then pointed to the board. Look. He swallowed, his brows furrowed in confusion and a bit of fear. Already he was facing off with someone he had little idea as to how their quirk worked. There on the board was the first obstacle to the final round. Shinso, calm down, Yamada hissed. He had turned the mic off for a few while the crowd was talking about the pairings. The classes had started to walk back to their seats, leaving the first round contestants standing, Midoriya and Shinso. It's not my anxiety, Hisashi, it's Midoriya's. He rolled his eyes, trying to reassure Midoriya through the bond. You can talk to him in a few, Yamada whispered, pressing the button on the mic. What a shocking turn of events for this year's tournament. Let's take a moment to press pause on the show and bring you some side games. Yamada turned the mic off, then turned towards Aizawa who was already out of his seat. You have 30 minutes while the games are going on. There's a 5-minute warning before it ends if you don't want to be discovered. Make it back here before the 5-minute warning is heard. Aizawa finished, then bolted out of the room. They assigned waiting rooms during the break, so finding his soulmate was not as hard as it seemed. What was hard was trying to keep his cool as he walked down to the area. He didn't want any followers as fighting in the first round was already nerve-wracking enough, but having your soulmate announced to the world was even worse. When he made it to the hallway where the students were waiting for the 5-minute call, he stopped, taking a deep breath, then walked down the hall as if he didn't care, stopping when Uraraka and Tsuyu were walking hand in hand down the hall. Aizawa-sensei, what are you doing here? Tsuyu asked, tilting her head to the side. Uraraka elbowed her gently, then smiled. Finally, Midoriya is sick and recovery girl isn't coming. He could tell Uraraka was lying. It was very obvious to him, and yet she was giving him an excuse to be alone with him. Thanks for calling me. What room? He asked lazily, though his heart was racing. Room 3, Ajiro is talking to him right now. She smiled, then pulled Tsuyu into her room, promptly closing and locking the door. He approached the door, knocking gently. It swung back to reveal Midoriya, who was smiling up at his soulmate, then Ajiro, who clearly looked embarrassed. I can leave for a bit. I hope the information helped Midoriya. Ajiro stuttered out. He walked out swiftly, keeping his tail close as he did. Aizawa walked in. The minute the door was closed and locked, Aizawa swept Midoriya off his feet. In turn, Midoriya let his shoes fall to the ground, and he wrapped his feet around his hips, his arms around his neck, essentially a koala bear. I'm proud of you, Aizawa said simply. Though he hadn't started the third round, he wanted to let Midoriya know he was so proud of him. I can feel it, he stuttered. Midoriya pulled his head away from his shoulder to look Aizawa in the eyes, content with just taking his features in. Instead, Aizawa pressed kisses gently to his face, making the teen giggle. Shouta, say my name again. Aizawa stopped pressing kisses to his face and instead walked over to the bed, sitting down, though Midoriya was still clinging to him like a koala bear. As Shouta, Aizawa pressed a kiss to his forehead. Shouta, one to the tip of his nose. Shouta. This time Midoriya was cut off by Aizawa, pressing his lips firmly against Midoriya. Midoriya broke the kiss, as it lingered for a few seconds, though he was in the mood to talk rather than kiss. The cuddles were nice. Something wrong? Aizawa asked Midoriya to shake his head, content resting their forehead together. I just want to sit like this for a while. He should be planning how to get past Todoroki, but he knows there's something more important he has to do rather than winning the match. He needs to save him. After all, it was Midoriya who saved himself his entire life, and even then it grew tiring. He couldn't imagine what it could be like to essentially never save yourself. Growing bored of me already, Aizawa joked, though the flash of pain he felt in the bond said otherwise. Midoriya opened his eyes and pressed a quick kiss to his lips. Never, just thinking about my matches, he responded, stretching his arms, then letting them drape over his neck once again. I don't think I can get past Todoroki. Where's that pro-hero attitude you had earlier? Aizawa asked, slightly worried, though Midoriya was still staying positive. That's just it. Todoroki can't even face his father at times, which only means something is wrong. He won't even use his fire consciously. I plan to fix it, he replied, aware of the numbing sensation he felt under and around the new burn. Besides, someone who has gotten burned most of their life makes the perfect rescuer. Don't sabotage your chance. It's okay. If I didn't stop here, I would have to face Kaken, and I don't think I can do that just yet, he added softly. That only made Aizawa's heart tug. They sat in silence once again, sharing small kisses occasionally, though it was Midoriya who broke the silence. Are we not going to talk about the fact that I can feel your emotions and you mine? He asked. Aizawa chuckled, pulling away slightly. I didn't think you would want to talk about it today, shelving it for another day, he repeated like Midoriya has said seemingly a million times. Though it was sarcastic, it only made Midoriya giggle. We have time, let's talk, he started and pulled back to face his faded better. Why can we feel each other's emotions so early on? I thought you had an idea, Aizawa replied. He was very much confused and expected his very smart soulmate to have an idea. Midoriya shrugged his shoulders, fidgeting with his fingers. I have a thought. Though it seems silly, he started, but the small kiss they shared held more emotions than either could describe. What if it's because I trusted you with my darkest secret and you trusted me with information about a previous idea to bond to Yamada if you didn't have a soulmate? I have a lot of secrets. There isn't any way for me to comfortably tell you them all in one go. Even the one I told you wasn't the full truth. I kept things out, a lot of things. But even then, we got this ability now. After we accepted the other for our secrets and more to come, most people, regardless if they are soulmates, do that. He rambled on. Aizawa only smiled and nodded, proud of his soulmate. You have a point. There isn't anything else that could explain why we can feel the other's emotion. Speaking of, he sighed deeply as if exhausted. We need to do something about your anxiety. Midoriya was confused. He knew he had bad anxiety, but it took a lot to throw him over the edge in terms of pure fear. Your anxiety over the first round was almost enough to give me a panic attack, Aizawa deadpanned, though it made Midoriya turn away, bowing his head slightly. Sorry, he muttered. Never did he think his anxiety would hurt his soulmate. Maybe if he wasn't so damaged, if he wasn't so stupid, Aizawa wouldn't have gotten hurt. Why can't he be a good soulmate? Stop thinking, Izuku. The breaking voice was enough to stop Midoriya's heart. What goes on in your head? Everything and nothing at once, he replied simply, tears brimming both soulmates' eyes. Aizawa chuckled, whipping Midoriya's tears as they fell. It's okay. After all that you've been through, it's expected that you have stronger emotions, negative ones at that, until you can properly heal. But just do me a favor and don't have a panic attack. I think that might actually give me a heart attack. You're not that old. Midoriya shot back, a playful smile tugging at his lips. Aizawa, in turn, fell back, keeping Midoriya steady. I stand corrected, old man. Old man? What does that make you then? A student dating an old man? Sugar baby. Aizawa's heart couldn't take any more of Midoriya's comments for the day, much less the week. Izuku, he muttered, holding the teen close. The things you do to me. Care to explain, sensei? He asked, his tone teasing and light, well aware of the mess he's slowly leaving Aizawa's mind in. I can't. Not here, at least not with this much time left. The clock on the wall proved to be the biggest cock block of them all. Then at your house? Midoriya asked innocently, his chin resting on Aizawa's chest. This boy knew what he was doing to his soulmate, and it was obvious. As obvious as Aizawa's frustration, obviously. Date first, he said simply. To complete the bond was supposed to be a momentous occasion, and at the rate they were going, well, the bond could be complete at the end of the week. Date. Midoriya's head perked up, excited at the prospect. Aizawa chuckled, running a hand through Midoriya's messy curls, his palm stopping towards his ear. Though Midoriya wasn't having it, he wanted the attention more. He nuzzled his cheek into his hand, eyes closed, and clearly enjoying it. I want to take you out first, Aizawa muttered, returning his hand to Midoriya's curls. As much as he was enjoying the nuzzles, it was getting harder and hard to resist. Okay, he agreed, burying his face back into Aizawa's neck. Nap? You have 15 minutes until the first match, Aizawa started, though with how cute Midoriya looked he couldn't say no. You have 10 minutes, I have to leave before the 5-minute mark. Deal? With that he pressed another kiss to his soulmate, though on the neck instead of his face, then fell asleep with a small sigh. Okay, sadly the chapter is over, and if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like, and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.